although not a few of his ideas retained their influence into the fascist period. 4. H. S. Chamberlain as the founder of modern racialism. The real representative advocate of racial theory in the pre-war period was H. S. Chamberlain. As a thinker, he too was far from possessing any true originality. He is significant in that he united old racial theory and also the imperialist revival of it with general reactionary tendencies typical of the imperialist age, above all, vitalism. He thereby provided racial theory with just that philosophical synthesis which reactionary extremism needed at the time. The authentic vitalists of this period, Dilthey, Simmel, etc. were still too strongly associated with old, partly liberal agnostic tendencies. Nietzsche in part was too close to anesthetic, oppositional decadence, and in part, despite his nearness to social Darwinism in other respects, he rejected racial theory in the narrower sense. Social Darwinism in turn lacked philosophical generalizations. Inasmuch as its advocates undertook these, they were scientific monist ones, and thus of no use to reactionary extremism. Chamberlain now summed up philosophically all the tendencies that mattered to the reactionary extremists. To that extent he cut an important figure, the ideological link between old reaction and the coming fascism. Of course, Chamberlain was not the only such link. An important forerunner, whom the fascists likewise revered as a direct spiritual ancestor, was Lagarde. It is certainly no accident that the German Kaiser Wilhelm XI was closely associated with Lagarde and came under his intellectual influence in his youth. 51. He also supported Stocker's anti-Semitic demagogy, nor was it by accident that there later arose a personal correspondence between the German Kaiser and Chamberlain. As early as 1901, the Kaiser described himself in a letter to Chamberlain as a fellow and combatant and ally in the struggle for Germania against Rome, Jerusalem, etc. Of Chamberlain's influence on his own thinking, and now all the ancient Aryan Germanic elements amassed and dormant within me had gradually to emerge by strenuous effort. They came into open conflict with what was inherited, often manifested themselves in 152, and the Kaiser said a bizarre form, and often, because they were more of an obscure inkling, stirred within me shapelessly and unconsciously, seeking an outlet. Then you appeared, and with your magic wand you brought order into confusion, light into darkness. The goals which had to be striven and toiled for. The elucidation of obscurely sensed paths which had to be followed in order to save the Germans, and thereby to save mankind. 153. This friendship lasted until Chamberlain's death. Chamberlain received the Iron Cross for his warmongering essays, and the amicable correspondence continued after the fall of the dynasty. But at the same time, Chamberlain also made contact with a new leader of extreme reaction. In 1923 there took place a meeting between him and Hitler, and Chamberlain summed up his impression of it as follows: "My faith in the German spirit has not wavered for one moment, but my hopes, this I'll admit, had sunk to a low ebb. You have transformed my state of soul at a stroke. That Germany should engender Hitler in the hour of her greatest need testifies to the life in her. The same goes for the influence that Hitler radiates. For those two things, personality and influence, go together. That the magnificent Ludendorff should openly join you and declare his sympathy with the movement emanating from you, how splendidly that confirms your worth." 154. Lagarde and his subsequent lesser successors, for example, Langbin, the author of Rembrandt as Educator, were still outsiders. They could ally themselves only peripherally and intermittently with current reactionary politics. Chamberlain saw in Lagarde the complementary political genius to Bismarck. 55. He described Lagarde's German writings, Deutschschriften, as among the most valuable of books. His special achievement was to have located in Christianity the inferior Semitic religious instincts and their harmful effect on Christian religion. That was a deed earning admiration and gratitude. Lagarde wished to have the whole of the Old Testament eliminated from Christian religious teaching. For, he stated, the Gospel has been 156 ruined, as far as that is possible, by its influence. Although Chamberlain criticized Lagarde for plowing a lone furrow, which made him a solitary outsider, he nevertheless saw in him one of his most important forerunners. Here the most significant element was the attitude to religion and Christianity. It blended the themes of the old and new forms of reactionary extremism. The old Prussian Junker reaction was Protestant pietist and thus traditional and orthodox on all religious issues. Germany's capitalist development and the need to retain a hold on political supremacy in an aggressively imperialist state, one requiring for its aggression an ideology that would embrace and mobilize all social strata, transformed the situation within the ranks of the reactionary extremists. Admittedly, the working class especially was not easy to infiltrate in this way. Here reformism had a lengthy job to do before surrender to German imperialism became a possibility. Hence the new reactionary extremism was oriented primarily to the petty bourgeois masses, who were not directly susceptible to the Junker influence, and hence there sprang up various forms of demagogic ideology, Stockers, anti-Semitism, later Nauman's nationalism, and so on. Among the intellectuals too, the most diverse tendencies held sway. Nietzsche, who was active at around the same time as Lagarde, likewise dissociated himself from orthodox Protestantism. But whereas he sought and denounced a new religion draped with atheistic slogans, Lagarde attempted to renew Protestantism by eliminating the Semitic elements. Both of them criticized the capitalist age's lack of culture, but in such a way that the butt of their criticism was directed against democracy and the labor movement. Here they fell in with the reactionary tendencies of imperialist vitalism. But for all the extent of Nietzsche's influence on the intelligentsia, this philosophy was not calculated to form a basis for influencing the broad masses. Now at this point Chamberlain came on the scene as the most important mind to continue Lagarde's line of thought. He expanded his racial theory into a general worldview assimilating all reactionary extremist tendencies, both old and new, and combining a cultural critique at the highest level, with vulgar anti-Semitic agitation and propaganda for the German race's exclusive vocation as rulers. It both contested outmoded Christianity and renewed it, thus addressing itself to believers and unbelievers at one and the same time, while also converting this Christian revival into a tool of anti-democratic, world-conquering imperialist Hohenzollern policy, and racial theory formed the kernel of this new philosophy. As we have noted, Chamberlain rejected Gobineau's form of racialism. At the same time he stated his allegiance to a social Darwinism. Directly. After the aforestated critical comments on Gobineau he wrote, "My master is primarily Charles Darwin." It must be said that the Darwin he acknowledged was Darwin minus the theory of evolution. Of evolution Chamberlain once wrote, "My instinct tells me that the idea of man is not in agreement with nature that, to his mind, disposed of the theory of evolution." Darwin's positive achievement, in Chamberlain's eyes, was the proof of the significance of race in the 157, 158, 159 entire realm of living beings. Here again, it must be said, Chamberlain dismissed all questions of origin and cause. The Darwin whom he accepted was merely a colleague of the men of praxis. One follow the great natural scientist into the stable and the chicken run into the nurseryman and say that here we have something which gives substance to the word race is unarguable and obvious to everybody. So Chamberlain's method derived from grossly incongruous views, each of his interpretations juxtaposed. The most vulgar empiricism and mystical intuitive philosophy. Certainly this dichotomy was nothing new in German reactionary philosophy. The older Schelling had already called his theory of revealed knowledge, his irrationalist philosophy of intuition, a philosophical empiricism, and Edward von Hartmann later endeavored to rescue this philosophy from the past and to modernize it. It does not greatly matter whether Chamberlain was familiar with these 160 predecessors of his or not. This, at all events, is where the essence of his successes as a philosopher lay. He was speaking for modern people, and all the achievements of capitalist industry and the technology and science supporting it were therefore to be preserved and justified philosophically. Indeed, the new philosophy was to be presented as though it were, through a radical empiricism, to protect this modern natural scientific praxis against impermissible inroads on the part of an abstract philosophy. Yet it was from this very soil that there sprang up the racial mystique, the German race's claim to world mastery. Chamberlain's racialism was thus suspended between a purportedly empiricist obviousness and the wildest obscurantist mysticism. On the one hand, Chamberlain cited as evidence the experience of animal breeders and horticulturists. These knew what race was, and, Chamberlain added, why should mankind constitute an exception? 161 elsewhere, discussing the merits of racehorses and Newfoundland dogs, he continued, here again, nobody acquainted in detail with the results of animal breeding can doubt that the history of mankind before us and around us obeys the same 162 law. Here too, the role of Darwinian sociology is plainly visible. It was that of removing all social elements from the theory of society as inessential to it. And yet Chamberlain knew perfectly well that the objective defining characteristics of race are quite invalid for men. When the distinguished German scholar Steinmetz put this point to him he replied, that is all very well. But life itself, which shows everywhere that race is a fact of importance to all organic existence, life does not wait for scholars to get to the bottom of it. 163 Hence the need for a leap into a rationalist intuition and into the inner life. The possession of race in our own consciousness carries immediate conviction as nothing else does. Any member of a decidedly pure race will sense the fact all the time. 164 This argument was of great import for the future of racialism. For here Chamberlain was reversing the issue. Intuition was not intended to judge the truth or falsity of an objective set of facts, but itself determined the racial standing of the inquirer, and anyone who did not have this intuition would be proved a crossbreed, a bastard, by dint of that very fact. Thus Chamberlain proudly announced as the essence of his method, without troubling myself about a definition, I have demonstrated what race is in my own breast, in the great deeds of genius, and on the glittering pages of human history. So here the most utterly subjective arbitrariness was laid down as a method. We can readily see how close Chamberlain's methodological efforts came to Nietzsche on the one hand, and to the intuition theory of Dilthey's descriptive psychology, 165, and phenomenological intuition of the essence, on the other. This obscurantist tendency was summed up in myth. Aspirations to myth were widespread in the imperialist period, especially in Germany. Agnosticism was crossing the border into mysticism, while mysticism and myth had a twofold function. This was already so with Nietzsche. Above all, mysticism helped to reduce every objective observation to the level of a mere myth. Empirio-criticism, the neo-Kantian philosophy of as if, and pragmatism were constantly operating in the epistemological field with a related method. Chamberlain exploited thoroughly all the achievements of this neo-Kantianism, whose major representatives such as Cohen or Simmel he repeatedly showered with praise, even though they were Jews. And he took this mythical line of thought to a radical close. Thus he said of Darwinian theory that it was simply a fiction. A 166 useful and salutary figment of the imagination was evident, according to Chamberlain, that Aristotle simply substituted one myth for another, and that is because no philosophy can manage without myths. Myths not just as emergency aids and to fill a few gaps, so at 167 but as a basic element that carries through the whole. The really philosophical standpoint, in Chamberlain's view, consisted in an awareness of the mythical character of all thinking. The first efflorescence of philosophy, that of ancient India, was clear on that point. The Indian philosophers well knew that their 168 myths were myths. Men had lost sight of this truth in the course of the later European development, and Kant was the first to regain the correct philosophical attitude. With Kant, man first attains to awareness about his own myth-forming that, according to Chamberlain, was Kant's Copernican deed. In this way Chamberlain reassured his modern readers of the continuing validity of natural scientific development, in its details, in specialist research. All that needed challenging was the claim to objective truth. For, Chamberlain stated, the value of science is not its substance of truth. This, after all, is only symbolic, but its usefulness as a practical method and its importance. 169-170 in shaping imagination and character. The appeal to praxis we have already encountered in Nietzsche and Dilthey. A real social need was at stake here. All relevance to the major problems of mankind's development, and consequently to human praxis, had vanished from standard bourgeois thinking. In view of the strict, and ever-increasing, scientific specialization forced upon academic science and philosophy by the capitalist division of labor, and in view of the agnosticism now dominating them, it was impossible for them to satisfy this concretely existing need on the basis of their own methodology. As we have noted, not even so outstanding a contemporary figure as Max Weber was able to pose these questions rationally, let alone answer them, through the insights of Iberjoy, science as it had become in the course of capitalist development. And at the same time, the irresistible nature of this need for solutions resulted in a transference of such propositions and answers to a fundamentally irrationalist faith. Chamberlain, like Nietzsche before him, unscrupulously accomplished what Max Weber undertook with many reservations. He set up myth as the era in which these answers could emerge spontaneously. To that end, science had to be downgraded to an unconscious myth, and the imperialist age's extreme relativism offered the most varied starting points for such an interpretation. Simmel, as we have seen, was already aiming at abolishing scientific progress relativistically, and placed myth-forming and science on a single plane. With Simmel, therefore, science was already half aware of its mythical character, and Chamberlain had to go only one step further to interpret Kant's epistemology as this growing self-consciousness of the mythical, fictive basic character of every view of the world. Relativistically minded modern liberal thinkers, while becoming very sharply opposed to the dogmatic aspect of materialism, were extremely patient towards and indeed full of sympathetic understanding for the most obscurantist intellectual trends of the time. Here again we see that objectively, this relativism of theirs was assisting the birth of fascist ideology. It is also readily visible that the theory of myth and forming of myth appeared the most viable philosophical path to praxis on an imperialist basis. For not only was this path, as we have noted, inaccessible to the specialist scientific disciplines, and imperialist bourgeois philosophy, as long as it did not pass into the mythical sphere, was likewise a specialist science. It was also more and more evident that the old religious philosophies handed down through history were similarly unable to serve as signposts. Their philosophy and the praxis resulting from it were not intimately enough related to contemporary problems to effect the connection. Old reactionary thinking sought to unite the outlook and ethos of the traditional religions with modern philosophical needs. But recognizing the new situation, the new reactionary sanctioned the concrete break intellectually and undertook to create through myth not only a fresh philosophy, but also a seasonable substitute for religion. This was what distinguished the new from the old reaction, but the doctrine of myth had another positive side to it, the justification of mere inner experience, of irrationalism and intuitionism raised to a philosophy. Now this is where Chamberlain's renewal of religion came in. Its starting point was a critique of contemporary culture. Here Chamberlain too proceeded from the fashionable antithesis between civilization and culture which played a cardinal role in imperialist vitalism. Culture was the Germanic and also the aristocratic element. Civilization by itself, on the other hand, was Western European, superficial, Jewish, democratic. But for all the superiority of culture over mere civilization, and of the Germanic race over the lower ones, the Germanic character had one crucial, dangerous failing: it lacked an indigenous religion. Chamberlain regarded it as his chief task to summon and restore to life this religion, and in this sense he was carrying on Lagardy's life work. The line of the genuine Germanic Aryan religion traced by Chamberlain ran via ancient India to Christ, and from the latter to Kant. In this respect ancient India, before it was ruined by miscegenation, was in a far more advantageous position. There, religion is also the transmitter of science, whereas here, all genuine science has always been in conflict with religion. 171 The division between religion and science is the acknowledgement of an official lie. This lie, which is vitiating the life of the individual and society, derives solely from the fact that we Indo-Europeans have stooped so low as to accept Jewish history as the basis and Syro-Egyptian magic arts as the crown of our supposed religion. 172 The superiority of ancient Indian philosophy lay in the fact that it was illogical and that logic does not rule its thinking, but serves it only when needed. Indian philosophy was an esoteric knowledge. 173 Beyond all concern with proofs. Here we see clearly whence and whither Chamberlain's path was leading. He proceeded from that alienation from religion which formed the starting point for the expansion of modern religious atheism. At the same time he was in league with those who proposed to overcome this alienation through a new, purified religion. Thus he was continuing the thought of both Nietzsche and Lagardy. His solution was amazingly simple: that rupture with reason and science which vitalism proclaimed as a scientific or philosophical reform Chamberlain declared to be the new religion. For the pre-war period, this simple, all too simple, solution meant too sudden a break with all scientific thinking on the one hand, and was too uncompromising with regard to the tragic postures of religious atheism on the other. So Chamberlain, precisely among the intellectual elite, was still an outsider during this period. It was for that very reason that fascism proper was able to turn him into a classic. Chamberlain raised vitalism to just that pitch the fascists required. From what has been stated, we can already perceive the connection between this issue and racialism. For Christ took the big step towards renewing Aryan philosophy, in Europe only, with the saying, "The kingdom of God is within." Christ signified the appearance of a new human type. Only with him did 174 mankind obtain a moral culture here. To be sure, Chamberlain faced the difficulty of proving that Christ had nothing to do with the Jewish race. His excuse was that Christ's teaching had been racially tainted by Judaism and by the tribal chaos of Rome in its decline. As stated, Kant was the first to adopt the Aryan Germanic standpoint again, and the first to show that religion was a generating of the idea of God from the 175 depths of one's heart. In general, Chamberlain's exegesis of Kant followed the purely agnosticist line of imperial neo-Kantianism, but with an even greater dose of mysticism. Thus he wrote of the thing in itself, the thing cannot be dealt with apart from the subject. A thing in itself detached from the reason, or, to put it more plainly, a thing for no reason is even more of a non-idea than a non-thing, for understanding and reason alone create unity in diversity. They alone, therefore, engender a thing. This is not because nothing exists outside of reason, but 176 because the reason alone has shaping power. Only this interpretation of Kantian doctrine could, in Chamberlain's view, provide the Germanic world with an indigenous religion, a real religious culture. A terrible backwardness was prevailing in Europe in this respect. With regard to religion, we Europeans are roughly at the point where the Hottentots stand in relation to science. What we call religion is an empirical mishmash, and our theology, of all denominations, is, in Kant's judgment, a metric lantern of chimeras. 11-177. This backwardness needed dispelling. If the mystical obscurantism preached by Chamberlain were to hold sway in Europe, it would open up future prospects for the Aryan race. But why those vast distances in time? For as we know, many centuries separate ancient India from Christ and the latter from Kant. Here was enacted precisely the essential substance of Chamberlain's philosophy, the racial struggle. The struggle was between the Aryan Germanic people of light and the powers of darkness, Judaism and Rome. With this, Chamberlain's thinking, which is expounded so far, differed little from ordinary imperialist vitalism, took on the original slant that pointed into the fascist future. Similarly, Chamberlain repudiated world history both in methodology and in content. He wrote, "As soon as we speak of mankind in general, and fancy that we see in history a development, progress, education, etc., of mankind, we are leaving the firm ground of facts and floating in airy abstractions. For this mankind that has been already philosophized about so much suffers from the severe weakness that it does not even exist." 178 Only races existed. The theory of mankind is obstructing all correct insight into history. It had to be painstakingly dug out like weed before we may state the patent truth with any hope of being understood. Our present civilization and culture is specifically Germanic, and the 179 exclusive work of the Germanic race. Here Chamberlain was expressing with great candor the viewpoint that all previous ideas of mankind and humanity must be abolished so that the patent truth of Germanic world mastery could become a philosophy. It is only logical that Chamberlain, like Gobineau and the social Darwinists, acknowledged progress and decay only in the individual races. Chamberlain, however, differed from his predecessors in that he linked racial theory with a historical perspective. He thereby surmounted both the racial pessimism of Gobineau and other French adherents to racialism and also the scientific monism of the social Darwinists, whose theory similarly yielded only a resigned insight into the ineluctable motions of the cosmos. This, of course, meant the absolute glorification of the Germanic race and an absolute rejection of everything non-Germanic. In setting up this perspective, Chamberlain came very near to vulgar pan-German propaganda. But he differed from it on two counts. One was that he stood in a close relationship to vitalism, whereas that propaganda was much more backward and unmodern philosophically. And closely connected with this was the fact that Chamberlain's historical theory and perspective, though as reactionary and hostile to progress as the pan-Germans, were less avowedly bound to the Junker status quo of Prussian Germany. While this too forced something of an outsider role upon Chamberlain before the First World War, it was just this that directly linked him with the new, post-war reaction, with fascism. Thus Chamberlain wrote of contemporary culture, "What is not Germanic in it is the germ of a disease or foreign cargo sailing under a German flag until, that is, we sink these pirate vessels with lead 180 for the most sacred of duties is to serve the Germanic race." 181 Chamberlain now expressed his philosophical allegiance to German imperialism with the most brutal cynicism. Nobody can prove that Germanic supremacy is a blessing for all the Earth's inhabitants. From the beginning right up to the present, we have seen the Germans slaughtering whole tribes and peoples so to procure room for themselves, was perpetuating the Nietzschean line of indirect imperialist apologetics, the blonde beast, line that so many of Nietzsche's liberal admirers would prefer to regard as non-existent or inessential to him. But at this juncture it is plain how necessary and how central this particular line was to both of them, to Nietzsche as well as Chamberlain. In other respects they may have greatly differed, and a big difference in stature may have separated Nietzsche the literary stylist and psychologist of culture from Chamberlain. But both stood out from 182 here Chamberlain the other vitalists and racialists in that they strove to provide a historical perspective for the imperialist age on the basis of a pessimistic cultural critique. But what kind of perspective might that be, if not an imperialist one? And if it was an imperialist one, then what else could it contain as its essential tenet but the myth of imperialist aggression and inhumanity? Where this perspective was lacking, all that could emerge was a skepticism bordering on nihilism, a state of despair or of resignation as the final wisdom as reflected in the history of vitalism from Dilthey and Simmel to Heidegger and Klages. Objectively considered, the imperialist period could follow one of only two courses. It could either approve imperialism along with its world wars, its subjugation and exploitation of colonial peoples and its own masses, or else imperialism could be effectively repudiated. The masses could revolt and destroy monopoly capitalism. The thinking man had to side openly and firmly either for or against. Otherwise his life, no matter whether he sympathized with imperialism as with fascism or disliked them, could only end without prospects, in despair. We have already repeatedly illustrated the objectively positive service to fascism of the philosophy of despair. Nietzsche and Chamberlain, to be sure, differed not only in stature but also in their closeness to the concrete realization of imperialism. Nietzsche was merely its prophet. Hence the general, abstract, poetic form of his imperialist myth. Chamberlain was already more active, a direct participant in the ideological preliminaries to the First World War. Hence we can already clearly discern in him the outlines of bestial imperialism a la Rosenberg and Hitler. With Chamberlain, racialism already served to give this bestiality a clear conscience. For those belonging to the other races, he claimed, were not human beings in the proper sense of the word. Even when speaking about abstractly epistemological issues, Chamberlain did not omit to add that truth too exists only for the chosen race. When I say peculiarly true, mean peculiarly true for us Germans. 183 This exclusion of the non-Germanic remainder of mankind from all natural right and capacity for culture permeated the whole of Chamberlain's so-called philosophy. Pure racial attributes constituted a definitive, biological aristocratic selection principle. Thus Chamberlain wrote of Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy is aristocratic to the core. It knows that the highest perceptions are accessible only to the chosen, and that the chosen individual can only be trained if he has specific physical racial qualifications of absolute equality. Mohammedanism indicated their members, racial. 184 That a democracy was known to Judaism, and 185 inferiority. Thus Chamberlain originated the racialist substitute for world history. Along with the history of mankind, the old division of antiquity, Middle Ages and the modern period was also rejected. Even the idea of the Renaissance seemed absurd to Chamberlain. For him there were only individual Aryan racial cultures, India, Persia, Greece, Rome, the medieval Teutonic empires, modern Germany, and they decayed as a result of miscegenation, of bastardization. Chamberlain's most important concept in his account of the forces opposing Aryan supremacy was the tribal chaos, arising in consequence of Roman territorial dominance. Here a universal miscegenation ensued and gave rise to the danger of a cultural decline. The Germanic peoples came to the rescue. Everything that was great and good and stood for high culture, whether in Italy or in Spain, was the work of descendants of the Germanic conquerors. Everything that was dangerous or bad and lacking in culture was represented, in this struggle, as the product of Judaism and tribal chaos, of which the Roman Catholic Church, according to Chamberlain, was the organized epitome and ideological guardian. Thus the whole of history since the decline of the Roman Empire amounted to a conflict between the Germanic bringers of light and Jerusalem and Rome, the powers of darkness. This conflict determined the association of religion and racialism in Chamberlain's conception. As Chamberlain proved, Christ was no Jew. The religion he had founded was the strict negation of the Jewish religion. The latter was an abstract materialism, and 186 a worship of idols. Kant's great achievement lay precisely in his having overthrown Nusjan for good. 87 Therewith Chamberlain obtained a complete merger of the hitherto separate trends of imperialist reaction, vitalistic irrationalism and racial theory. This abolition of Judaism and Jewish traditions in philosophy was here tantamount to the destruction of reason. The vitalist irrationalist undermining and dissolution of thinking and reason thereby acquired a clear, myth-like, universally tangible shape and began to leave the narrow confines of lecture platform and literary periodical. But at the same time, racialism was shaking off its positivist scientific sobriety, an intellectual and moral climate was originating in which it could become a religious substitute for desperate and fanatically aroused masses. Here, admittedly, Chamberlain was only the prophet, the herald of the man to come. But the latter had nothing new to add to Chamberlain's doctrine in content or methodology. He had only to adjust it for mass consumption according to this doctrine. The Aryan, Christ's and Christianity's great achievement had been already totally distorted by the half-Jew Paul and especially by Augustine, the product of the tribal chaos. As a counterpart and antithesis to Judaic abstract materialism, the Roman Church allegedly gave rise to a magical materialism 88 that was equally dangerous for the indigenous Germanic outlook. Again Chamberlain was a direct precursor of Hitler and Rosenberg in that he branded philosophically as materialism all that he found devilish, everything Jewish, all miscegenation. This too indicates how much all these polemics were primarily aimed against dialectical and historical materialism as the one serious adversary of imperialist ideology. It also shows, on the other hand, that this supposedly self-evident, groundless denigration was only possible on the basis of the preparatory work performed by the imperialist age's anti-Marxist agnosticism. Chamberlain wrote, the coupling of the Aryan with the Jewish spirit, and of both with follies of the nationless, religionless tribal chaos is the major danger. The Jewish spirit, had it been adopted in its pure form, would have perpetrated far less damage, but as it is, it infiltrated the sublime world of Indo-European symbolism and freely creative, versatile formative energy. Like the South American poisoned art, this spirit pierced and paralyzed an organism which alone possesses life and beauty throughout the process of recreation. At the same time, this dogmatic spirit transfixed as permanent religious components the silliest and most repugnant superstitions believed by miserable slaves. What had formerly been good for the common man, in Origen's view, or for slaves, as Demosthenes jeered, had henceforth to be believed by the princes of the mind on penalty of eternal damnation. 89. Thus the Aryan religion of Christ was twisted into the Roman Church of tribal chaos. This distortion, Chamberlain asserted, determined European history from the period of the tribal migrations to the present day. It was the foundation of the 19th century, for this struggle had not yet been fought to the very end. The Germanic North's rebellion against the tribal chaos of southern Europe had not yet led to a real victory. Although, as the latest branch of the Aryan race, the Germanic people was the legitimate master of the world, it found itself in a problematic situation regarding its claims and its chances of rule. These, Chamberlain thought, could only be realized through a radical conquest of the elements of Judaism and tribal chaos in religion, through the birth of an indigenous Germanic religion. Thus with Chamberlain, racial theory became the universal philosophy, the ideological tool of Wilhelm imperialism's aggressive claims to global mastery. After what has been stated so far, we can readily understand that Chamberlain pursued a keen pan-German propaganda in the First World War and that he joined Hitler's side after Germany's defeat. His many war pamphlets contain little that is new in relation to what we have previously expounded. They emphasize the basic anti-democratic aspect of his tendencies more sharply than his theoretical writings. Even before the war he advised Wilhelm XI to blow up the Reichstag in order to clear the road for his plans. The Germans' vocation as masters of the world was also given a more marked prominence in these pamphlets than in the previous writings, and along with the central, religio-racial problem, the elimination of democracy and establishment of rule by the chosen few was increasingly stressed as an internal obstacle to be overcome. The significance of Prussia also received a stronger affirmative note than before. Polemicizing against the contrast of Weimar and Potsdam widely drawn by Anglo-democratic circles in particular, Chamberlain wrote, "The foreigner who professes to like a Germany without Prussia is either a fool or a scoundrel." 190 Naturally the German imperialist facets of his programmatic bias emerged from these writings nakedly, without philosophical trappings. He emphasized quite openly that German world mastery was at stake. A victory in Europe did not mean the end of the struggle, and they had to conquer and subjugate the whole world. The issue, to Chamberlain's mind, was that of global dominion or perdition. The Germany he envisaged could not be other than aggressively imperialist. If Germany does not rule the world, then she will disappear from the map. It 191 is a matter of either or, so Chamberlain's racialist philosophy logically contributed to the propaganda of the then most aggressive and reactionary group of German imperialists, the Pan-Germans. 5. The National Socialist philosophy. As the demaic synthesis of German irrealist philosophy, we now see that in the form of a so-called philosophy for decadent reactionary intellectuals, and in a war propaganda for barbarized, chauvinistic bourgeois Philistines, the outlines of National Socialist philosophy were virtually complete. It only remained to convey it to the streets from the salons, cafes and common rooms. Hitler and his henchmen accomplished this final step in the development of reactionary extremism in Germany. In doing so, they fully acknowledged the services of Chamberlain. Rosenberg himself wrote a book on him, and after the seizure of power he once stated, in order to warn fascist fellow travelers, and to offer them a guideline, that National Socialism recognized only Richard Wagner, Nietzsche, Lagarde and H.S. Chamberlain as its real ancestors. 92 But we must by overestimate Chamberlain's significance. He represents only a penultimate literary summing up of the most reactionary lines of thought in the German, and international, development. German fascism itself was an eclectic synthesis of all the reactionary tendencies, but because of Germany's specific development they evolved more strongly and firmly here than in other countries. In number they were unlimited, while their no means differences, despite the shared reactionary character, were very considerable. Having discussed already the special conditions under which German developed, we can now refer to them again under headings: the 30 Years' War, ducal state absolutism, capitalism's late development, Bismarck's founding of the Reich with the Prussian Junker class supreme, and with quasi-parliamentarism allied to the preservation of Hohenzollern personal rule, etc. The result of these was that hardly one bourgeois ideological strain did not, in some form, assist an accommodation to the German reality, a reconciliation with it, and thus have a reactionary aspect. And in the imperialist period's revival of the classic philosophers, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, bourgeois thinkers showed a sheer class instinct by constantly appropriating precisely their reactionary sides. Bringing these into prominence, they purged the old philosophies of their progressive foundations and tendencies. Thus Kant was thoroughly purged of his wavering between materialism and idealism. Lenin. Thus Rickert's reactionary neo-Kantian school exploited the later Fichte's irrationalism to extend neo-Kantianism. Thus Edward von Hartmann revived the later Schelling's philosophy, whose reactionary character was expressed more strongly and effectively still in the subsequent influence of Kierkegaard. Thus neo-Hegelianism used Hegel's reconciliation with the reality of Prussia to turn him into a precursor of Bismarck and to expand his philosophy in general, thoroughly purged of all dialectics into that of conserving German backwardness, into a synthesis of all reactionary trends. Then there were the thinkers whose basic tendencies were reactionary from the start, such as Schopenhauer, the Romantics, chiefly Adam Muller, Gors, etc. and Nietzsche. Fascism, inheriting the collective legacy of Germany's reactionary development, used it in order to establish a bestial imperialism in home and foreign affairs. National Socialism was a major appeal to the worst instincts of the German people. Above all, it appealed to those bad qualities formed in the course of centuries as a result of failed revolutions and the lack of a democratic German development and ideology. Engels spoke of the servility that had penetrated the national consciousness as a result of the humiliation of the 193 30 Years' War. The modern form of this servility was a complete failure to recognize that in spite of the growth of German capitalism, and in spite of the outward military might of the Prussianized German Reich, the German misery had continued to prevail at home almost unchanged. But with most ideologists, there was far more to it than simply a failure to perceive this state of affairs. On the contrary, they evolved more and more powerfully an ideology which saw in this preservation of the German misery in the quasi-constitutional character of Bismarck's Reich, and in the unchallenged supremacy of reactionary Prussianism, Junker rule, Prussian militarism and bureaucracy, a higher form of social structure and political constitution than that evolved in the West in the train of bourgeois revolution. In the imperialist age, as we know, the Western democracies, because of the abrupt emergence of the contradictions and limitations of bourgeois democracy, gave rise to an increasingly broad and pointed critique of democracy as a whole. But in Russia, this criticism was already growing into an ideological negation of liberalism among the revolutionary Democrats, especially Chernyshevsky. And Lenin, during the imperialist period, used a consistent Marxist critique of bourgeois democracy to extend the Marxian doctrine of the dictatorship of the proletariat and proletarian democracy, thus putting in a more concrete form than Marx himself the theory of the transition from capitalism to socialism. In Western Europe, on the other hand, the critique of democracy was only operating between the extreme and erroneous poles of ultra-reaction and anarchism or syndicalism in the labor movement. Although the German imperialist ideologists enthusiastically adopted this critique, they used it only in order to pass off a Prussianized Germany as a higher, forward-looking social and political form surmounting the contradictions of democracy. The adoption of the Western critique of democracy thus engendered the ideology of aggressive German imperialism, the doctrine of the German mission to signpost the future for mankind, and this on the very basis of the conserving of all the retrograde institutions of the German misery. This special form of the German mission also created great confusion among all those thinkers inclined to be progressive in their aims, or who at least intended to fight against extreme reaction. A blind, slavish, uncritical obsequiousness towards the existing political authority of the day was coupled with an idealizing of the political and social forms of a backward Germany. It poured Germany's development into a bourgeois democracy, steered it into totally wrong channels and created, often involuntary, ideological support for those reactionary ways of thinking where a glorification of German backwardness corresponded to natural class interests. This contradictory nature of the German development was already strongly tangible in Stein's reform movement, and especially in Baron Stein himself. It was manifested in the later Hegel's bureaucratic patrician political theory, in his distortion of the correct view of the Reformation as a kind of bourgeois revolution to the effect that it already signified the completion of democratic revolutionary tasks in Germany. It even penetrated the labor movement with Lassalle's ever-influential political theory and created there an opportunistic legalism to a degree unknown elsewhere, an idolizing of the state in itself. The ideology of extreme reaction first took shape intellectually on the right wing of Romanticism, in very close conjunction with the most retrograde circles of Junker reaction in Prussia. It received a powerful boost in that the democratic critical resistance opposing it, the democratic critical exposure of reactionary ideology in Germany, was far weaker than in any other country in the world. This even applied, save for the periods when Marx and Engels were exerting an immediate influence, to the German labor movement. In his critique of the Erfurt Manifesto, Engels issued a serious warning to German social democracy for neglecting its most vital tasks in the struggle against reaction and for German democratization, and for even fostering illusions of the lackadaisical coalescence of the old shambles with a socialist society. Engels' criticism was leveled against those German illusions which expected a coalescence with socialism of the existing Germany, that is, a country that had not yet become democratized and for which all the tasks of democratization, including the concrete realization of national unity, the central issue of Germany's transformation into a democracy, were revolutionary tasks. Such a road to socialism as that mooted at 11194. Erfurt was, in Engels' opinion, only liable to distract attention from the major tasks of the revolutionary democratization of Germany. And to fight for the latter could be the only correct preliminary objective and subjective to socialism in Germany. But this criticism was not understood in the German labor movement. There arose the false extremes of the reconciliation with undemocratic, imperialist Germany on the one hand, and of an abstract proclamation of socialism abstractly bypassing the revolutionary democratic tasks on the other. Among the leading ideologists of German social democracy in the imperial age, Franz Mehring was practically the only one in whom the traditions of revolutionary struggle against Prussian reaction were really alive and kicking. Lenin observed and sharply criticized this turn of events at an early date. The Republican tradition is greatly enfeebled among the socialists of Europe. Not infrequently the weakening of Republican propaganda signifies the lack of a vital thrust towards the total victory of the proletariat in general. Not for nothing did Engels, in criticizing the Erfurt Draft Manifesto in 1891, devote all his energy to alerting the German workers to the importance of the Republican struggle, the possibility that such a struggle would become a live issue in Germany as well. 195. Under these conditions, the whole of bourgeois ideology was completely saturated with reactionary forms and contents. Agnosticism and mysticism governed the thinking of even those bourgeois minds that favored progress in their main political bias. Even racial theory infiltrated these circles. Let us mention just Rathenai, later the victim of fascist assassins. Hand in hand with this went, as we have noted, the modernization of reactionary Junker ideology. It goes without saying that this process was not a uniform one either. The old forms and the old slogans, for God, King and Fatherland, Am Deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genießen, recourse to Orthodox Protestantism, etc. survived until far into the Weimar Republic, influencing certain numerically limited petty bourgeois circles. We may recall German nationalist propaganda, the steel helmets, and so on. But beside this there was an ever-growing need to mold the most extreme reactionary contents and most aggressive objectives of German imperialism into a form capable of winning over to its internal and external aims the broad masses of the petty bourgeoisie, farmers, intellectuals and also the workers' Germanies. Defeat in the First World War gave rise to two closely linked problem complexes. They facilitated this reconstruction of extreme reactionary ideology, its modernization and its efficacy among broad masses of the German people. The first complex was the general national resentment of the Treaty of Versailles. The Social Democrats, opportunism and the Communists' weakness did not permit of a popular liberation from the humiliating burdens of the past, the consequences of the war, by way of a radical revolution, as happened in Russia. As a result of this failure in 1918, the masses were increasingly ensnared under imperialist reactionary leadership in their national aspirations. The campaign against the Treaty of Versailles, the watchword of national liberation, miscarried as a slogan of the revolutionary democratic unification of the German nation and changed more and more into a revival of aggressive German imperialism. The second problem complex, which was interwoven with the first at every point and reinforced its efficacy, was the disappointment of the masses over the social results of the 1918 Rising. Hopes at that time, and they extended far into the petty bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, were running exceptionally high. The fact, therefore, that under the aegis of the Weimar Republic, the regime of Junkers allied with the big capitalists was just as oppressive as before was bound to cause immense disappointment. The great economic crisis in 1929, and the Weimar democracy's firmly reactionary economic and social policy during this crisis, only intensified it. At the same time, it became evident that no movement which aimed simply at harking back to the pre-war state of affairs, a Hohenzollern restoration, could gain a mass influence. So in the camp of reactionary extremism there sprang up a need for social demagogy, a camouflaging of aggressive imperialist goals as national and social revolution. The intervention of Hitler and his helpmates met these vital needs of the most reactionary members of the German Junker class and big capitalists. They fulfilled them by conveying ultra-reactionary ideology, seasonably modernized, out of the salons and cafes onto the streets. Hitler's ideology was nothing beyond an extremely crafty, cynically subtle exploitation of this set of problems. Their past activity had well equipped Hitler himself and his closest associates for the task. In Vienna, Hitler had been a student of Luger's anti-Semitic social demagogy, and later he became an agent for the Reichswehr in Germany. His chief ideologist, Rosenberg, was a pupil of the Black Hundred in Tsarist Russia and later likewise a German agent. Both of them, like the other German fascist leaders, were ruthless and unscrupulous hirelings of the most reactionary imperialism, demagogic front-runners for the Prusso-German policy of aggression and suppression. Hence they ceased to possess even the semblance of an ideological bona fides. They themselves regarded their own doctrine with total cynicism and incredulous indifference, playing with virtuosity on the German people's aforestated backward attributes corrupted through its historical development. They put this doctrine at the service of German imperialist capitalism, the big capitalists and ruling Junkers, the preservation of Prussianized Germany, the latter's expansion and its battle for global dominance. In their speeches and writings, the fascist leaders poured out with a nauseating show of emotion their national and social demagogic, whose public second names were honor, loyalty, faith, sacrifice, etc. But when they came together in private, they spoke with the most cynical, knowing smiles of their own messages and manifestos. Today we still know relatively little of this intimate material concerning the fascist leaders. 96 Nevertheless, the fugitive Danzig leader Rauschning, for example, has published enough information on his personal contacts with Hitler and the others for us to obtain a fairly solid picture of the situation. Here I shall give just a couple of characteristic examples. Rauschning had a conversation with Hitler in which they discussed the central dogma of German fascism, racial theory. Hitler voiced the following opinion on this subject: the nation is a political expression of democracy and liberalism. We must get rid of this false construction and replace it with the racial idea, which is not yet shop-worn politically. I know very well that there is no such thing as race in the scientific sense. As a politician, I need a concept enabling us to abolish the previous historical foundations and replace them with a completely new, anti-historical order, and to put this on an intellectual footing. Their task was to destroy national boundaries. With a racial concept, National Socialism can carry out its revolution and overturn the world. 197 Here it is clear that for Hitler, racial theory was only a pretext for making attractive and plausible to the masses a wholesale conquest and subjugation of Europe and the destruction of the European peoples as distinct nations. As we know, research into the first beginnings of the German people was closely linked with racial theory. The fascists proclaimed it one of the most important parts of their doctrine and even set up special scientific departments to investigate it. Their attitude to this special science of theirs is illustrated in a conversation which Rauschning had with the Gestapo leader Himmler. The latter, who had prohibited a German scholar from giving lectures in prehistory at Danzig, spoke about this ban to Rauschning as follows: "It doesn't matter one bit whether this, that or the other is the real truth about the early history of the Germanic tribes. Hypotheses change every other year, and science goes from one to the next. So there is no real reason why the party shouldn't stipulate a particular hypothesis as a starting point, even if it contradicts prevailing scientific opinion. The important thing, and this is why the state pays these fellows, the professors, GL, is to have such thoughts on history as will confirm our people in the national pride it needs. We know also how central a role anti-Semitism 198 played in National Socialist philosophy, and Hitlerian propaganda. When, however, Rauschning was talking to Hitler about this question and naively asking him if he intended to exterminate the Jews, Hitler replied, "No. Otherwise we would have to invent them again. It is always important for us to have a visible enemy, not just an abstract one, and when the notorious protocols of the wise men of Zion that had figured centrally in the Hitler rights pogrom agitation came up in the same discussion, Rauschning expressed doubts as to their authenticity. Hitler answered, "One don't care a damn whether the story is true historically. Even if it isn't, it sounds all the more convincing. We could add umpteen further examples, even from the limited material available on the fascist leaders, 199 to these personal convictions. But those we have cited will more than suffice, I think, to illustrate the attitude of Hitler and his cronies to their own theory. We should just add that Hitler, again in a conversation with Rauschning, described the central thesis of his own social demagogic, so-called Prussian socialism, as stupid nonsense 100. All this clearly reflects the foundations of National Socialist methodology. But we can also readily round them out from Hitler's writings. Here too we shall refer only to a couple of main points that make it evident that, with Hitler and his colleagues, we are not simply dealing with a false and dangerous theory in need of refutation with intellectual arguments. What we are dealing with is a hodgepodge, concocted with unscrupulous demagogy, of the most diverse reactionary theories for which the only criterion was whether they would enable Hitler to hoodwink the masses. This kind of propaganda derived, in Hitler, from a cavalier contempt for the people. He wrote, "The people, in its overwhelming majority, is so feminine in temperament and attitude that emotional feeling determines its thoughts and actions far more than sober consideration." 1101. Here, as we can see, Hitler was translating the results of imperial aristocratic epistemology, and the social philosophy of mass concentration, Vermissung, into the language of practical demagogy. It was from this viewpoint that he elaborated his propaganda methods. Suggestion was to be substituted for conviction, and a torrid atmosphere of blind faith, the hysterical faith of men in despair, was to be engendered by all possible means. Here again the vitalist campaign against reason, irrespective of how much of it Hitler knew, formed the philosophical basis for a shared demagogic technique. Hitler's originality lay in the fact that he was the first to apply techniques of American advertising to German politics and propaganda. His object was to stupefy and defraud the masses. In his magnum opus he admitted that his goal was a demagogic one, that of breaking down men's free will and capacity to think. By what tricks this goal could be achieved was the only question to which Hitler devoted close and deciduous study. In so doing he examined all conceivable external details of the power of suggestion, of the susceptibility of the masses. Again, let us quote a single example. In all these instances, it is a matter of making inroads on man's freedom of will. Naturally this applies most to assemblies, where men of basically opposed wills come together and must now be won over to a new will. In the morning and even throughout the day, men's volitional powers seem to resist with the utmost energy any attempt to impose on them an alien will and opinion. In the evening, on the other hand, they will succumb more readily to the ruling force of a stronger act of will. For in truth, every such assembly represents a contest between two opposed forces. Now the outstanding eloquence of a dominating apostle type will more easily convert to the fresh will men who themselves have already undergone a perfectly natural weakening of their powers of resistance than those who are still in full possession of their intellectual and volitional powers. 102. Hitler expressed himself with the same cynicism with regard to his own party program. He conceded that in the course of time, changes might become objectively necessary. But he automatically repudiated such changes on principle. Every attempt at this, however, has usually dire results. For it throws open to discussion something that was supposed to be unshakably firm. For how do we propose to instill blind faith in the correctness of a doctrine if we ourselves spread uncertainty and doubt through constant alterations to its outer structure? 1103. This propaganda technique is connected with one of the few straight points of Hitler's philosophy. Hitler was passionately opposed to objective truth, and he contested objectivity in every sphere of life. He regarded himself as the agent for a capitalist display whose purposes he was striving to achieve with ruthlessly crafty propaganda techniques, in conscious independence of any objective truth or accuracy. In this respect he was truly the clever pupil of American advertising. When he was discussing the techniques of propaganda, this intrinsic character of his sometimes found an unwittingly grotesque expression. Again, let us give one example. What, for instance, would you say to a poster which was intended to commend a new soap, but which also described other soaps as now? Exactly the same goes for political 1104 advertising. This fusion of German vitalism and American advertising was no accident either. Both are manifestations of the imperialist age. Both appeal to the desolation and disorientation of the people of this age, to their imprisonment in a fetishized category system belonging to monopoly capitalism. They played on men's numb suffering under the system and their inability to break free from it. But the American system of advertising was aimed at the man in the street, appealing to his most immediate daily needs, and in these the objective standardization through monopoly capitalism was mingled with a vague desire within this framework to stay personal. Vitalism, on the other hand, reached out via extremely circuitous routes to the intellectual elite, where the inner resistance to standardization was much more fiery, albeit objectively speaking equally hopeless. Hence advertising techniques were cynically demagogic from the outset, an immediate expression of monopoly capitalism, whereas vitalism was for a long time pursued bona fide or at least with indirect, quasi-scientific and quasi-literary means. But for all their differences they were united objectively considered in distracting attention from all objectivity, in the one-sided appeal to feelings, experiences, etc., and in trying to eliminate and pour contempt on reason and independent, rational judgment. There was, therefore, a specific social necessity which explains why the Products and the method of vitalism were conveyed to the streets with the tools of American advertising, and that Hitler combined in his own person vitalism and monopoly capitalism. The latter's most advanced techniques, that is, American techniques, were coupled with its most advanced imperialist reactionary ideology, that is, the German ideology. The very possibility of this parallel, this unity indicates that we can only understand and criticize all the barbarity, cynicism and so forth of the Hitler period by considering the economics, social structure and social trends of monopoly capitalism. Any attempt to interpret Hitlerism as a revival of some barbarism or other will miss the most crucial specific features of German fascism. It is only from the angle of these cynical, unscrupulous advertising techniques that we can accurately portray the Hitler fascists' so-called ideology, for all that they ever asked was, what use is this idea, what advantage does it have? In total independence of objective truth, which, indeed, they vehemently and scornfully rejected. In this they were in complete agreement with modern philosophy from Nietzsche via pragmatism up to our own day. Now, however, these coarse and muscular advertising techniques join forces with the products of imperialist vitalism, the philosophy of the most refined minds of this period. For that agnosticist irrationalism which had gone on developing in Germany from Nietzsche, Dilthey and Simmel to Klages, Heidegger and Jaspers had as its final outcome a repudiation of objective truth no less vehement than that which Hitler voiced from other motives and with other arguments. Thus vitalist irrationalism's relevance to fascist philosophy did not hang on individual epistemological findings. These, difficult and subtle, were only meant for small intellectual circles. It had to do with a general spiritual mood of radical doubt concerning the possibility of objective knowledge and the value of reason and understanding, as also with a blind faith in intuitive, irrational prophecies contradicting reason and understanding. In short, it had to do with an atmosphere of hysterical, superstitious credulity whereby the obscurantism of the campaign against objective truth, reason and understanding appeared to be the last word in modern science and the most advanced epistemology. These affiliated tendencies helped to create an intellectual atmosphere facilitating the upsurge and infiltration of the fascist madness. Because of them Rosenberg, the leading National Socialist ideologist, had a certain sympathy with the most right-wing proponents of irrationalist vitalism. Spengler and Klages, for instance, he mentioned in approving tones, although he dismissed the concrete substance of their doctrine and regarded their whole activity as having been superseded through the birth of National Socialism. For while vitalist irrationalism was indispensable to the intellectual climate surrounding fascism, it was itself too refined, ethereal, subtle and too indirectly linked with the aims of German monopoly capitalism to be exploited directly for coarsely demagogic purposes. What was needed for these was precisely that association between vitalism and racialism which we have noted in Chamberlain. Here Hitler and Rosenberg found the intellectual tools directly applicable to their demagogic purposes on the one hand, the philosophy for a German intelligentsia infected by reaction, and on the other, the basis for a solid and brutal demagogy, a doctrine seemingly plain to everyone, with which to bemuse the masses wandering in a despairing search for salvation. The Nazis took over from Chamberlain the inward racial theory, the deciding of racial characteristics on an intuitive basis. Although their propaganda made much of so-called physiological characteristics, shape of skull, color of hair, eyes, etc., intuition was the essential criterion nevertheless. One of the Hitler movement's official philosophers, Ernst Krieg, stated this relationship to biology quite openly. Biological philosophy, however, signifies something intrinsically different from laying philosophical foundations with the existing specialist science of biology. 11.11.05 Hence, Rosenberg too, in his programmatic writings, talked much more about soul than about objective racial characteristics. He argued this with the pronouncement, soul means race as seen from within. 1106 That was a direct continuation of Chamberlain's racial theory, but we also find that Rosenberg was a zealous student of Chamberlain in all the other most important conditions. Like the latter he denied causality. Like the latter he rejected any investigation of origins. And like his teacher he dismissed the existence of a universal history of mankind. Only individual races, and notably the Aryans, the Germanic race, had any history. But even theirs was only a history in outward appearance. In reality, he claimed, the good in a race could not change on this issue. Rosenberg stated, in essence the first major mythical pinnacle of achievement is not further consummated, but simply assumes different forms. The value which inspirits a god or hero is perennial, in good as in evil. One form of Odin has died, but Odin is an eternal reflection of the primal spiritual powers of Nordic man is as much alive today as 5,000 years ago, and he summed up the conclusions to this postulate as follows. The latest possible knowledge of a race is already enclosed in its initial myth. 1107 With this, vitalism's inner conflict reached its conclusion. It resolved the dichotomy between objectively anti-historical, anthropological typology, and the attempt to argue, on this very basis, a non-principled, irrationalist theory of history. Naturally this conflict was resolved, as Chamberlain above all had foreshadowed in one way, and Spengler, Klages, Heidegger et al. In others, as a victory for anti-historicism and a theoretical abolition of history. This brought to light in full clarity the objective theoretical impossibility of comprehending history methodologically after excluding the idea of progress. If Rosenberg, here, was putting a drastic end to all imperialist pseudo-historicism, he was only drawing, in his mythical demagogic manner, all the conclusions of a position already implicit in the cautious antinomies of a thinker like Dilthey. This interpretation of race conformed not only to Chamberlain, but also to Gobineau. As its inevitable sequel, any transformation was viewed as only a corruption caused by miscegenation. Hence Rosenberg eagerly adopted Chamberlain's idea of tribal chaos, with Roman Catholicism and Judaism as the two principal menaces. Hence, like Chamberlain, he regarded it as the central failing of Germanic life that it had no indigenous religion. In view of Rosenberg's total insignificance as a thinker, it would be tedious to examine where he copied Chamberlain word for word and where he modified him. What is important is the method whereby he turned Chamberlain's reactionary literary sentiments into an action program for national and social demagogy. The heightening of Chamberlain's activist doctrine, in contrast to the fatalism of Gobineau and the social Darwinists, was the most significant element here. Hitler and Rosenberg took up 3 of Chamberlain's main points. Firstly, the concept of tribal chaos and resistance to it. Secondly, the racial capacity for self-regeneration. And thirdly, racial theory as an up-to-date substitute for religion. All 3 points they demagogically exaggerated and simplified in the interests of German imperialist aggression. As far as the first point is concerned, Rosenberg too placed Judaism and Rome at the center of the struggle as the chief adversaries. But no longer was the campaign waged in a polite literary manner of the kind which Chamberlain, especially at the outset, had displayed, with his constant deference to outstanding individual Jews and Catholics. Instead there sprang up an overt and unscrupulous pogrom demagogy. For Chamberlain, the Jews were already agents of the portentous idea of equality. Now, capitalism and socialism were paired together as the consequences. They were taken as equivalents and challenged as current manifestations of tribal chaos. Here again an old reactionary tradition was contributing to the social demagogy of the Hitler movement. As we know, during the 19th century the contradictions of the capitalist system produced everywhere a romantic anti-capitalist movement. Initially, this was of relatively substantial scientific merit because of its lively critique of these contradictions, and Sismondi went so far as to demonstrate the inevitability of economic crises in capitalism. The young Carlyle performed similar work in the social field. The 1848 revolution, the emergence of scientific socialism and its amalgamation with the revolutionary working class quickly changed the face of romantic anti-capitalism. It was, as an ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, backward-looking from the beginning, in Sismondi, towards the simple pre-capitalist production of goods. In Carlyle, towards the ordered economy of the Middle Ages in contrast to capitalist anarchy. The purely ideological aspect of romantic anti-capitalism's development preserved this backward-looking tendency. And that was all the more so because the closely related tendency to oppose culture to civilization necessarily entailed a critique of the capitalist lack of culture from the standpoint of great bygone cultures. But the necessity of also forming a view on socialism, as a movement leading beyond capitalism, brought about a fundamental change of direction. The principle of order was sought and located in capitalism itself to a mounting extent, although without relinquishing that critique of capitalist culture that drew its criteria from the past. But, from now on, the force that might lead away from anarchy was sought in big capitalism itself. That was already Carlyle's standpoint after the revolution in 1848. Nietzsche, as we have seen, provided the most vivid formulation of this contradictory twofold tendency on the eve of the imperialist age. This social situation, and the intellectual situation it determined, had 2 consequences. Firstly, capitalism's good sides had to be distinguished from its bad ones. Proudhon had already made this point, and vulgar liberal apologetics were always at pains to depict the bad sides as volatile, incidental features of capitalism. But this trend could only become a component of romantic anti-capitalism when an indirect apologetic began to defend the capitalist system precisely from the angle of its bad sides, the development of this apologetic being expected to surmount the anarchy of vulgar liberal capitalism, to bring a new order nearer. In short, romantic anti-capitalism would have to be turned into an ideology of imperialist capitalism. Secondly, and in very close connection with this change, the rebuttal of socialism was coupled with this new attitude to capitalism. Socialism was now presented as the continuation and extension of those anti-cultural tendencies, threats to human personality, that were being contested in capitalism. And it was expected of imperialism, of regulated capitalism, that they would in practice vanquish those tendencies. One factor aided this change of direction. The bourgeois intelligentsia's loss of all culture, all knowledge in the economic field since the collapse of classical economics. Thus the economic contrast between capitalism and socialism lay beyond the horizon of its awareness. And since socialism aimed at surmounting capitalism in a forward direction, that is, progressively, via a higher development of the productive forces, and since by that the intellectuals understood only technology and division of labor, it was easy for such identifications of the repudiated capitalism with socialism to come about. One of the first to formulate this identification in an impressive way was Dostoevsky, in Notes from the Underground. Philosophically, Nietzsche once again was the successful proponent of this idea, summing up everything reprehensible about capitalism under the heading of democracy. Spengler and others followed suit. Thus, here again, Rosenberg was heir to an erroneous attitude that had been long developing, and so he could easily employ it for his demagogic ends. Thus he declared war on the last anarchic offshoots of liberal commercial imperialism, whose victims in their despair became involved with Bolshevik Marxism in order to finish off what democracy began, the 1108 extermination of racial and national consciousness. And elsewhere Rosenberg wrote, raceless authority demanded the anarchy of freedom. Rome and Jacobinism in its ancient forms and its later, purest formation in Babeuf and Lenin condition each other. 1109 Internally this interpretation of history formed, to Rosenberg's mind, the ideological basis for social demagogy. Marxism in its struggle against capital was, according to Rosenberg, falsifying the real proposition and working in the interests of international Jewry. Racialists, on the other hand, had to ask in whose hands this capital lies, and by what principles it is regulated, guided or supervised. This last issue is the crucial one. Racialism made it possible to simplify all romantic anti-capitalism's complicated thought processes into a question of ownership. According to racial qualifications, fascist social demagogy was bent on sustaining German reactionary monopoly capitalism, on saving it from the revolutionary danger which sparked off the Great Economic Crisis. Hence this distinction by Rosenberg, and hence Feder's distinction between capital that is grasping, refend, and capital that is creative, schaffend. In monetary and commercial capital, the non-proletarian masses saw their direct exploitation by turning this point to advantage, and with the aid of racialist social demagogy, the extremely widespread mass bitterness at being exploited through monopoly capitalism was steered into anti-Semitic channels. 1110. But at the same time, the Chamberlain concept of tribal chaos was also used as an argument for imperialist aggression. Those states against which German imperialism's greed for conquest was chiefly aimed were depicted as a racial chaos. This applied above all to Russia, but also to France. The latter was scarcely to be considered a European state any longer today, but rather an offshoot of Africa, led by Jews. Hitler too called France an African state on European soil. Hitler and Rosenberg, we see, were arguing the aggressive goals of German imperialism in principle, from racialist precepts. It is perhaps worth commenting that, here again, the fascists' so-called philosophy resembled an advertising poster which could have a new one of diametrically opposed content pasted over it when they had something different to sell. Thus when the Nazis were hoping to create a European coalition against the Soviet Union with the help of the Four-Power Agreement, Rosenberg promptly forgot all that he had written about the blackening and befouling of the French. The France he was trying to win as a temporary ally was suddenly no longer bastardized, but a farming country whose decisive basic feature had become a worship of the soil. 112. That is, something positive in the eyes of National Socialist philosophy, as far as the second question, race regeneration, is concerned. Hitler expressly admitted it. He wrote, at the basis of it there lies a natural process of regeneration, albeit a slow one, which gradually eliminates racial impurities again as long as a basic supply of racially pure elements is still present and no further bastardization takes place. Brought fascism into line with such optimistic racialists as Chamberlain and Waltman as well. For these 1113 this view offers, however, all that would save racial purity was a complex of racial hygienic measures. And these fascism proceeded to adopt marriage control, prohibition on marriage, etc., but it handled them as tools of a terrible and arbitrary tyranny. Hitler knew full well that skull measurements, family trees and the like can be used to prove anything, and also the very opposite. Hence he applied these devices systematically as a means of pressure and extortion. As Ernst Krieg wrote, race is assessed by the type and degree of potential achievement for the whole life of the race and nation. 1114. That amounts to saying that, on the one hand, racial purity in the fascist system is the precondition of all forward movement and indeed of any moderately tolerable life. On the other hand, however, it depended entirely on the whim of the fascist man in power who was to be considered a member of the pure race, and to a non-member for a Goebbels, the most suspicious appearance and the most dubious ancestry might be of no account. In one instance, while somebody else who ventured to express a reservation on some issue could be instantly pronounced a mongrel and condemned as Jewified in mind and character, it is here evident why fascism appropriated Chamberlain's inward, intuitionist definition of race when propagating racial theory in mass assemblies. It was useful to operate with exact, visible and easily comprehensible racial characteristics. For the ruling machinery of fascist despotism, on the other hand, the inward criterion as formulated by Krieg was the most suitable precisely because it was the most arbitrary. Thus the regeneration and preservation of racial purity were used as an instrument for keeping the whole German people in a condition of slavish obedience, and thus for inculcating that mindlessness, servility and lack of public spiritedness which had always been hallmarks of the German distress, but which had never before reached the pitch it did under fascism and Hitler's racial policy. It was typical of the way this fascist ethic developed. That Chamberlain already presented loyalty as a specific moral attribute of Germanic man. As an example, and again this is very typical, Chamberlain cited the German mercenaries who had played a vile, cruel, always counter-revolutionary and anti-progressive role in return for money throughout Europe. The old German Democrats stigmatized this mercenary period as a disgrace to Germany, but Chamberlain already saw it as a morally cardinal racial characteristic. And Krieg, when writing of the heroic man, formulated his essence as follows: destiny demands of the heroic man the sense of honor which submits to every order. 1115. But that does not exhaust the significance of this complex for the Hitler movement. On the one hand, it was exploited in order to obtain and to establish unlimited rule by a minority in Germany herself. Rosenberg, paraphrasing Chamberlain, stated that no nation was racially unitarian, not even the German. From this it followed that the dominance of the higher-ranking, purer race, the Nordic, needed safeguarding by every possible means. Rosenberg maintained that there were at least 5 races in Germany, but that only the Nordic was bearing genuine cultural fruit. He went on, this emphasizing of the Nordic race does not mean any sowing of racial hatred in Germany. It means the reverse, the conscious acknowledgement of a sanguine cementing link within our nationhood. The day that Nordic blood runs completely dry, Germany would fall apart and go to the wall in anonymous chaos. According to Rosenberg, the axiomatic carrier of this Nordic blood was the National Socialist movement. This was the new nobility. Its stock was 80% Nordic, and verification in the movement signified more than a head index count. Here we see at the 1116 same time the modernization of reactionary thought through racial theory. Although fascism retained the predominance of the Prussian Junker caste, it turned it into one part only of the new nobility. The Junkers had to share their old parasitical life with new parasites, the Nazi movement's upper crust. So that no part of this racially determined nobility should want for anything, fascism intended to extend each one's field of operation to immeasurable lengths. Thus Rosenberg planned to create a nobility of blood and achievement, on the basis of racial purity. In the above sentences we have touched already on the further and intrinsic goal of German fascism, namely German dominance over the whole world. Fascism adopted all the old dreams of mastery and claims to dominion of the worst German chauvinism, but exceeded them many times over. If we consider this issue in connection with National Socialist philosophy, we must first take a look at its aristocratic character and pseudo-biological foundation. Hitler said of racial theory that it proceeded from the higher or lesser value of the different races. And it feels obliged by this knowledge, in accordance with the eternal will that rules this universe, to support the victory of the better and stronger, to demand the subordination of the worse and weaker. It thus honors in principle nature's aristocratic basic idea and believes in the force of this 1118 law down to the last individual being. With Nietzsche and in social Darwinism, the biological argument for the dominance of the exploiting classes and the colonizing nations was already an ideology of inhumanity. For it presented the oppressed person as a fundamentally different creature, as biologically born to be exploited and enslaved. Hitler went further still. He wrote, so the presence of lower men was one of the most important prerequisites for the forming of higher cultures. It is certain that the first human culture was based less on the tamed animal than on the employment of lower men. 1119 In racialist eyes the Aryan or German was a living being qualitatively different from the other human races in every respect. In no sphere of human activity did they speak a common language. Understanding between them was impossible in principle unless a corruption and sullying of racial purity ensued. The slightest humane feeling towards the enemies of fascism who, according to interracial theory, belonged ero ipso to low races was a sign of racial impurity in anyone who felt such an emotion. Thus fascism inculcated a dogmatic inhumanity in the whole German people. Or rather, in view of our above statements, it subjected the whole people to a tyrannical pressure that forced a bestial inhumanity on all, offered rewards for it and threatened all who acted humanely with expulsion from the popular community with ostracism. The qualitative division of men into higher and lower races permeated the whole National Socialist philosophy. In the philosophical field we have already come across this doctrine in Chamberlain, and Rosenberg assiduously executed his germinal ideas in all spheres of epistemology, aesthetics, and so on. This, however, was only an ideological foundation for the atrocious praxis of National Socialism, a praxis applied to the best of the German people from the outset, and to other nations from the start of the World War, to the horror, disgust and hatred of mankind. Hence Rosenberg, after stressing Chamberlain's merits, was quite justified in saying, world history as racial history is today's repudiation of this declining doctrine of 1120 humanitas. The point of this theory was to induce the Germans to treat as animals all dissenters at home and members of alien races further afield, as beasts of burden and cattle for the slaughterhouse respectively. Thus the Hitler-Rosenberg type of German imperialist aggression constituted, in racialist form, a philosophy of modernized cannibalism. It extracted from racialism's reactionary theory of inequality all the barbaric consequences possible, and took them to bestial extremes. Hence the constant criticizing by Hitler and Rosenberg of the old type of chauvinism and nationalism. This critique was, in part, a demagogic intended to win over those masses who were dissatisfied with the old Hohenzollern regime, and who could never therefore be enlisted for the cause of its renewal. Weakness of the German nationalists, propaganda. This critique, however, was moving in the direction of a heightened aggressive chauvinism. In its own view, the old Hohenzollern nationalism had been insufficiently aggressive, far too humane and irresolute. Hitler rebuffed the old Hohenzollern plans for colonization and expansion. He criticized especially sharply the aim of assimilating conquered nations by force through Germanization. What he advocated was extermination. It was not clear to people, he explained, that Germanization can only be practiced on the 1121 land itself, never on human beings. That is to say, the German Reich ought to expand, conquer fertile lands and expel or wipe out their population. Long before seizing power, Hitler already had the following program: the foreign policy of the national state must safeguard the existence, on this planet, of the races epitomized by the state by creating a healthy, sturdy and natural relationship between the number and the growth of the people on the one hand, and the greatness and goodness of the ground and soil on the other. 1122. This fascist theory of Lebensraum was the basis for Hitlerite Germany's criminal attack on the Soviet Union. It is clear from Hitler's Mein Kampf that the fascist movement was founded on this plan from the very beginning. Here it is interesting to note again how the fascist leaders stood with regard to their own theory. As we have seen, the so-called theoretical basis of both the internal construction and the outward aggression was the dominance of Nordic blood. Hence Hitler and Rosenberg were perpetually flirting with the tribally related Nordic peoples. But it turned out during the World War that these peoples were not prepared to join the European New Order of their own accord or to be made quislings. Thereupon Rosenberg, in a communique which he wrote with Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, suddenly declared that these peoples were not fully qualified Aryans but a mere national composite, a bastardized race with Finnish Mongolian, Slav, Celtic Gallic and other elements. The simultaneous axis of Berlin-Rome-Tokyo, which involved going along with the Japanese imperialists, determined the propagation of the Japanese as the Oriental Prussians. Thus here too, racial theory for Hitler and Rosenberg was merely a propaganda instrument, a mere soap advertisement, for aggressive German imperialism. So Hitler and Rosenberg proclaimed with total cynicism the bestial idea of Germany's conquest of the world. Within Germany, SA and SS jackboots were to trample on anything that might obstruct these fiendish plans, above all, the labor movement, but also, every vestige of reason, science, humanity. In order to create the atmosphere needed to carry out the education of the German masses in these atrocities, everything from the past was revived that smacked of the reactionary, chauvinistic and inhuman. In this context we must now consider the third problem complex. The resumption of Chamberlain's plan of an indigenous German religion. National Socialism's despotic rule could tolerate no other ideological power beside itself. It was inevitable that National Socialist philosophy should evolve into a religious substitute. Essential to this process, once again, was the modernizing tendency already visible in Chamberlain. Rosenberg, himself decadently disorganized intellectual, had a flair for those ideological perplexities which, after the collapse of the World War, arose in Germany. Chiefly within the intelligentsia, a breaking away from the old religious beliefs and, at the same time, an immense need of a new belief or superstition which found expression in gullibility, obscurantism and confused searching. Accordingly he wrote, millions are roaming at large between the armed forces of Marxist chaos and the adherents of the Church, inwardly in complete disorder and at the mercy of confusing dogmas and avaricious prophets, but also driven for the most part by a powerful longing for new values and new forms. 1123 Even such a reactionary of the old school as the deposed Kaiser wrote to Chamberlain in 1923, the Church has failed. 1124 Thus everywhere it went, the National Socialist movement claimed that it was founding a new religion. Admittedly Hitler himself, before seizing power, was careful not to alienate the followers of historical beliefs whom he wanted to win over on this issue. He therefore proclaimed religious freedom and the neutrality of the National Socialist movement on the religious question, but after coming to power, he clearly demonstrated how he interpreted religious freedom in practice with his suppression of Catholicism, undermining of the Protestant Church and persecution of recalcitrant Catholics and Orthodox Protestant believers. This tendency, however, was plainly evident from Rosenberg's writings even before the coup. Rosenberg adopted, as we have already stressed, the Lagarde-Chamberlain plan for the Germanization of Christianity. The Old Testament had to be abolished as a religious primer. 125 Jesus as a German was already one of the points in Chamberlain's program for religious renewal. With Rosenberg, Christ was already wearing SA jackboots. Jesus appears to us today as a self.1126 aware master. And Rosenberg laid down in the same breath that this Aryanized, de-Judaized Christianity must be rendered a supine agent of fascist imperial policy, but a German religious movement bent on developing into a national one will have to declare that the ideal of charity is at all costs to be subordinated to the idea of national honor. 1127 What Hitler and Rosenberg understood by national honor has emerged clearly enough from the aforegoing exposition. To create this fascist religious substitute, Rosenberg made his racial theory culminate in the myth of Germanic greatness, again through an eclectic summary of all the reactionary tendencies of a century, from romantic feudalism to imperialist vitalism. He cited as his objective, to embody the aspiration of the Nordic racial soul, as symbolized by popular myth, in the German church. That is for me the greatest task of our century. Hitler himself explained to Rauschning in 1932, one can only be either a German or a Christian. One cannot be both. One cannot turn Jesus into an Aryan. That is nonsense. Again, it is interesting to note what Hitler thought of the racialist endeavors of his personal philosophers, Chamberlain and Rosenberg. He went on, what can we do? The same as the Catholic Church 1128 did when it imposed its faith on the heathen, to conserve what is usable while changing its meaning. All these German fascist tendencies, demagogic in form and willfully despotic in content and nature, 1129, were concentrated in the country's political theory and practice. As we know, Germany in the modern age developed on lines different to those taken by Western Europe, as also Russia. Whereas everywhere else, the dissolution of feudalism gave rise to unified nation-states, in Germany it led to a political fragmentation. Hence Lenin was right in saying that the central issue of the bourgeois revolution in Germany was the creation of national unity. In the development of Germany, this situation produced various results which were peculiar to the country, but always unfavorable and connected with the reinforcement of reactionary ideas. Firstly, absolutism in Germany lacked those progressive features that were visible wherever it was the organ for establishing the political unity of a nation. Secondly, this line of development was connected with the belated and feeble development of the bourgeois class and with a long retention of relics of feudalism and the political predominance of the nobility. Thirdly, the bourgeois democratic revolution was weaker, less clear-cut and more susceptible to reactionary distractions than elsewhere, since its chief task was the setting up of a missing central power and not the progressive democratic transformation of one that already existed. Naturally enough, these features also governed the development of German ideology. Marx stated the following about the belated class development in Germany linked with this trend: the necessary result was that during the epoch of absolute monarchy, which occurred here in its very lamest, semi-patriarchal form, the particular sphere into which the administration of public affairs fell through the division of labor acquired an abnormal independence, which modern bureaucracy took further still. The state thus constituted itself as a seemingly autonomous power and has preserved in Germany to this day a position, a transitional stage, which was only temporary in other countries. 1130 Thus in other countries the ideology of absolutism, even if it turned the state into a leviathan, distinctly reflected class struggles and class interests, as also the position and function of the state in these conflicts, albeit by no means fully or consciously. But in Germany, because of the backwardness we have outlined, there arose the theory of the state as the embodiment of the absolute idea, a theory which degenerated into a state mystique and idolatry. This is also clearly visible in Hegel's law philosophy. Reactionary tendencies of both the 19th and the 20th century proceeded along these lines in many respects. Without question, state idolatry was one of the ideological mainstays of that retrograde critique of the Western democracies, that glorification of German backwardness, of which we have repeatedly spoken. Exploiting and underlining the backward facets of Hegelian philosophy, imperialist neo-Hegelianism played a role of some significance in this development. Only, fascism was not simply a continuation of conventional reactionary trends but a qualitatively outstanding peak of Germany's reactionary development. Dimitrov rightly remarked that in fascism, one bourgeois government was not simply replaced by another, but that a change of system ensued. Fascist demagogy with regard to the state question was very closely linked with this situation. Here, as in other fields, Hitler again adopted a demagogic pseudo-revolutionary stance in order to exploit for propaganda purposes the disappointment of the masses at Germany's political development so far and their alienation from the state. In attacking the existing political system and its ideological champions, he adopted a radical and even revolutionary posture. Hitler wrote, "We cannot have state authority as an end in itself, for in the case all tyranny on this earth would be unassailable and sanctioned, but in general we must never forget that the highest purpose of human existence is not to maintain a state or indeed a government, but to preserve the national character. Once, however, this itself is in danger of being suppressed or even eliminated, the question of legality will play a subordinate role. Human rights can break political rights." Hitler now infers from these premises that the state represents not an end but a means. It may well be the precondition of a superior 1151 human culture, only it is not the cause of it. Rather, this lies exclusively in the existence of a race with cultural potentialities. 1152 Hitler's extreme anti-democratism also finds expression in this spuriously revolutionary demagogy. Again it does so, to be sure, in a mendaciously demagogic manner whereby Hitler exploited all the reactionary nonsense that German imperialist ideologists had concocted to argue the superiority of a backward Germany to the Western democracies. Here, as in his definition of the state itself, Hitler naturally centered his agitation on the cunning demagogy of racialism. Democracy was, as Chamberlain had claimed, a Judaized institution. Only the Jew can praise an institution as grubby and false as himself. 1133 Hitler did not, however, oppose the old German monarchy to the despised Western Jewish democracy, as did the common or garden reactionaries of the old school. As a banner for the despotic arbitrary government he was planning, Hitler devised a new demagogic watchword, Germanic democracy. As opposed to Jewish democracy, he stated, there was the true Germanic democracy of the freely elected leader, with his obligation to accept complete responsibility for his deeds and omissions. In this democracy, there is no majority poll on individual issues but only the ruling of a single person, who must then back his decision with his possessions and life. 1134 The content of this demagogy also has a long preliminary history. Here let us just recall Max Weber's conversation with Ludendorff. In another passage Hitler gave an even clearer definition of the essence of Germanic democracy, authority of every leader reaching downwards, and responsibility 1135 reaching upwards. It will be plain to anyone familiar with German history that this so-called principle of Germanic democracy was nothing more than a modernized rehashing of the axiom of Prussia's King Friedrich XI, a propos military organization, that the soldiers needed to fear their subalterns more than the enemy. As a general point it must not be overlooked that this professedly new political theory of Hitler was deeply rooted in the Prusso-German political development and its thinking. Indeed, Hitler's idea of the leader was no more than a modernized, plebiscitary variant of the old Prussian king concept, the theory of personal rule, by a king answerable only to God for his deeds. It was connected also with the restoration theory of Haller, who viewed the state as the autocratically run private possession of the king. With the political theory of the Prussian conservatives, theorist, Stahl, who was philosophically dependent on the later Schelling. And with the views of the romantic reactionary Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was influenced by Haller and Stahl. This was the king who would not suffer a sheet of paper, the Constitution, to stand between king and nation and encroach on the autonomous freedom of action of the divinely inspired king, and so forth. Germanic democracy was of course a brusque denial of human equality. Hitler wrote, "It does not dawn on this depraved bourgeois world that it is truly committing a sin against all reason. That it is a criminal folly to train a congenital semi-ape until he looks like a barrister, while millions belonging to the most highly bred race have to remain in wholly unworthy positions." Rosenberg formulated with even more brutal cynicism this racial doctrine of the inequality of men as a matter of principle. In 1932, in connection with the Potempa trial and the death sentence passed on a number of swinish Nazi butchers of working people, Nazis whom Hitler assured of his sympathy in a telegram, Rosenberg voiced his thoughts thus: "This reveals the vast chasm which will divide forever. 1136 Our thinking, our sense of justice from liberalism and reaction. It is characteristic of the justice prevailing today and encrusting all the people's healthy instincts of self-preservation that one man be deemed equal to 1137 another. At first glance we are here dealing merely with brash and hollow demagogy intended to exploit the disappointment of the masses with the Weimar Republic and to stir them into pseudo-revolutionary in reality, counter-revolutionary activity. But much more than this was at stake. To be sure, the Hitlerian state brought about a ghastly realization of all reactionary dreams about the omnipotence of the state. Never was there a state so immeasurably powerful, never a despotism that could interfere so freely with the whole of men's lives. But here again, we are dealing not with straightforward willful encroachments, but with the fiendishly tyrannical nature of the fascist state. The National Socialist regime, said Stuckart, a Secretary of State, embraces comprehensively the earthly existence of the German. That is to say, the state was entitled to intervene at will in every single aspect of an individual's life. And Hitlerian fascism rejected as a matter of principle any protection of individual rights and any legal safeguard That again would be liberalism, a liberal view of the state. Lukacs continued, placed the individual and society in antithesis to the state in that it thought it necessary to make provision for freeing the state citizen from the bonds of a paramount political force and for protecting his personal rights. From 138 state interference, German fascism destroyed these safeguards of the personal rights of the individual. Thus, after Hitler's coup, the pseudo-revolutionary demagogic polemic against the old political theories turned into a substantiation of the absolute, unlimited despotism of the Hitler clique. Its political theory served primarily to give this unlimited and arbitrary despotism a theoretical basis and to wipe out justice and the safeguarding of justice both in theory and in practice in the fascist state. Rosenberg formulated clearly the fascist theory of justice by resorting to a purportedly ancient Indian legal precept: justice is that which Aryan men hold to be right before seizing power. Hitler had already programmatically opposed equality before the law in a political context by distinguishing, for the benefit of the future state, between the racially pure citizen and the member of the state who enjoyed no rights at all. This principle was executed in the fascist state on the basis of interracial theory. The aforesaid Secretary of State, Lukacs, argued that the conferring of state citizenship on any individual followed an individual test of his worthiness, but who is to be regarded as having a racial affiliation of blood is not expressly stated in the 1140 decisions on this were subject to the unlimited arbitrariness of Hitler's ruling clique. Fascism now likewise advanced this arbitrariness as 1159 the principle, again making a demagogic appeal to that bitterness which the democratic state's formal equality before the law had evoked in the broad masses in view of the crying material inequality. The New Reich, wrote Lukacs, is no longer a constitutional state but a philosophical state based on German customs, with reference to the evolution of justice in the Hitler state. Lukacs now laid down that all the old legal categories, including those of the Constitution, had lost their substance. The formal constitutional concept has lost its meaning for the German right. 1141 Thus the population was totally lacking in rights and absolutely dependent on the whims of the ruling Hitler clique. The explanation provided to account for this condition was that the National Socialist state was breaking with the old bourgeois neutrality and objectivity of the earlier state. It was again intended to use the anger of the masses at the older state's hypocritical impartiality to win credulous acceptance of this fascist despotism as marking a step forward. Another fascist Secretary of State, Roland Freisler, President of the Supreme Court, said, "The state consciously makes itself the fighter." For National Socialist philosophy among the German people, the starting point and the goal of all action is not the individual but the people in its perennial sequence of generations. 1142 Germanic democracy was, according to fascist propaganda, thereby realized on an institutional basis that its substance was. In reality, the complete negation of any popular influence on political decisions is evident from what we have expounded so far. But Nazi propaganda aimed at presenting this enslaved condition, this institutionalized servility, as a general raising of the people's political awareness. The Reich's chief press officer, Otto Dietrich, clearly illustrated how the Nazis envisaged this Germanic democracy, and politicizing of the nation. National Socialism, Dietrich wrote, does not ask of the individual that he pursue politics. This art is reserved for a few men who have a calling and a mission. But it asks each single member of the German people to think and feel politically. This political thinking is not complicated, not confusing or scientifically problematic. It is simple, clear and unified, and Dietrich also explained what he meant by that. For the Führer was the executor of the will of the people, not however through election but in consequence of that immanent will to self-affirmation inherent in every nation according to racial bloody 143. All this masquerade of Germanic democracy was no more than the boundless dictatorship of the Führer, that is, through his agency, the dictatorship of the most reactionary and aggressive section of German monopoly capitalism. The tremendous enslavement and mindless servility to which it gave rise is most clearly stated in the introduction to the compilation from which we have quoted Lukacs, Freisler and Dietrich. In it we read the following: all real decision rests with the Führer. If he decides otherwise than is set out in this official compilation, then National Socialism has not changed its views on the matter, but the author has mistaken the true attitude of National 1144 Socialism to this particular problem. This Führer dictatorship could produce only lackeys and profiteers of the most reactionary and aggressive part of German imperialist reaction. Its Germanic democracy reared the repulsive type of a human breed that was boundlessly servile to men of higher rank, and just as boundlessly, cruelly tyrannical towards men below it. The German Messier constantly produced the elements of such a type within the German people. If we look at Germany's progressive literature, we find that it takes this type as its butt time and again. In, for instance, Heinrich Mann's novel Man of Straw, which portrays the Wilhelmine manifestation of the type with devastating satire. But what had hitherto grown up spontaneously, as it were, from German backwardness and its ideological idealization now became a conscious product of Hitler's work of education. Not for nothing did Hitler and Rosenberg, in works fundamental to fascist philosophy, occupy themselves with the questions of morality and education in great detail. Rosenberg placed honor at the center of Aryan Germanic morality just as Chamberlain had put loyalty at its center. What we are to understand by Rosenberg's honor is already patent from what we have discussed so far. It was an empty, high-flown cliché meant to provide a demagogic camouflage for the Hitlerites. Total amorality. Hitler voiced this amorality with similar clarity in private conversation with Rushing. Moralistic platitudes are essential for the masses. There could be no greater mistake for a politician than to be seen posing as the immoral Superman. Of course I shall not make it a matter of principle whether or not to act immorally in the conventional sense. I do not abide, you see, by any principles whatever. That's all. 1145. Now how Hitler envisaged his work of education, in concrete terms, he also told Rushing in no uncertain manner. The latter expressed objections to the abuses going on in the concentration camps. Hitler replied, brutality is respected. The ordinary man in the street only respects brute force and ruthlessness. The people need to be kept in a salutary state of fear. They want to fear something. Why make a fuss over brutality and wax indignant over tortures? The masses want it. They want something that will give them shudders of terror. 1146. This, however, was only one aspect of the work of education, the aspect turned towards the broad masses. For the fascist upper crust, Hitler had already the watchword of limitless corruption: get rich. On this subject too he spoke to Rushing candidly and cynically. 1. Allow my men every liberty, do as you like, but don't get caught at it. Have we pulled things out of the mire just to be sent home empty-handed? But for Hitler, this get rich had a further educational advantage. If the crimes of unreliable party members were known, one had greater control over them. Spying and mutual denunciation would begin in the party elite. Each man is in everyone else's power, and nobody remains his own master. That is the desired result of the slogan get rich. 111,147. Now since the whole of the Third Reich pivoted on a hierarchy of the leader and his following, a structure reaching from caretaker to chancellor, the cynical Hitlerian method with its mixture of corruption and brutalization was able to pervert morally the broadest sections of the German nation. It faced the choice of becoming corrupt hangmen or victims of torture, and this systematic pressure now gave rise to the barbaric type of the Hitler soldier, from whose atrocities all Europe suffered until the Allied victories put an end to his rampaging. The Hitlerites made a principle of barbarity. Hitler spoke to Rushing about it at the time of his conflicts with the Hugenberg German nationals. They regard me as an unwashed barbarian. Yes, we are barbarians, we want to be. The name is an honorable one, we shall rejuvenate the world. 1148. As may be recalled, Nietzsche first voiced this thought, the truth of which was realized in the Imperial World War. In Germany the Hitler regime illustrated the nature of this rejuvenation with its horrible deeds, as did Hitler's army in every corner of Europe. But such deeds, and we can never stress this too heavily, were not isolated excesses but the inevitable consequence of the Hitler regime. It was just what Hitler had intended. On this subject too, he spoke to Rushing with candor in private conversation. My doctrine is a tough one. Every weakness must be driven out of them, the young people trained by Hitler, GL. In my regime's strongholds there will grow up a youth before whom the whole world will tremble. A vehemently active, lordly, callous, brutal youth, that's what I set out to achieve. There must be neither weakness nor mildness in them. I would like to see in their eyes one day a gleam of pride and the independence of beasts of prey. In this way I shall wipe out the effects of a human taming process that has gone on for thousands of years. I shall then command a pure and noble human material. With it we can create a new order, not, of course, by way of the intellect. Learning is harmful for my young men. 1149. They need discipline, and must never fear death. 1150. Here Hitler reveals the real content of Rosenberg's demagogic talk about honor. Hitler did, in fact, put into practice his real goals in this area. Although failing dismally in his ambitious plan to impose German rule on the whole civilized world, he did achieve the corruption and brutalization of a large sector of the German nation. In the process, as we have seen, he skillfully exploited with demagogic cynicism all the obscurantist and reactionary theories which had sprung up in a retarded Germany as and when he needed them. He deliberately cultivated all the instincts both servile and bestial which had flourished in the German Messiah so as to create those hordes with which he overran Europe. But even if we could not conquer it, we would snatch half the world into ruin with us and permit no triumph over Germany. There will be no second 1918. We shall not capitulate. 1151. Whether or not we view the suicide of Hitler, the world criminal, as a capitulation is irrelevant. One thing is certain, 1945 was not a repeat of 1918. The collapse of Hitler's Germany was no straightforward defeat, however crushing, no mere change of system, but the end of a whole line of development. It ended that falsely based German unity which started with the defeat of the 1848 revolution and was complete by 1870-1. It posed this central issue of the German nation entirely afresh once again. Indeed, one may say that the whole misguided history of Germany became due for revision. 100 years before, Alexander von Humboldt, who was really not inordinately radical, had already seen that with the defeat of the Peasants' War, Germany had lost her way. She needed to retrace her steps to that date in order to find the right direction. What had happened since was the inevitable result of it. Not, however, a sequel in the sense of a timeless ontology, but in the sense of a very concrete German history. And thereupon this train of thought brings us to Franz Mehring's shrewd observation that the Battle of Jena was the German version of the storming of the Bastille. And in 1918, we may add, events repeated themselves just as fruitlessly. And a second repetition in 1945 concretely demanded of all thinking and intellectually honest Germans that they draw from this insight all the political, social and philosophical consequences, that they complete voluntarily and internally the externally dictated uprising and radically remove the harmful legacy of the German Middle Ages from the German nation's future road. But this was not a decline, as Hitler demagogically proclaimed, but the start of a process of rebirth. It would be ridiculous, said Stalin as early as 1942, to equate the Hitler clique with the German people and the German state. The experience of history tells us that Hitlers come and go, but the German people and state endure. 1152. In this book we have devoted attention to the ideological or, more strictly, the philosophical side of this development. Seen from such a viewpoint, 1945 signifies primarily this, when irrationalism, the dogmatic and total destruction of reason, became a major country's official worldview, and when that country went to war with its social and ideological adversary, the Socialist Soviet Union. It sustained a crushing defeat. And the defeat was as total as the war had been. Hitlerism cannot be resurrected in that form in which it evolved. Nobody disputes that the imperialist forces which produced it are also operative today, even to a greater degree. We shall discuss in our epilogue the fundamental difference in the situation notwithstanding all the continuously operative, socio-economically parallel tendencies. At this juncture, having portrayed the passage of German irrationalism from theory into practice, and the inevitable collapse of this diabolical world historical climax to a philosophical orientation, it only remains for us to comment on that point which this whole book undertook to demonstrate. It is that both the climax and its collapse were, historically, equally necessary, although not of course in a fatalistic sense. Just as Hitler came to political and military grief not through individual and hence avoidable errors of judgment, so irrationalism as a world outlook received corresponding practical form in Hitlerism, and it perished in a similarly appropriate form. In revealing the nihilistic cynicism of Hitler and his henchmen and in showing that they did not themselves believe in the doctrine they demagogically proclaim, thereby translating it into practice, our studies do not refute these facts of the matter. On the contrary, they confirm them. For it is just here that we find the perfect expression of that dialectical unity of cynical nihilism and speculative, uncritical credulity and frivolous superstition which every irrationalism contains implicitly and which simply acquired a matching figure in Hitler. We underestimate the historical significance of the German destiny, embracing that of the destiny of irrational philosophy, if, in assessing Hitler, we put the accent solely on his low intellectual and moral standards. In itself, to be sure, such an assessment is correct. But it was again historical necessity which caused the lowering of standards. It is a steep descent from Schelling and Schopenhauer via Nietzsche, Dilthey, Spengler, etc. to Hitler and Rosenberg. But in its very steepness, it sufficiently expresses the character of irrationalism and the necessity of its development. Part of this necessity was the adversary against which National Socialism came to grief in practical, politico-military terms, the Socialist Soviet Union. Here we are concerned only with the philosophical aspect of the question. Hitler, in bringing irrationalism to practical fulfillment, was the executor of Nietzsche's spiritual testament and of the philosophical development coming after Nietzsche and from him. We showed in the relevant chapter how inevitable it was that the irrationalism in Nietzsche should turn against socialism. We showed then that he had run up against an opponent that was unknown and, from the irrationalist viewpoint, inscrutable and inaccessible to the understanding. For all the difference in level between Nietzsche the philosopher and Hitler the demagogue in intellect and culture, and as we have stressed, this too expresses the inevitability of the historical development, there was precious little difference in their knowledge and understanding of the adversary on precisely this cardinal issue. It was, one may safely say, as good as non-existent. And in Hitler's politics, we can see the translation of irrationalist philosophy into practice. The destruction or the restitution of reason is not an academic question for specialist philosophers. Throughout this book we have tried to show that the stance adopted towards reason, the bias towards affirming or denying it, and the acknowledgement or dismissal of its effectualness reached from life into philosophy, and not from philosophy into life. Reason is denied or its impotence is declared, Schiller, as soon as reality itself, the life led by the thinker, evinces no movement forward into a future worth affirming, no prospect of a future surpassing the present. Behind all antirational attitudes, therefore, objectively, in the process of the socio-historical development itself, and subjectively, in the position of the individual concerned, there lies the question of whether one sides with decline and decay or with the new and emerging. And we have repeatedly shown that so-called impartiality, the so-called transcending of parties and the sense of sublimity always implies a siding with the decadent. Hence, and whether or not an individual wants it or is even aware of it, every stand for or against reason is inseparably linked with his opinion of socialism. That was not always the case. The intellectual struggles up to 1848 had as their chief content the conflict between the bourgeois democratic progress which the French Revolution set in motion and the German feudal absolutist status quo. After the Battle of June in 1848, more especially after the Paris Commune and most of all after the October Revolution in 1917, the fronts were quite differently aligned. Whether the individual knew it or not, the struggle between socialism and monopoly capitalism now helped to determine all his decisions. And everything expressing his general outlook, however abstractly epistemological or ontological its form, is ultimately determined by the standpoint he adopts. It is now clear that the world historical resolution of the Second World War cannot fail to leave a mark on anyone who takes his own questions of world outlook seriously and does not want to deceive himself with an emotional befogging of the issues or with logical somersaults. He cannot remain blind to the fact that in this war irrationalist philosophy, put into practice after holding sway for almost a century, suffered a crushing defeat in the theoretical sense also. Nor can he overlook the fact that the socialist outlook, so often hushed up and equally often repudiated supposedly forever, achieved a historic victory by virtue of the deeds of the Soviet peoples, who were inspired by it in practice as in theory. It was a victory for reason become concrete and practical, over the ghastly and diabolical myths of irrationalism. The philosophical controversies ineluctably ensuing from this new world situation for every honest thinker do not, of course, commit him to joining those parties which represent and are trying to realize Marxism, Leninism. We are here dealing with a question which is not so much directly political as one implying that each person find his bearings in his present life on the most universal level. Although the majority of thinkers barely grasped this during the period we have depicted, they helped, on the contrary, to obscure the problem to the best of their abilities. It deeply engaged the best artists and writers of the era. This movement has never ceased to operate since Zola's declaration that every time he tackled a concrete issue, he found himself confronting socialism. Without making any claim to comprehensiveness, we can cite such names as Corbett and William Morris, Anatole France and Romain Rolland, Shaw and Dreiser, Heinrich and Thomas Mann. The overwhelming majority of them have never been socialist in their philosophy. But what lifts their works, from Corbett's paintings to the profoundly bourgeois Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, above their contemporaries, pessimistic, nihilistic decadence, and underpins the inner soundness of their output, is that they had the courage to come to terms with socialism, the major progressive force of present times, with the future facing us. And this without timidity, without succumbing in fear and hatred to truth-distorting myths or flight from reality. This too has been an international phenomenon. But it has a very special significance for German culture, and this is not merely so because it is precisely in Germany that this controversy has, since 1945, become a particularly urgent topical issue. Rather it is because, and this, it must be said, is intimately connected with the present intellectual situation in general. The point at issue is to resolve a chronic morbidity in German culture that reached an acutely critical peak in the age of Hitler and the foregoing period. The Germans were unable to make anything of their own distinguished past and reap the benefits for latter-day achievements like other major nations. That was because they crippled their own classical development. They thereby relegated it to a half-buried past, a fading and academic memory on the one hand, and reinforced current evil influences by distorting and falsifying it in a reactionary manner on the other. To be brief, we are here thinking of the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as the vitally operative mainspring of a genuine German culture from an objectively historical angle. This work was the intellectual crowning of all those progressive tendencies arising on behalf of the German people's liberation and its molding into a nation, and nonetheless so for the fact that in content and method it signifies a qualitative advance on all previous work. The intellectual spadework for the bourgeois democratic revolution in Germany, from Lessing to Heine, from Kant to Hegel and Feuerbach, climaxed in the classic formulation of the theory of proletarian revolution. And this, from an objectively historical angle, is an achievement which every nation on earth must admire in the German development. But subjectively, it passed German culture by unnoticed. Marx did not become an active, enriching factor in Germany's culture. And precisely because its development was crippled in this area, Germany's great past was doomed partly to ossify and to degenerate into academic small talk, and partly to merge with the foggy vapors of decadence in a false and damaging reactionary unity. Such a German line of cultural development as the oft-quoted Goethe, Schopenhauer, Wagner, Nietzsche line invokes Hitler in the name of Germany's great past. To make the contrast clear, let us take the cultural development of Russia. Pushkin and Gogol were followed by the major democratic revolutionary theorists, Belinsky and Herzen, Chernyshevsky and Dobrolyubov. Their activity enabled the country of Tolstoy to incorporate Lenin as a great pioneering figure in his own national culture, as well as abroad. Socialism and regard for the national culture formed an organic unity for the Russians and not a painful antithesis, as for so many of the best German minds in the previous century. We repeat, by no means does one have to be a socialist to sense the urgency of this problem and to take a vigorous part in finding a solution. Already in the 20s, Thomas Mann wrote, "One said that things would only go well with Germany and that she would only find her feet when Karl Marx has read Friedrich Hölderlin, an encounter which, by the way, is in the process of happening." I forgot to add that a honest-sided acquaintance would be bound to remain sterile with this advice. Mann already clearly sketched the answer for Germany and her culture before the catastrophe of Hitler. Such a revision of Germany's past in the name of her future is essential if the third, externally originating storming of the Bastille is to become an action undertaken by the Germans themselves. In the end, here we have been discussing only the cultural, and chiefly the philosophical aspect of this question. But we have tried to show how all such problems, even 1153, the most abstract, grow out of the life of society and become important factors in its development. There is no recognition of past events that is fruitful for the present without a perspective on the future. And no concrete national perspective on the future without an accurately illuminated past. The purpose of this book is a summons to that work. It is calling for a final settlement with the harmful legacy of the German Misere and for the construction of a real and authentic German future. Through digesting critically the rich and as yet far from fully recognized progressive legacy, demolition, clearance and a fresh start will amount to a great deal of work. With the best will in the world, the reactionary irrationalist traditions of more than a century cannot be overcome in a matter of days or months. But there is no other possible way to recovery. That reason which has been lost or destroyed can only be located in reality itself and can only be restored in interaction with it. And in order to attain to reality, the break is essential. It is difficult, but not impossible. Goethe has his Faust say, hence all magnanimous persons bold the boundless and like trusty hold, drum fassen geisterwürdig groß zu schauen zum grenzenlosen grenzenlos vertrauen. Epilogue. On post-war irrationalism. In our studies so far we have attempted to portray, in its chief elements, the course of irrationalism's development from the feudal reactionary ideological backlash against the French Revolution to Hitlerism and its inevitable demise. We began this exposition when Hitler was still in power, the fullness of power. With his downfall, it became an essentially historical one. But only in part. We should add, for nobody today will presume to claim that either the ideology or the procedures of Hitlerism belong entirely to past history. At the war's end, admittedly, major sections of the masses just freed from the fascist nightmare cherished the illusion that a really new period of peace and liberty might be beginning. Scarcely a year later, however, Churchill's Fulton speech meant that all their dreams were cruelly shattered. And it became clear to ever larger circles that, as the initiated had long known, the end of the war signified, rather, making ready for another war, against the Soviet Union, and that to influence the masses ideologically in favor of this formed a central problem for the imperialists today. Therefore, in the midst of the intensified Cold War, a polemic against irrationalism as an ideology of militant reaction, albeit a polemic essentially historical in orientation, cannot possibly end with Hitler. It must attempt to outline at least the most important elements of the movement after Hitler's downfall. That is the aim of our epilogue. As already indicated, of course, in no respect does it claim to be scientifically complete and exhaustive either in an extensive or an intensive sense. For in the period after the end of the Second World War, the United States gained increasing prominence as the leading power of imperialist reaction, taking Germany's place in this respect. In substance, then, we would have to write a history of that nation's philosophy as precise as that we have produced for Germany in order to show the derivation and roots, both social and intellectual, of the present ideologies of the American age. It goes without saying that this would take a whole book, possibly of the size of this one, and the author considers himself by no means equipped to write such a work, or even an outline. Our concern in this epilogue can only be to give rough outlines of the most important new elements in post-war social trends and to illustrate their ideological reflections through a number of especially typical instances. And the primary object of this is to provide a link between our foregoing studies and life today. It is naturally proper that the study should finally turn to Germany again, partly because of the important role which the plans of American imperialism allot to the Germans, and partly because important figures from pre-fascism play no small part in the ideology of Western Germany today. In accordance with the design as a whole, we shall treat these subjects too not so much exhaustively as by giving typical examples. This epilogue's only claim is to indicate the chief prevailing trends in the Cold War ideologies in their most characteristic exponents. If we now move on to the actual questions of substance, we are at once faced with the question of how the new features of the post-1945 period manifested themselves. The anti-fascist coalition crumbled very rapidly, and the crusade against communism, the main leitmotif of Hitlerian propaganda, was taken up by Democrats with an increasing display of energy. Naturally, this meant a change of orientation, and also of content and structure, in democratic views. Since they had opposed fascism during the war, they could at times rightly regard themselves as continuing the long-departed heyday of bourgeois democracy, or they could at least pose as so doing. This forward-looking direction had a great charm that explains why, even after its total reversal, it was attempted to preserve the semblance of such a continuity and to direct the struggle against totalitarianism, whereby fascism and communism were now reduced to this common denominator. Apart from the fact that this view was a piece of old head from the junk shop of social democratism and Trotskyism, it promptly and inevitably evinced a fresh piece of hypocrisy in its concrete situation. For in order to combat communism effectively on the political plane, this democracy had to form an intimate alliance with the German survivors from the Nazi movement, Jammerschaft, Krupp, Hitler's generals, as well as with France, etc. etc. Unavoidably, anti-totalitarian ideology more and more took on distinctly fascist features. The crusade against communism and Marxism-Leninism was similarly an old legacy of bourgeois ideology turned reactionary. As we have shown, Nietzsche first set this ideological struggle in motion along every line. And as we have seen, the struggle grew more and more widespread and acute after 1917, until with Hitler it finally reached a temporary climax which coupled the lowest intellectual standards hitherto known with lying and provocation, the Reichstag fire, and bestial cruelty, Auschwitz, etc. Subsequently, this temporary nadir was further exceeded by the Cold War, stage-managed from Washington. Here again, the ideological offensive was combined with provocations of the most diverse kinds to surpass Hitler's version of this struggle in every sphere. But in this book we shall occupy ourselves only with the ideological side of the matter. Until now we have emphasized those features of the free world ideology promoted by the USA which were also a part of fascism. This was so as to obtain a proper footing for our following exposition, which will be concerned with the differences from Hitlerian ideology. But it would misfire and mislead if we failed to consider these differences, indeed contrasting features, within the common social and ideological context. A straightforward revival of Hitlerism is scarcely possible under existing conditions. Of course Franco's fascism went on undisturbed, and of course Adenauer's political machinery teamed with erstwhile leading fascists. Of course fascist secret unions and organizations have with American help, sprung up in Germany time and again. And of course the updated form and extension of Nazi ideology has been able to find overt expression, not only in careless, reluctantly disowned statements by Nazi officers and in memoirs and hagiographies of the Hitlerian leaders, but also in programmatic periodicals quite openly. An example of the latter is Nation Europa, the monthly for European renewal which proclaims, the Reich, completely shattered more than once and yet always rising anew, has acquired still greater powers, etc. etc. But not even in Western Germany is all this the new ideology's principal line, at least not at the time of writing. With Hitler's collapse, international and Hesse German reaction was thrown into a new objective situation and was forced to draw the consequences on the ideological plane as well. Hitler stupefied and conquered the German masses with his social and national demagogy. That meant that his myth, a product of extreme irrationalism, was capable of two things. First, it could channel specific national feelings, justified in themselves, into an ideology of imperialist chauvinism, imperialist aggression and the suppression and destruction of other peoples by the Germans. Secondly, the myth confirmed the unlimited sway of German monopoly capitalism, substantially in the most reactionary and barbaric style. According to its formal demagogic, however, this was a completely new, revolutionary social order professedly standing above the dilemma of capitalism and socialism. We have dealt in such detail with the mendacious myth of German socialism, and Germanic democracy both in its genesis and its functioning, that we do not now need to discuss it at length. These two myths, which are closely related and form an ideological unity, were both destroyed when the war was resolved, the Hitlerian form of social demagogy especially. Socialism triumphed in the Central European national democracies and in China, while powerful communist parties of the masses began to flourish, notably in France and Italy. After this, every group of monopoly capitalists found it a far too hazardous ploy to risk again the slogan of the other socialism as a maneuver to divert the masses from communism. Hitler was still able to gain power by these means, but let us remember that as soon as 1934 he was having to apply the bloodiest terrorism in order to counteract the supporters of the Second Revolution. There is moreover, and this is a primary theme, the economic difference between the leading power of reactionary monopoly capitalism in each case, between Hitler's Germany and the United States today. As we know, the result of capitalism's delayed development in Germany was that when she entered the imperialist period, she found a colonial world already carved up. Hence her imperialist politics were militaristically aggressive, overtly so. She was striving for a violent redistribution of territories. The defeat of these endeavors in the First World War, its economic and social effects and, in particular, the German repercussions of the economic world crisis that began in 1929 shook German capitalism to the foundations. Hitler's solution, his social demagogy, sprang from this parlous state of German capitalism. And his national demagogy, the program for new and even more comprehensive imperialist aggression, was able to blend with the social demagogy by summoning Germany, as a proletarian nation, to the barricades against the Western exponents of monopoly capitalism and by passing off imperialist rivalries as a national and social war of liberation against monopoly capital. None of these motives ever played a part in either the domestic or the foreign policy of the United States. A tottering of the capitalist system was never in question, not even in the most critical times. In contrast to Germany, the USA had a constitution which was democratic from the start. And its ruling class managed, particularly during the imperialist era, to have the democratic form so effectively preserved that by democratically legal means, it achieved a dictatorship of monopoly capitalism at least as firm as that which Hitler set up with his tyrannic procedures. This smoothly functioning democracy, so-called, was created by the presidential prerogative, the Supreme Court's authority in constitutional questions, and the monopoly capitalists always decided which were constitutional questions: the finance monopoly over the press, radio, etc., electioneering costs, which successfully prevented really democratic parties from springing up beside the two parties of monopoly capitalism, and lastly the use of terroristic devices, the lynching system. And this democracy could, in substance, realize everything sought by Hitler without needing to break with democracy formally. In addition, there was the incomparably broader and more solid economic basis of monopoly capitalism. In Norman Mailer's highly interesting American war novel The Naked and the Dead, his General Cummings expresses the difference most vividly, as kinetic energy. A country is organization, coordinated effort. Your epithet, fascism. Historically, the purpose of this war is to translate America's potential into kinetic energy. The concept of fascism, far sounder than communism if you consider it, for it's grounded firmly in men's actual natures, merely started in the wrong country, in a country which did not have enough intrinsic potential power to develop completely. In Germany, with that basic frustration of limited physical means, there were bound to be excesses. But the concept was sound enough. For the past century, the entire historical process has been working toward greater and greater consolidation of power. Physical power for this century, an extension of our universe, and a political power, a political organization to make it possible. Your men of power in America, I can tell you, are becoming conscious of their real aims for the first time in our history. Watch after the war. Our foreign policy is going to be far more naked, far less hypocritical than it has ever been. We can therefore readily understand that the United States, monopoly capitalists neither require nor can apply either a German socialism, or a Germanic democracy, in their home affairs. Capitalism, for them, is and will remain the ideal economic system, and democratic freedom, the model for every state institution and form of government. How this democratic freedom develops into fascist coercion without undergoing any formal changes has been long recognized not only by the world at large but also by Americans of intelligence and integrity. It by no means takes a Marxist to perceive it. The profoundly bourgeois author Sinclair Lewis portrayed this development in his novel It Can't Happen Here, albeit with some illusions regarding the behavior of the liberal bourgeoisie. And previously, e.g., in Elmer Gantry, he correctly exposed the fascist terrorism which the Democrats tolerated and indeed artificially cultivated. So economic, social and political conditions in the United States were bound to give rise to an ideology whose central point became an overt defense of capitalism and capitalist freedom. From the philosophical methodological angle, then, the henceforward effectively leading role of American ideology in the reactionary camp meant to break with the method which we have described, in its German version, as an indirect apologetic for capitalism. This collapsed along with Hitler as the leading ideology of reaction. It had to yield again to the direct apologetic for capitalism. In the interests of clarity, we shall begin with capitalism's methods of defense. For the form taken by these methods also determined the complex whose purpose was to link national sentiments with imperialist interests. The problem of monopoly capitalism remains central to direct as well as indirect apologetics, and this is understandable. For the chief task of any apologetic is to appease the spontaneous indignation of the masses and to steer it into a direction favoring the capitalist system. But this indignation is directed precisely against monopoly organizations. The masses, having grasped already their connection with capitalist laws of motion, can in any case not be won with an apologetic propaganda. The existence, dominance and expansion of the monopolies amounts to an automatic daily advertisement for socialism. And this not only among those directly exploited, but also among the intellectuals. The Gaullist Raymond Aron once noted with deep regret the inefficacy of American propaganda on the French intelligentsia, indeed the latter's hostile rejection of it. The reason he gave was that, for most European intellectuals, anti-capitalism is far more than a mere economic theory, it is an article of faith. Hitler solved the question in a very simple fashion. He translated the German but only the German monopolies into the new form of German socialism. It was extreme irrationalist philosophy which engendered the spiritual atmosphere of blind faith for this claptrap. Now since the ideologists of American monopoly capitalism were neither able nor willing to follow this road, it became necessary for them to turn monopoly capitalism into something contingent, a removable contingency. Moreover, let us just quote Lippmann as an example. His was a standard method of vulgar economics, identifying technology with economics. He virtually always spoke of technology instead of economics in order to obtain his proof, although this in itself could carry no conviction in the light of its own postulates. The development of technology and mass production does not presuppose a monopoly. Concentration has its origin in privilege and not in technology. But where did such privilege come from? The answer is extremely simple. The liberals, as the result of a short-sighted and faulty application of the laissez-faire principle, had permitted and indeed encouraged its genesis. The intellectual upper hand of collectivism supposedly existed between 1848 and 1870. Whence this superiority? Again the answer is extremely simple. It resulted from the intellectual climate. A whole century earlier, Reuter's Uncle Brassard had, in a humorous parody of such explanations, declared that poverty stems from pauvreté. It was out of this liberal error, Lippmann asserted, that monopolies had arisen. And he was far from holding a monopoly in this truism. The Swiss economist Roque explained the origin of monopolies in similar terms, professing to locate their cause in the cult of the colossal, which reigned at the end of the 19th century. Like Lippmann, he too denied the economic inevitability of the concentration of capital and with it, that of cartels, trusts, umbrella organizations, and so on. Elsewhere he saw in the monopolies a legacy of the feudal period without noticing the contradiction to the theory just stated. The trusts, said Lippmann, had not grown organically, but were artificially grown, at all events, and however we interpret the causes of their appearance, Lippmann and Roque were agreed that monopolies were by no means inevitable. They then blithely eliminated all the essential objective conditions from the imperialist economy. Like their prototypes, the popular economists of the mid-19th century, they encompassed mentally just the surface aspects of capitalism. And naturally any aspects artificially isolated from the essence, from the mechanics must be distorted, even mere surface ones granted, even were concentration and monopoly not manifestations of imperialist capitalism resulting inevitably from economic laws, their existence still has disturbing effects with which the apologist must somehow come to terms. In Lippmann's view, classical political economy already recognized them, modern monopolies, GL, as frictions and disturbances, but had shown by these expressions that it underestimated their social significance quite hugely. That assessment had to be adjusted through the demagogy of direct apologetics. Hence the exceptional importance of the question as to whether we ascribe the collapse of liberalism to the error the liberals made or, as the collectivists believe, to a kind of ineluctable historical necessity, for only in the former case is the error irreparable one. If the legislation of bourgeois society has brought about the trusts, etc., it can also restrict and indeed entirely abolish them. It can, as Lippmann says, put an end to the concentration of capital, the businessmen's collectivism. That, Lippmann maintained, was now the major task facing the liberal revival. He scornfully dismissed other liberals' compromise attempts, such as those of Stuart Chase. Political democracy can remain stable in all areas if it only keeps its distance from the economy, Lippmann's italics. On the contrary, the mistake made by liberalism was that it chose to regard property and the authorities of capital-based societies as absolute and untouchable. But a change was possible in Lippmann's view. Men nowadays are capable of reforming the social order by changing the laws, since Lippmann saw only the subjectivistically distorted surface of capitalist society. It did not even occur to him to ask how laws come about, that is, to examine more closely the relation between the economy and the politico-juristic superstructure. With a blank face of a parliamentary cretin he could calmly state that such a change was possible. But he ignored the one interesting question, the question of which social forces could accomplish the change in reality. He contented himself with demagogically hatching theoretically shallow projects to lead the naive reader astray. In Lippmann's fellow thinker Roque, we clearly see the extent to which any bona fides was lacking from such lines of thought. Roque backed up his active anti-monopoly policy, which culminated by appealing to the legislature as much as Lippmann's did, with the following arguments: that this last road is eminently viable has been proved by the U.S. through the Sherman Act of 1890, a law prohibiting any monopoly or monopoly agreement and still representing the basis of American economic justice today. The facts, of course, at once forced him to add that this law has proved to be ineffective to date. This, he maintained, was due, on the one hand, to the tariff policy of the U.S., which encouraged monopolies, and the law had never been executed with real energy on the other. Now if such writers draw on all this to posit their neoliberal line, the abolition of monopolies by law, as a concretely promising prospect, without going into the socio-economic causes of the concrete failure, we can only marvel at their boldness. They themselves could not possibly believe in such balderdash, yet they offered it to their readers. Lippmann and Rope, of course, are just two examples. Other authors said the same but formulated their thoughts in different ways. Two elements which they all had in common need stressing particularly. Firstly, the idea of capitalism, termed the free market economy, is the ideal social order. Any disturbances which occurred were mere side effects which could always be eradicated through legislation. And this was a possibility because one was living in the freedom of a democracy where the majority vote was decisive and all-powerful. Secondly, this method signified, ideally, a return to the classic economists. But what was the true nature of this return? It was the classic thinkers' great theoretical deed to have substantiated the theory of labor value, that is, to have comprehended the principles of capitalism in real terms, albeit faultily and fragmentarily, such that the theory of surplus value, exploitation, the perception of capitalism's contradictions could be established from this angle, as already became visible in the Ricardo School's breakdown. In reality, of course, there can be no question here of such a turning back. The connection was not with the classic thinkers themselves but with their degenerate epigones, the vulgar economists, who had already erased all contradictions from the theory of capitalism and interpreted the classics as if their own. Shallow harmonizing at all costs constituted the classic doctrine's very essence. Previously, Marx had clearly demonstrated this vulgarizing tendency in a by no means unimportant transitional figure, James Mill. Contrasting the master, Ricardo, with Mill, he wrote, "With the master, the new insignificant evolves amid the compost heap of contradictions. He works the law forcibly out of the contrasting phenomena. With Mill, on the contrary, where the economic relationship and therefore the categories expressing it also includes antitheses, where it is contradiction and the very unity of contradictions, he emphasizes the element of their unity and denies the antitheses. This tendency became more marked still with the outright vulgarizers. Even now, however, we have not adequately defined modern economics. For the change in theory during the pre-imperial and imperial age, the total subjectifying of economics, from the marginal utility theory to Keynes and modern American learning, likewise claims to be a classical legacy, and Lippmann's recourse to Adam Smith, for instance, again includes an interpretation which falsifies history. In reality, even so shallow a vulgarizer and apologist as Say inevitably looks a profound thinker and uncompromising explorer of truth by comparison with modern economists. In Malthus we can discern very clearly the character of such a legacy. After what has been stated, it cannot seem surprising that he has been highly honored in modern times and that his population theory has gained exceptional influence. But even Malthus had to be improved in the reactionary direction to suit the modern purposes of apologists for the imperialist economy. He himself wrote only an apologetic for the misery of the working class, Marx. Now, however, the current revival of Malthusianism has given rise to a call to exterminate whole nations, an apologetic for wars necessitating a series of mass human sacrifices. Vote, but even more moderate thinkers, ones not inclined overtly to draw such far-reaching consequences, have been thoroughly Malthusian in regarding the rapid increase in population as causing the misery, as preventing the blessings of capitalism from ending in universal prosperity. Rope, this treatise does not pretend even to suggest the problems of the modern capitalist economy. Our only goal in this analysis is to register the general ideological change of direction after Hitler's downfall. Hitlerian social demagogy was linked with an overt irrationalism and it culminated in this. Contradictions in capitalism that were thought insoluble, by normal means, led to the leap into a radically irrationalistic myth. The present, directly apologetic, defense of capitalism renounces myth and irrationalism, or so it appears. With regard to form, mode of presentation, and style, we are here dealing with purely conceptual, scientific deduction. But this is only so in appearance, for the content of the conceptual constructions is a pure conceptual void, a construction of non-existent connections, a denial of concrete principles and a halt at those bogus connections which the immediate surface of economic reality displays immediately, and thus non-conceptually. We are therefore dealing with a new form of irrationalism disguised as a rationalism, but not, it must be said, with one that is fundamentally new. We have already remarked on the return of American economics, and its European adherence, to vulgar economics. At the same time we pointed out that in these modern economics, all anti-scientific tendencies have been heightened to match the conditions of direct capitalist apologetics in the imperial age. So if Marx has already proved the irrational trends imminent in the old vulgar economics, this is true of modern economics on a scale so greatly enlarged that the growth in quantity has precipitated a new quality. The irrationalism implicit in the old vulgar economics has now become an explicit one. Since Marx's statements on the subject provide a basic and comprehensive exposition of the problems arising, I think he should be quoted in detail. The agencies of the irrational forms, which present specific economic conditions and epitomize them in practice, do not however affect the effective carriers of these conditions in practice, in their usual dealings. And since they are used to operating within them, their minds see nothing objectionable about it. For them there is nothing mysterious in a total contradiction. In phenomena alienated from the interconnected order and become absurd if taken in isolation, they feel as much at home as fish in water. Here it is the case that, as Hegel says with regard to certain mathematical formulae, what ordinary common sense finds irrational is the rational, and what it holds rational is irrationality itself. May we remind the reader at this point that the above allusion is to Hegel's mathematical studies, which we discussed in detail in Chapter 11. Hegel showed in those writings how the emergence of genuine dialectical contradictions creates the semblance of an irrationality for metaphysical thinking. But at the same time, he showed how dialectical thought can resolve the contradictions into a higher rationality. What Hegel demonstrated on the general level through an example taken from mathematics, Marx presented on the level of a broader and deeper social generalization. He shows us the concrete circumstances that raise the problems of irrationalism and turn their intellectual reflection into methodological, philosophical problems of irrationalism. Here Marx gave convincing proof of how and why capitalism's immediate agents could move in this irrational milieu with complete freedom and lack of problems. Ideologists on the same social and intellectual level too could naively accept as truisms the irrationality of social categories, their forms and conditions of existence, as Marx puts it. Of course, the thus acknowledged irrationality has to come to light in various ways, but it is so unrecognized at first, unconsciously, and not yet crystallized into an irrationalist philosophy. Naturally, this applies to the old popular economists themselves, but also to the beginnings of Marxism and especially pragmatism, which, as we showed in our preface, is an ideology of capitalist agents consciously anchored in capitalist immediacy, a Babbitt philosophy. However, the growing acuteness of the social contradictions necessitated deepening of the philosophical questions. The most typical example is the development of German irrationalism in the imperial age, with Hitler as its climax today. However, with the decided return of capitalist apologetics to the direct form, a new situation was bound to arise from the philosophical angle as well. It is perfectly natural for the Marxist pragmatist rather than the German type of irrationalism to reign in philosophy also. Without exception, this shift has determined socially the whole of semantics in the USA, the neo-Marxism of Wittgenstein and Carnap, and Dewey's extension of pragmatism. It has also dictated the fact that those philosophical trends more strongly inclined, in their methodology, to carry on as such directions the pre-fascist line of German irrationalism did not blossom into leading ideologies, but could take effect only as third-road theories. French existentialism, for example. Here, where we can only deal with the mainstream of thought, we shall not discuss this movement, especially as we have done so already in other contexts. Cf. my book Existentialism or Marxism? Berlin 1951. It goes without saying that here again, in line with this epilogue's general aim, we do not have a detailed analysis and characterization in mind even with regard to the principal orientations. We shall confine ourselves to indicating certain decisive evolving trends in order to sketch the new aspect of the prevailing post-war imperialist philosophy. It also goes without saying that these trends had already been active in American philosophy for a very long time, throughout the imperial period. Today they govern its whole ideology. In Dewey they had long been apparent as an advanced phase of pragmatism which was consciously an ideology of capitalist agents, the builders and active supporters of the American lifestyle from the outset. And pragmatism, consciously rejecting objective examination of a reality independent of the consciousness, studied only the practical usefulness of individual actions in surroundings taken to be immutable, that is, in essence, not in the details concerning individual action. It was only natural that the imperialist development of these surroundings found an exact reflection in the content and structure of Dewey's philosophy, but in semantics and neo-Marxism also their dividing lines are often blurred. Vigorous further development of the earliest Marxism in accordance with the ideological requirements of modern American imperialism. The early Marxist show of strict scientific thinking has been preserved unaltered, but at the same time the departure from objective reality has gone far beyond the earlier standards. Philosophy's task is now no longer an analysis of sensations, but only one of word meanings and sentence structures. And parallel with the formal academic total loss of substance which this has arisen entailed, overt direct apologetics have emerged far more prominently than ever before. Marxism came about originally as a philosophical weapon against materialism, chiefly in the field of the epistemology of natural science. The modern agnostic forms which were elaborated in the process naturally constituted a good starting point for many an irrationalist current, and Marxism was always a philosophical assistance to irrationalism. Now, a general direct apologetic has plainly emerged. Semantics examine energetically and systematically the general concepts of social and economic life, only to find them trivial, empty word formations. What follows? The English Marxist Maurice Cornfor tells us very clearly in a quotation from Barrows Dunham's Man Against Myth. As we clearly see, there are no dogs in general, no human race, no profit system, no political parties, no fascism, no undernourished peoples, no shabby clothes, no truth, no social justice. With things standing thus there is no economic problem, no political problem, no fascist problem, no nutrition question and no social question. By simply breathing out he continues, they have spirited out of the world every important problem to have tormented the human race during its entire history, and in addition, Cornfor showed most lucidly the social consequences of such a philosophy. He stated, to take a simple example, let us consider the kind of discussion that occurs very frequently between workers and employers. What is the semantic prescription for solving the dispute? It is expressed very clearly in the words of the boss who says, let's forget all this twaddle about labor and capital and profit and exploitation, which is only the meaningless invention of political agitators who are playing on your emotions. Let's speak man to man, as atom to atom, and let's try and understand each other. That is actually the way in which employers very often argue. They learned to be semanticists before semantics was even invented, and Cornforth shows this inevitable consequence of the semantic method, the point where it fulfills the social function set by imperialist capitalism, in other cases as well, such as that of the Malthusian vote, who settles all agrarian issues semantically, with similar results in terms of class with vote. However, the method's other side also clearly appears. He reveals an irrational mysticism which was only latent and implicit in Marxism itself. For vote, in applying the semantic method to the agrarian question, says that the land is an ineffable reality. Here he was exceeding conventional agnosticism. For him, reality no longer simply lies outside the area of the perceptible, it is also an irrational chaos. Stuart Chase expresses this tendency more distinctly still. Examining the process of abstraction, he gives the description of a pencil as an example. Although this is a non-verbal, spatio-temporal occurrence, he tries to express it somehow or other. And the fruit of this endeavor to express the non-verbal in words is the definition of a pencil as a mad dance of electrons. Here the new irrationalism amounts to a completely irrational subjectifying, anthropologizing and mythicizing of natural phenomena. For in the first place, Chase's definition is in no sense that of a pencil as a particular part of objective reality, unequivocally definable through its attributes and functions. What Chase says of it could just as well be said of a house, a desk, etc. To describe objects from concrete reality, nature and society, since a pencil is a social object as well, solely in terms of the movement of electrons already constitutes an irrational mysticism. But in the second place, the very movement of electrons is a mad dance, only for the impressionism of a willed immediacy. Objectively considered, it has principles of its own which science can to an approximate degree observe rationally. Although Stuart Chase clothes his definition in the currently fashionable cloak of modern scientific exactitude, a wild irrational mysticism is visible behind it. Without committing ourselves to a detailed analysis of this new brand of irrationalism, let us attempt briefly to illustrate this orientation's general philosophical character. Wittgenstein, one of its leading figures, offers a number of statements which are central to its methodology. He wrote, "Sentences can represent the whole reality, but they cannot represent what must be meant in them by reality. For this representation to become possible, the logical form sentences cannot represent the logical form. The form is reflected in the sentences. Language cannot represent that which reflects itself in language. We cannot express through language that which expresses itself through language. Sentences show the logical form of reality. They exhibit it. That which one can show, one cannot utter." Here, perhaps I may remind the reader of my studies of the phenomenological method, especially Max Scheler's discussion of it, in order to give due weight both to the socially determined unity of the various modern irrationalist trends and to the, likewise socially determined, variety of their stages. Scheler resorted as much as Wittgenstein to this immediate irrationalist foundation as the sole bedrock, the sole content of philosophy. There was, to be sure, the difference that he regarded this irrationalist content as still utterable. Only at the existentialist stage of phenomenology did the irrationalism of the foundation manifest itself quite clearly. In stressing this parallel, we by no means wish to claim that existentialism influenced Wittgenstein. Such methodological issues have a social basis, and both the shared and the unlike elements of the method and conclusions reflect this basis. The same applies to the relation between Wittgenstein and the later existentialist development of phenomenology and semantics as to the epistemological affinity between Mach and Husserl, to which we referred in the appropriate place. Certainly Scheler's own Macht der Vernunft, the impotence of reason, may also be mentioned in this context. Wittgenstein was therefore forced to draw the consequences of this situation. He said of the relation of science, the science of semantics, to life, "We feel that even if we have answered all the questions of science, we did not so much as touch the problems of life. For then, to be sure, not a single question will remain, and just this is the answer. We perceive the solution to the life problem in the problem's disappearance. Is not that the reason why men to whom life's meaning became evident are incapable of saying out loud of what this meaning consists? That is truly the ineffable. It reveals itself, it is the mystical. It is no accident that a burning admirer of Wittgenstein, José Ferreira Moura, extols him precisely as a philosopher of despair. He comments on the general characteristics of the age and its representative thinker as follows: Heidegger, Sartre, Kafka and Camus let us go on living with confidence in a world's existence. However awesome the break they proclaim, it is not a radical one. The ground where they find their footing holds firm. The shattering earthquake reduces our old dwellings to ruins, but even among the ruins one can go on living and can build new houses. But Wittgenstein, after these said losses, leaves us wholly bereft of support. For if the ground disappears along with the ruins, the roots along with the felled tree, we shall no longer have any support. No longer, too, will we be able to resort to nothingness or face the absurd with minds that are clear. We will have to disappear altogether. Moura also recognizes that with Wittgenstein, as with semantics in general, the chief culprit is reason and thinking. Thinking is the great disruptive influence, we could almost say the great temptation. The misdeed itself, the act of thinking, becomes man's great guilt, his essential sin. In the world described by Wittgenstein, the center is undiluted absurdity. In it the question has put itself in question. And Chase confirms this worldview and its semantic analysis by drawing such radical conclusions that the exposition lapses into the grotesquely amusing. He envies his tomcat Hobie, who is not subject to the hallucinations caused by wrong word usage, since he has no truck with philosophy and formal logic. When I go astray in the language jungle, I revert to Hobie's outlook as though to a magnet, so the irrationalism and strictly scientific, direct apologetics exudes from every pore. but its leading exponents were unwilling to acknowledge its connection with the movement that culminated in Hitler. Instead, they sought out and located, so they thought, a glorious ancestry for it. Just as Truman and Eisenhower wished to appear to the public not as Hitler's successors but as continuing the mission of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, so the direct apologetics of our day, although irrationalist at heart, have preferred to seek their ancestors in the Enlightenment. This exactly matches the economists' efforts to feign a return to their classic authors, a practical impossibility, as we have shown. To them, say, and his still shallower successors as well as Malthus seen as more reactionary and barbaric than he actually was represented the classic authors de facto. The same situation obtains in philosophy. Kaufmann, for instance, sought to turn Nietzsche into a worthy successor to the great Enlightenment minds, and it is extremely typical that the present-day renaissance of Enlightenment has revalued and hailed as a great rediscovery the Marquis de Sade, etc. It is not fortuitous that the forging of such connections has proved fruitless. True, the earlier apologists and vulgarizers suppressed economic truths, distorted the correlations and banished the genuine problems in order to substitute spurious ones. But for all their scientific bona fides, they honestly believed in the inviolability of capitalism and its unlimited possibilities of development. That also goes for the corresponding literary output, weak and bad as it was, of Onet or Gustav Freytag. But today the literary parallels to the economy of direct apologetics and the philosophy of semantics are manifest in such advocates of nihilistic despair as Kafka or Camus. Here we are speaking of literature as a graph of social trends. Questions of aesthetic merit are beside the point in this context. Of the phenomenon of despair we shall speak more fully later. For the moment the observation will suffice. That we may note precisely in the leading ideologists a profound disbelief in their own apologetic exposition and the optimistic perspectives which are supposed to follow from it. No doubt there can exist blockheads, even masses of them, who believe Lipin's notion that one fine day, albeit little by little, the United States legislature will really abolish the excessive concentration of capital, the trusts, and so on. But naturally so experienced and well-versed a publicist as Lipin does not believe a word of it. But what, in that case, does he believe? What determines his attitude? Despair or cynicism, or both together? There is more than one explanation for these moods among the ideological defenders of imperialism. They were founded not only on the impossibility of obtaining a satisfactory theoretical solution to the problems of monopoly capitalism, one that would preserve its reign intact as well as appease the hostile mood of the masses. They stemmed also from the current state of the struggle against the chief adversary, socialism. Clearly, this central question also determined the philosophical situation to a decisive extent. For the whole of capitalist learning was bent, ideologically, on rebutting in a cogent manner the socialist alternative that was weighing on it more and more inescapably between the two world wars. This seemed relatively simple for the capitalist ideologists. While Soviet power was still in the process of becoming established, they constantly prophesied socialism's definitive collapse for the coming week. Before going over to a more long-term demonstration of the abortive experiment, they pronounced each 5-year plan unrealizable before it started, misrepresented the teething troubles of socialist reconstruction as symptoms of a definite failure, and so on. Such arguments still crop up time and again today, of course. But their success as propaganda has become increasingly dubious, for their discrepancy with the facts has been growing more and more obvious. The Soviet Army's successful resistance to the strongest land power in the world, its annihilating victory over Hitler, the peaceful and monumental reconstruction of the post-war era, the ability to produce its own atomic bombs, etc. These have given the world irrefutable proof of the socialist economy's high economic and technical standards, the ever-rising curve of its development. All this has had a paralyzing effect on the propaganda of imminent collapse. It could not, of course, be relinquished, but its persuasiveness has steadily decreased and has had to be replaced by other methods. But these new methods, at a time when the Cold War's crucial ideological battles were going on, have shown the constantly declining quality of anti-Soviet propaganda. Only outright calumny and false testimony by hired agents could carry through the attempts at a fresh offensive. If we reflect that, 30 years before Otto Bauer was the main ideologist of such theories of alarm and despondency, whereas the Americans now turn to Kravchenko, we can measure precisely this fall in standards. And since it is the central ideological question with which we are dealing, we also obtain a precise index for the decline in standards in the less directly propagandist fields of economics, philosophy, and so forth. How deeply the Kravchenko principle penetrates the most abstract-looking philosophical exchanges is best illustrated by the debate between Camus and Sartre. Camus' last book was severely but fairly criticized in Sartre's periodical by Francis Jeanson. In an indignant reply, Camus evaded all the important arguments, especially with regard to historicality, to which we shall return shortly in another context, so as to make the Kravchenko issue, that of penal work camps in the Soviet Union, the focal point of a philosophical discussion. This he did in a debate about Hegel and Marx, revolution, historical necessity and individual freedom. In his reply, Sartre rightly did not enter into Camus' demagogic absurdities. He refuted his arguments objectively, contenting himself on this issue with unmasking the moral malifides of Camus and his ilk. Let us be serious, Camus, he wrote, and please tell me what feelings the revelations of Rousseau awaken in an anti-communist heart. Despair? Sadness? Shame at being human? Get along with you. The only feeling that such news arouses in the anti-communist is, and I'll find it hard to say this, a feeling of joy. Joy at having one's proof to hand at last and seeing what one wanted to see. One such themes naturally played a decisive role in Hitlerian ideology and propaganda as well, as we have shown in detail in the chapter concerned. We have also repeatedly indicated how important, in this connection, speculating on the despair of the masses was in the capitalist countries, and how cynically Hitler used despair and delirium to consolidate the rule of monopoly capitalism. But, on the one hand, all this was concealed for a long while by the tell me gold, the bogus glitter of social demagogy. To illustrate the difference in the situation today, let us refer merely to the emotional power of a slogan like the breaking of vassalage in contrast to Lippmann's consoling promises of a statutory elimination of monopolies. And, on the other hand, whereas despair for Hitler was a socially given starting point, today's direct apologetic is meant to stifle society's despair at birth. What, therefore, was a vehicle in Hitler's case is in this respect a barrier today again. It is not ideology that has brought this antithesis into reality. It is the social reality which determines the propaganda starting point and its objective. Since Hitler tricked monopoly capitalism out in a socialist form, he was able to abuse for his own ends the despair and bitterness of the masses over their exploitation by capitalists. In the United States, on the other hand, the ideology of the ruling class is the maintenance of monopoly capitalism as it stands instead, therefore, of stirring up discontent it must calm it down. Unquestionably many American imperial activists feel that the direct apologetic of monopoly capitalism as compared to Hitler's indirect apologetic has put them in a less favorable position from the propagandist angle. So inevitably, attempts have been initiated to discover new forms of indirect apologetics attuned to American conditions. But how? The contrast between direct and indirect apologetics is not simply a question of form but one of social content. The masses that are being depressed and exploited by monopoly capitalism seek a means of escape. The dry reasonableness of Lippmann, say, has great disadvantages, and these are constantly surfacing as irrationalism and despair. The most famous and influential attempt to gain a new, more effective theoretical basis by twisting round the indirect apologetic which Hitler used so effectively is Burnham's managerial revolution. This is a very clear effort to adopt and to put into practice the cardinal structure of indirect apologetics. Burnham does not want to deny monopoly capitalism's contradictions, and does not even want to trivialize them as easily removable disorders. On the contrary, just like Hitler, he takes them as his starting point and aims at gaining from their analysis a new and enticing social demagogic perspective. Since he is a renegade Trotskyite, it is a simple matter for him to use the equation of Bolshevism with fascism. He offers, moreover, a corollary borrowed straight from the technocrats, and already present, in embryo, in Thorstein Veblen, whereby an analogous process also takes place in normal capitalism. The capitalists themselves, the legal owners of the means of production, distance themselves increasingly from production itself and take a less and less active part in its practical management, being replaced by the leading functionaries, Burnham's managers. Like all the insights of contemporary apologetics, this is of course as old as the hills. As early as 1835 Andrew Ure, in his Philosophy of Manufactures, called the manager the soul of our enterprise system. Burnham, like the nowadays classic Malthus, was not only an unscrupulous sycophant but also a shameless plagiarist of economic writings that had fallen into oblivion. So the de facto rule of the managers, according to Burnham, is the major universal principle in the present economic development. It asserts itself equally, under politically differing forms in socialism, fascism and the United States. Thereby Burnham, like the Hitlerian ideologists as well as the semanticists, excludes all real socio-economic differences and contrasts between the different systems. And this gives rise to a non-conceptual semantic obscurity in which the communist functionary or factory manager is presented as identical with the capitalist manager. But at all events, Burnham arrived in this way at a program of indirect apologetics. Like Hitler, he demagogically professes to negate capitalism. And like Hitler, he denies that history poses the dilemma of choosing between capitalism or socialism. Like Hitler, he claims to have found a tertium debtor. Certainly, for all the far-reaching methodological affinity, the changing times and the difference of operational field have left their stamp on the content and form of both constructions. Hitler overrode the dilemma of capitalism versus socialism with the aid of an irrational myth which excited strong emotions. This began with that despair and longing for relief experienced by the masses in the misery of the crisis of 1929. Burnham too sketches the theoretical outlines of a myth, but he does so in the sober tone of dry objective scientific thinking. Indeed, whereas with Hitler the essential substance of the ideology he proclaimed was a direct result of the mythical solution to the dilemma, Burnham wants to make a sharp, clear-cut division between scientific statement myth and ideology. We shall return to this question to study it in more detail. The difference of tone in itself illustrates the difference in period and relevant circumstances and so, as has become already evident, strongly affects the methodology itself. Cynical as Hitler was in the role of chief propagandist and hangman of monopoly capitalism, he could reckon with the likelihood that the proclamation of his myth would carry the desperate masses along with it. But what could Burnham expect from his myth? The indirect apologetics of monopoly capitalism, as whose profit he figures, can only result at best in an elitist circulation, Pareto. This, however, cannot be more than an ideological cushion for the bourgeoisie and bourgeois intelligentsia in the face of a really profound upheaval in society. Both men, Hitler and Burnham, endeavored not only to rescue but also to consolidate monopoly capitalism. Hitler, however, sought to accomplish this with the semblance of a revolution that would, on the surface, transform the whole of society. Burnham too, we admit, mentions revolution, but the whole structure of capitalism, particularly in its relation to mass labor, again remains basically unaltered. The so-called revolution is patently confined solely to the leading sector. Hitler and Burnham, of course, both based their outlook on their contempt for the masses. Nevertheless, Hitler sparked off a mass movement, and his demagogy retained the appearance of giving the masses a say, even during the Nazi regime. Burnham, on the other hand, just like the liberals he heartily despised, regards mass concentration, Vermissung, as the major danger, and hence strives openly to thwart all power in the hands of the masses. One obvious aspect of this is that Burnham equates Hitlerian and American press propaganda with the communist enlightenment and further education of the masses. In consequence of all this, Burnham, in going over to indirect apologetics, fails to produce any effective myth that would at once result in striking social demagogic catchwords. Burnham's indirect apologetic climaxed merely in a call to create a corresponding ideology. This, however, was carefully separated from the, purportedly, objectively scientific theory, totally independent of it in content and method. What, therefore, was unified with Hitler is divided with Burnham. The science, here, is objective, in the sense of semantics and neo-Machism, and in itself has nothing to do with ideology or propaganda. Burnham employed this objectivity to suggest to his readers the fateful inevitability of managerial evolution. The ideology, on the other hand, was determined by the concrete tasks in each instance and had not the slightest relevance to the reality of social evolution and the growth in our perception of it. Ideologies must, Burnham said, 1. Express at least in rough outline what currently matches the interests of the ruling class, and help to create a model of thought and sensibility salutary to the maintenance of a given social order's key institutions and relations. 2. At the same time, these must be so expressed as to be capable of appealing to mass feeling. An ideology which embraces the interests of a given ruling class would have no value at all as a social bond if it openly expressed its function, namely that of safeguarding the power of the ruling class over the rest of society. The ideology must speak ostensibly on behalf of mankind, the people, the nation, the future, God, destiny, and so on. It is hardly possible to imagine a higher degree of elitist cynicism than this. All the same, Burnham here sought to dissociate himself from those of his colleagues who thought that any old ideology could, with the appropriate propaganda machinery, fulfill this function. Such ideas, he said, were wrong. More is involved than a skillful propaganda technique. A successful ideology must, even if confused in form, appear to the masses as though it were voicing some of their interests. This distinction constitutes the latest acme of cynicism. Certainly we have gone through a great deal in the last decades. We have been acquainted with, among other things, the conversations between Hitler and Rauschning. But the effect of Burnham's book is the effect that Rosenberg would have made if he had included those conversations in his myth of the 20th century as explanatory glosses. As the exponent of the new indirect apologetics, Burnham is simultaneously his own Rauschning, but this piling up of cynical contempt for humanity had not only the moral aspect that we have studied so far. It also exhibits some political aspects in practice, although Hitler made similarly cynical statements from time to time. For example, in comparing political propaganda to soap advertising, he also created a diabolically effective concrete ideology which, although or because it touched the lowest intellectual and moral level hitherto plumbed in human history, still had a mighty and dangerous power over the masses. Here Burnham contents himself with a cynically sketched prescription for an effective ideology, professedly because the science for which he stood was too grand to manufacture ideologies. To be sure, after the war he himself emerged as the chief propagandist of fresh aggression. In reality this dualism reflects his inability to expand his indirect apologetic, which was created precisely in order to make up for and to outstrip the weak effect of direct apologetics on the masses, into an ideology that would evoke widespread mass enthusiasm. He contents himself with a methodological recipe because he could no longer find an effective ideology to go with this indirect defense of monopoly capitalism. For the working masses could never warm to the idea that shareholders were being succeeded by managers, all the less in view of Burnham's contention that working conditions were bound to remain the same. Thus Burnham's charge that the technocrats were stating their aims all too openly also applies to himself, but over and above this, his now infamous attempt to create an indirect apologetic for the purposes of American imperialism is itself proof of the fact that the recourse to indirect apologetics did not reflect any lack of skill or experience on the ideologists' part. It was the necessary ideological consequence of the structure and potential influence of American imperialism. And Burnham himself furnishes proof of this point in that his later war propaganda writings, which tried to create an ideology for the crusade against the Soviet Union, virtually never returned to this managerial revolution. All this leads us on to the second demagogic complex, national demagogy. As we have noted, Hitler steered German national sentiments which were well-founded, and has readily kindled into enthusiasm, into the chauvinistic ideology of aggression and global conquest. Burnham and associated direct apologists set the same target not only for the American nation, but for every nation. They were, however, unable to produce an ideology of this kind. Hitler too came to grief with the expansion of his ideology beyond Germany's frontiers into an ideology of the new Europe. But the failure of Burnham and company begins much earlier than that. For how could one rouse any enthusiasm in the ordinary American for the defense of his country on the Yalu River in Korea, or in Morocco? Of course a narrow section of monopoly capitalists and their aides were wildly excited about these plans. Of course heated discussions of such subjects can spring up in clubs or cafes even among ordinary men, under the influence of neatly packaged, monopolistically handled war propaganda. But the big question is, what are we left with if these catchphrases are converted into practice, if they grow into personal issues of life and death? Realistic records of the Second World War offer a none too rosy prospect. Although Japan had been treated as the old enemy for decades, and although the war started with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the soldiers in Mailer's book talk as follows: "What have I got against these goddamn Japs? Do you think I care whether they keep this goddamn jungle or not?" 1. And the dialogue goes on to express their really deep hatred of their own superiors. Bromfield portrays the same situation, only in a more apathetic tone. If, in Stefan Heim's novel, 3 there are isolated enthusiastic combatants, that is only because they believe, naively, in the crusade to spread democracy. The substance of the novel is precisely their disappointment as a result of the actual American imperialist policy in occupied Germany, the suppression of democracy and the protection of fascists by the real military leaders. And experience of the effects of the Korean War carries one in the same direction for Burnham and his ilk. Therefore, the central issue would be to make the man in the street grasp that the national life of the American people is threatened by the Soviet Union's aggressive designs. But Burnham himself states, whatever the truth about the military potential of the Red Army, it seems reasonably clear that the communist leaders regard its military role as strategic defense. Indeed, Burnham takes this defensive character of the Soviet Union's policy so seriously that in line with some statements by MacArthur he draws this conclusion: for 2 or 3 years we are free to behave towards the Soviet Union and communism as we like, without risk of military conflict. This voices clearly the ideology of naked open aggression. It is not, therefore, a personal propagandistic weakness in Burnham and his associates if they have failed to mobilize the masses into what purports to be national self-defense. That was all the more inevitable because the Soviet peace policy and readiness to negotiate becomes more and more plain to the masses as the Soviet Union, in all her public statements, stresses indefatigably that the peaceful coexistence of different social systems is eminently possible. The difference in practice between Hitler's indirect and American direct apologetics is manifest in the consideration that, whereas Hitler succeeded in gradually maneuvering the German labor force into an imperial war of aggression, the American imperialists and their ideologists are forced to begin at that very point at which Hitler finally arrived after a long period of preparation and deception. The deeper cause of this situation lies in the fact that the American imperial ideologists, above all Burnham, do not see the Soviet Union primarily as a rival political power to the USA. Indeed often, as we have noted, they are compelled to admit that such a political contest for world rule does not exist in the Soviet Union's mind. They see the real danger instead in the spread of communism, and it is this, not the socialist state as such, that they consider their real adversary. Here again we are concerned chiefly with the ideological aspects of this question complex. And for that very reason, the antithesis just stated is not new to us. For imperialist bourgeois ideology, socialism has been the main enemy since Nietzsche. To be sure, this struggle was a largely ideological one for a long while, albeit combined with bourgeois political reprisals. Only since the socialist victory in the Soviet Union has it become more and more strongly bound up with methods used in the imperialist powers' foreign policies. And it is only natural for this struggle to have become increasingly acute with the growth of Soviet power and the victory of socialism in other countries as well. It is beyond the scope of our studies to investigate how the imperialist powers' foreign policy, from the support of a Kolchak or Denikin to the present Cold War, has absorbed more and more elements of civil war. This is of import to our theme only because the challenge to communist ideology has thereby shifted to the center of all controversy more openly than ever before. Objectively and in point of fact this has been the case since Nietzsche. But the ensuing shifts of accent represent something qualitatively new. It was possible to say in our foregoing studies that the exacerbation of the struggle was linked with a continual drop in the intellectual and moral level of bourgeois ideology. This was already evident in Nietzsche's entry into this arena, by comparison with the founders of modern irrationalism in combating the bourgeois concept of progress. This drop in standards eventually culminated in Hitler. Now Burnham and his ilk have long exceeded it. With Burnham, the question inevitably arises of what one can and must oppose to the communist outlook. Hitler still had the iridescent soap bubbles of his myth. Burnham has only the scum, and Burnham did sense a weakness in his position here. That is why he strongly resisted any claim to a world outlook. Many people, he remarked, were fascinated by this appeal to one and demanded something similar from the bourgeois side. Since we cannot have such a belief because of the nature of the situation, said Burnham, we are imperceptibly cramped into a posture of sterility and passiveness. Burnham planned to reawaken an active, attacking spirit by means of 2 arguments. Firstly, he identified a world outlook with totalitarianism and defined the very lack of a philosophy in the bourgeois world today as its supreme merit, to be defended as a sacred possession. Secondly, he deemed the world outlook to be superfluous from the practical political angle. Also in the second place he stated, it is untrue that a war or a social conflict can only end in success if the program and its defense take a positive form. Most often the opposite is true. On the whole, men understand far better what they are against than what they are for. By way of an example he cited the French Revolution as a negation of the ancient regime. But it does not take a profound knowledge of history to see through the sophistry of these arguments. When the French peasants said no to feudalism, that was a verbal expression among many others of their striving for possession of land, for a free say in their labor and the fruits of it, for political freedom and so on, that is, something positive. In the reality of society, the terms yes and no are inseparably linked dialectically. There does not exist a no in social reality which does not incorporate an essentially positive element. Even the machine wreckers, through their no, were striving for something positive. That this something was full of backward prejudices and extremely vague is another matter. But this vagueness was not present in the French Revolution as far as its bourgeois democratic aims are concerned. Only when the victory's contradictory features began to point beyond bourgeois society did any vagueness set in, as an ideological characteristic of the primitive, undeveloped state of the notion of socialism possible at the time, and here again, it did not assume the form of pure negativity for which Burnham calls. It goes without saying that Burnham's standpoint is also inadmissible from a philosophical angle. It is an existentialist myth whose untenability I have proved in my examination of this subject, that a particular and peculiar reality, Heidegger's nullifying nothing etc. may pertain to negation. Affirmation and negation are related to the self-same objective reality, and they express, often in different forms, sometimes with certain variations in content, the same concrete substance. But despite the philosophical untenability of this fetishizing of the negation, it certainly does have real social foundations. It is the ideological self-defense of those intellectuals who have lost all social stability, who thus feel totally isolated socially, in a situation vis-a-vis terrene. Naturally, the negative character of such a situation is again something that positively exists, and when important writers like Dostoevsky describe it, their account differs only in the psychology of such figures from the psychology of normal man. Only in extreme decadence is this psychology inflated into a component in the shaping of reality itself. Then a literature parallel to existentialist philosophy comes into being. Now Burnham sought to make this nihilism the ideological starting point of the struggle against socialism. The world which he was defending no longer had a philosophy or ideals, and out of this necessity he made a virtue one, it must be said, which rates as such only in the eyes of decadent intellectual parasites. Certainly it is a universal phenomenon today for the defense of the free world, as a basis for the supposedly healthy development of mankind to prod an extremely close alliance with decadent thought and morality. This alliance is not fortuitous, for, on the one hand, all decadent minds detect instinctively that their existence can have a foundation only in an objectively decayed world, even if subjectively they believe themselves to be passionately against that world. And, on the other, the political cynicism of ultra-reactionary systems can make much use of just such decadent ideologists. It is not by accident that today, Burnham more or less occupies the position of Rosenberg or Goebbels. All three represent a similar type of decadence. The ideology of the direct apologetic of monopoly capitalism has to employ the methods of a hypocritical cynicism, suppressing all popular freedom in the name of freedom and democracy, preparing for war and waging it in the name of safeguarding peace, and so on. This propaganda, moreover, not only uses downright lies, the Kravchenko method, in its claims. It also arranges for various imperialist crimes to be depicted, with the press monopoly's help, as non-existent, bacteria warfare, mistreatment of Korean and Chinese prisoners of war, etc. It is plain that just as the cynical nihilists Rosenberg and Goebbels were Hitler's born propagandists, the cynical hypocrite of Burnham's type is the born ideologist for the Cold War today. Here it is unnecessary for us to consider the political consequences and perspectives of such propaganda more closely. Let us give just one example of how this nihilism affects the ideology behind practical politics, and how, in drawing the consequences from the social situation and the resulting ideology, it reveals its own nature, its negativity. Some time ago the former general staff officer of Hitler's Wehrmacht, Adalbert Weinstein, published a collection of writings. In it, the essence of the German army now coming into being is defined as an army without emotion. Military feeling, the argument runs, means an exaggeration of martial values. It is also the product of national consciousness, the will to fight and masculine pride. In the past, such feeling was linked with the reality of wars. This link snapped with Hitler's propaganda, but the soldiers at the front, having relinquished all emotion, tried to wipe out the enemy wherever possible. From all this Weinstein drew the following conclusions: the struggle of the industrialized nations no longer knows the pathos of war. In reality the American troops constitute, in their training methods and on the battlefield, an army without emotion. The conclusion, here, is as interesting as the argument leading up to it. Weinstein perceived clearly that the old wars were charged with feeling, that is, with a content inspiring the nation, the masses, and that under Hitler the feeling vanished. But since Weinstein was unable to counter Hitler's inhuman martial objectives with real socio-human ideals, he made the same virtue of necessity as Burnham does in general ideological terms. He opposed Hitler's empty propaganda with a total ideational vacuum by locating the reason for this loss of pathos in the industrialization of Germany and the USA, and not in the reactionary turn taken by their social development. With this, Weinstein is a war theorist arrived at the very point which Burnham reached in his general ideological formulation. Such agreement could be proved between many authors today. It shows to what extent the reality of society always dictates the proposition, method and solution. Monopoly capitalism's ideologists have only a purely negative answer to all present-day questions: at all costs no communism, anything but that. And if we have no positive ideal with which to oppose it, then let nothingness be the ideal. But however cynically authors like Burnham define the sociological criteria of a purportedly effective ideology, nothing can be conjured out of nothingness that would really mobilize the masses for permanent dedication to a cause on which they would stake their lives. No ideology even in Burnham's spirit. Although the monopoly of public opinion may occasionally delude great masses through mercurial and contradictory lies, Hitler's example shows that there are severe limits to such influence. In the unceasing confrontation with reality by examining Weinstein's views, we have already crossed beyond the U.S. frontiers. This we had to do, for the crusade proclaimed against communism by Burnham was required to mobilize not only the American people but peoples all over the world. Here lies the second weak point in the reactionary ideology prevailing today. And Burnham voices it with open cynicism: the USA needs allies and not mercenaries. And yet it is uncertain who is or can be an ally, and to what degree. The cynical hypocrisy of Burnham's exposition is expressed in his contrast between allies and mercenaries, since United States foreign policy actually seeks mercenaries, although to be sure it calls them allies. These doubts, which were already well founded when Burnham wrote the above words, are manifested far more distinctly and concretely in an essay published 2 years later by Raymond Aron. In dealing with the Franco-American relationship, Aron turns to the subject of old and new fellow travelers, those people, that is, who accept American command just as quickly as, in bygone times, they bow to the rule of the Third Reich. Sometimes, regrettably, it is the same people. He holds it against them again, very regretfully, that it is just these Western Europeans who are seemingly not in the least concerned about the threat arising through a Russian supremacy in the cultural field. And he finds in non-communists most markedly an attitude which is that of neutralists. They deny our dependence, maintaining simplified it is in the Europeans' power to shake off the so-called supremacy of America, and that the danger of war will recede, if not be completely banished, as soon as Europeans dissociate themselves for good from their influential protectors. In an extreme form this view is found above all in France, and especially among the French intellectuals. As a symptom all this is undoubtedly important, but what lies behind it? We have indicated the answer in commenting on Burnham's statements about allies and mercenaries. The best definition so far of the principle behind American foreign policy has been given by Hitler's erstwhile official lawyer, the Carl Schmitt, already well known to readers of this book. Schmitt is now not only endeavoring for and obtaining a full amnesty, but is in the process of rising to become the legal theorist of the American age. Schmitt's formulation rivals Burnham's in cynicism but surpasses it in precision, cujus economia, edis regio. This is a cynically candid expression of the United States' absolute claim to global dominion. And not by chance is it an up-to-date secular variant on the Augsburg Convention, cujus regio, edis religio. In both cases naked power relations are stated as absolute determinants, only now of course at a more advanced stage, hence economic in substance and absolute in all political respects. Naturally economic supremacy in the capitalist world had long been a means of intervening in the internal affairs of politically independent but economically dependent states. But as long as different groups of rival imperial powers existed, this very rivalry set specific limits to such interference. As a result of the Second World War, however, the USA was left as the sole imperial power really independent in the economic sense, at least during the time that has hitherto elapsed. That is to say, not only on colonial territory has the competition between imperial states become highly unequal, certainly it is still going on. What were imperial powers up to now have found themselves more and more dependent on America economically. Clearly this new situation was also reflected more and more strongly in the interdependence of her foreign and domestic policies, and the former became determined more and more by this new economic basis. Schmitt expresses this state of affairs, one which has existed for a very long time de facto, with the same candid cynicism with which, as Hitler's ideological right-hand man, he once voiced the principle woe to the neutrals. It is clear that the qualitatively altered situation had also to be reflected in ideology. The most important such form it took was an increasingly widespread cosmopolitanism, the view that the independence of nation-states and their political sovereignty had been overtaken by history. The predominance of cosmopolitanism does not mean the total disappearance of chauvinist campaigns, cf. the agitation against the Oder-Neisse line in Western Germany. But on the whole it is the less significant phenomenon. Economic, political and cultural developments, said the cosmopolitan ideologists, were driving increasingly towards an integration of individual states, the annulment of national sovereignties, and ultimately towards a global state. Here, as in Hitlerian ideology, one can observe that the bourgeois thinking of the imperial period had tacitly to concede defeat in the intellectual struggle with historical materialism. Although publicly combating the latter even more militantly where possible, it was capable of constructing a counter-ideology only with the help of distorted and falsified borrowings from it. And this counter-ideology is a caricature strung together from twisted scraps of historical materialism. That was already how Hitler's socialism was constructed. Such elements are to be found in Burnham's manager theory, the redundancy of the capitalist in production, etc. The priority of the economic basis over political sovereignty appears in Schmitt. And all this also applies here. The Marxian view of capitalism's historical mission, of the creation of a unified world market and world economy, was now presented in a distorted, caricaturistic form, everything turning topsy-turvy and every truth becoming a lie. For, in the first place, there is less of a unified capitalist world economy today than ever before. More than 800 million people live outside the capitalist sphere of influence. In the second place, and this is particularly relevant to cosmopolitanism and the world state, it is untrue that the origin of a world economy and market would render national sovereignty and the independence of nations outmoded and do away with these constructions. The intensifying of the economic links does not mean the end of autonomous national development. On the contrary, the evolution of socialism shows that even peoples previously living free of history, awoke precisely in socialism to a conscious national life. There is no dying out of national culture, of an awareness of national independence and an enthusiasm for it among any of the peoples pursuing a socialist life. On the contrary, they are gaining strength all the time, but this movement is also found in peoples living under capitalism. Indeed, the penetration by capitalism of hitherto pre-capitalist areas has given rise everywhere to national feelings, national consciousness, and a striving after national independence. The historical thesis of cosmopolitanism, the world state theory, is in glaring contradiction to the facts of present-day reality. Naturally it too is supported by specific social facts. But here, similarly, the fundamental blindness of imperialist ideology clearly emerges. Granted, it is forced to acknowledge the presence in society of the mounting awareness of the masses, and of their demand for economic and social, political and cultural recognition. But it interprets these things as a menace to culture, as wholly reprehensible, so here once again its endeavors are purely defensive. Political measures of repression are not the concern of this book. We have dealt repeatedly and in detail with the history of this bourgeois attitude as the problem of Vermissung. We have noted also how Hitler's national and social demagogy supplied for a transitional period a short-lived bogus solution. Here again the limit to the prevailing direct apologetic of capitalism is delineated by the fact that in reverting to 19th century liberal ideology, it also inherited the latter's dread of the masses and resistance to their independence. Obviously it did so in a qualitatively heightened form reflecting conditions in the imperialist period. That means that this ideology took nothing into account besides the situation and perspective of the ruling class and its intellectual following. The cultivation of the masses was left to propaganda and repression. Burnham's division of science and propaganda is thus founded on the situation of the post-war imperialist bourgeoisie. Now as far as the national question and cosmopolitanism, the world state and so on are concerned in this context, Riccardo Lombardi has rightly pointed out that all capitalist colonization is connected with the buttressing of the old ruling classes. These form an alliance with the colonizers in order to prop up their tottering power. Earlier it was the feudal classes, and it still is in, for instance, some Arab states. Now if, as today, fully developed capitalist states and indeed major powers are being colonized by the United States, present-day monopoly capitalism is taking over the role which the feudal classes used to play, it becomes the native prop for the betrayal of national independence. On this foundation, the ideology of cosmopolitanism acquires real, not impotent supporters. Burnham's negative catchphrase resistance to communism at all costs, even at the expense of national sovereignty, finds a concrete basis among this social group and the intellectuals serving it, and on this basis the cosmopolitan ideology turns into one of a doctrinaire betrayal of the homeland. To be sure, this situation does not mean that the existing real antitheses are superseded in the national question. On the contrary, they are constantly exacerbated in point of fact. For among every people, the safeguarding of national independence and sovereignty will also mobilize those groups that otherwise would be indifferent, indeed averse to communism. Since the communists, true to Marxist-Leninist doctrine, always figure everywhere as the guardians and pioneers of national freedom and self-determination, resistance to communism in the American spirit is bound to win communism new allies all the time. Hitler fell down miserably on this issue, with his plan for the new European order. The impossibility of the American plan to revive Hitler's policy on a global scale is already manifest before being fully put into practice. It is also manifest here why such empty and automatically ineffective catchphrases as Weinstein's war without emotion are bound to spring up everywhere. Inflammatory slogans, political or martial feeling, can only stem from convictions and emotions which the nation really possesses. The dogmatic antithesis to popular endeavors we have outlined is force reducing the direct apologetic of American imperialism to an insubstantial propaganda technique from the very start. Again, to examine this more closely is not our task. We have mentioned one essential element which already enters into ideology, namely the exploitation of the press monopoly, etc., to depict non-existent things as reality and to assert the absence of facts which are plain to see, such as the aforementioned bacteria warfare. All this already happened under Hitler. The difference is merely that although from the international angle the American propaganda machine is far more powerful, it does not have the corrupt charm of Hitler's beguiling mysticism. It has to be drier, more sober, and for that reason the contrasts between its aims and the real wishes of the masses will come to light more quickly. Of course it would be a gross political error to underestimate the potential influence of so mighty a machine. As planned, we shall not go into a concrete assessment of the issue here. What matters in analyzing the ideology is to point out the illusions produced by the pressure of the machine itself on the one hand, and arising out of the stated view of mass feeling, on the other. The illusion, above all, that such propaganda could really convince everybody that only communist fifth columns would develop a resistance to the ideals of the American age. Hitler in his time confused his quislings with nations. Now many ideologists of direct apologetics are confusing the majority of nations with fifth columns. The reason, in both cases, is a contempt for the masses and hence a blindness towards their real will. Besides this, and there is an interconnection here, we have the megalomania of the machinery. The American professor Henry Morgenthau calls attention to the fact that the press, radio, etc., are by no means identical with real public opinion in America. That the false association has given rise to false crowd-pulling politics. The administration, he says, has become a prisoner of its own propaganda. This flimsiness of the direct apologetics of American imperialism is closely linked with another difference from Hitler's indirect apologetic. We refer to the public relationship to religion and the churches. Hitler's myth put forward the claim to be an immediate substitute for religion. It therefore contained an overt polemic against Catholicism. It was, as we have shown in the relevant chapter, a demagogic continuation of the religious atheism of irrationalist philosophy. All these motives are absent from present-day direct apologetics. These, on the contrary, seek support very actively from all the churches, and especially the Roman Catholic. The Vatican's propaganda machine is as close to the voice of America as the Banca di Santo Spirito to Wall Street. Here we must certainly stress that Rosenberg's hostility to Catholicism must not be taken too seriously either. For certain sections it meant an ideological shadowboxing, but it did not stop the Hitler regime from receiving concrete support from the Vatican and the leading German Catholics. It is self-evident that this difference did not arise primarily out of the shortcomings of ideology as a most welcome complement, but out of the socio-historical evolution of the United States themselves. There, church and commerce were always as intimately linked as were capitalism and Protestant sects at the time of their founding. And since the United States did not go through any such crises as those experienced by European nations after the French Revolution, there was no profound shaking of religious faith either. Thus the defense of capitalist society in America did not need to incorporate religious atheism in the systems of indirect apologetics. The so-called agnosticism of a part of the highbrow intelligentsia was something perfectly harmless in comparison to the European ideological crises. So it was organically, out of the social evolution of the United States themselves, that the alliance between the churches above all, the Vatican, and American imperialism grew into a crusade against communism again. It is not our present task to analyze and to judge the political, the practical propagandistic importance of this alliance, for example, its influence on backward agricultural and petty bourgeois sectors. The only issue which concerns us is the ideological side, whether the alliance with religion and the church can fill this direct apologetics pure and empty negativity with a philosophical content, whether it can make up for the obligatory renunciation of a religious substitute law Rosenberg. These questions too, we think, must be answered in the negative. That such philosophical trends as French existentialism which continue the religious atheistic line cannot attain to a leading role internationally, that they represent an intermediate stage, a third road, ideology, is only a negative symptom of this situation. A positive one would be provable only if it could be shown where and when a new spiritual motive arises through this alliance with religion and the church, an element of religious, or even just pseudo-religious, enthusiasm. But there is not a trace of this. And so profoundly counter-revolutionary a thinker as the white Russian émigré Berdyaev correctly indicates the cause. He writes, with deep sorrow, of the unreligious condition of contemporary man. The overwhelming majority of men, Christians included, are materialists, and they do not believe in the power of the Spirit. They believe in nothing but material power, military or economic, but this basic attitude is by no means incompatible with an allegiance to religion and even a cult of myths. In dealing with Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, we have referred to the spiritual comfort offered to a decadent intelligentsia by the religious atheism of the one and the emotional religiosity of the other. The more advanced the decadence, the stronger the need for such a comfort will become. It has already assumed overtly religious forms in previous ages, for example, in the Austrian type of Baroque Catholicism. Thus today, it can have the religious tint which is in vogue politically and can do so in a candidly cynical way without having undergone the slightest change in basic moral attitude or the least enrichment in philosophical matters. Aldous Huxley, who has recently begun preaching mysticism, represents this attitude with uncommonly frank cynicism. He does not, of course, believe in the slightest in the real core of any genuinely mystical state, in the mystical union with God, but he adds, but that by no means diminishes the value of mysticism as a road to well-being. Nobody regards Swedish gymnastics or cleaning one's teeth as a direct avenue to God. If we make a habit of yoga or Pepsodent, we do it for our well-being. For the same reason we should make a habit of mysticism and moral virtue, it will no longer surprise the reader that such an ideological comfort should appear precisely at a time when intellectuals were invoking God in despair. The connection is clearly visible in Aldous Huxley's cynicism. With Bertrand Russell, this religious despair is manifested even more cynically, pursuing in an apparently jocular way all the counter-revolutionary, aggressive imperialist consequences. Russell offers, on the plane of religious metaphysics, the following perspective: perhaps I sometimes imagine God does not want us to understand the mechanism with which he steers the material universe. Perhaps nuclear physicists have come so close to the ultimate secrets that he thinks it is time to call a halt to their work. And what simpler method could he adopt than to let them carry on their inventions until mankind is wiped out? If I could imagine that deer and squirrels, nightingales and larks would survive this catastrophe, I could face it with some equanimity. Man has proved, after all, that he is unworthy to be the lord of creation, but such apocalyptic moods always have an exactly delineated political content, the life and death struggle against socialism. For people like Bertrand Russell, the demise of humanity is more bearable than the prospect of a socialist victory. And of course the apocalypse is not to be taken seriously. Its real substance, that which Russell desires, is for the White Terror to succeed the Red and for a single military government, the American, naturally GL, to be set up all over the world. The religious renaissance, then, is nothing more than a further ideological sanction of atomic and bacteria warfare. Lippmann once wrote, when the times grow out of joint, some men storm the barricades and others retire to a monastery. We have shown the ideological difficulties of the counter-revolutionary barricades and have also intimated that ideologically, the aid of religion should not be rated too highly. As regards the monastery idea, this is a general sign of decadence in times of crisis, an ideological retreat from great conflicts and the repudiation of a standpoint. The detail of whether it is a Buddhist atheist monastery or a Catholic one is, if we examine the ideology of withdrawal, which we cannot do here, of no great importance. All the more significant, however, is the direction taken in the escape. For even in judging the ideology, it would, precisely where the conflicts are great and decisive, be wrong to take the viewpoint, whoever is not for it is against it, or simply to lump together all who seek a third road, or want to be neutral. No, in that respect every monastery is still for or against one of the parties to the struggle. Moriarty or Graham Greene, when they write religious fiction in which all concretely social matter pales into insignificance beside religious themes, are standing, and we do not need to take into account Moriarty's overtly warmongering publications, on the imperialist side of the barricade merely by staying in the monastery. On the other hand, Karl Barth's rejection of any social distinctions in religion, for example, contains a rejection of imperialist warfare. Not for nothing does the imperialist press speak of Barth, and of Niemöller in particular, as lost souls in a no-man's land, or even as abductors into a no-man's land, whereas it sees in Moriarty or Graham Greene a significant extension in depth to its mental portrait of the world. Here this press is evincing a sound political and aesthetic instinct in no respect save for built-in miracles does the world shaped by these writers differ from the decadent movement's barbaric unleashing of the instincts, and such monasteries may very well be suitable places of training for future collaborators or even for imperialist butchers. Mention of these religious ideologies affords us a chance to make a few comments on the great history philosopher of our day, A.J. Toynbee. Philosophically, his now famous oeuvre offers nothing new whatever on all the main issues. Toynbee is a straightforward epigone of the vitalist epigone Spengler, from whom he has borrowed all his important concepts, such as opposition to the unity of history, the equating of all civilizations, the denouncing of progress as illusory, and so on. His so-called originality is expressed in wholly trivial details, for however many such culture cycles either one of them constructs with equal arbitrariness, they result in as few concrete differences as exist between, to recall Lenin's joke, a red devil and a blue one, that is, none at all. It also matters little that Toynbee does not draw on Spengler's biological irrationalism. For to his mind, a culture's historical transition from a static to a dynamic condition is a pure rational miracle instead. To effect this transition, Toynbee also uses purely mythological similes, and he argues this method with the following epistemological considerations. The occurrence can be best expressed in such mythological images, for they are not affected by the contradictions arising when an observation is translated into logical terms. If God's universe is perfect, no devil can logically exist apart from it, while if the devil does exist, then the perfection which he comes to disrupt would necessarily be already imperfect through the mere fact of his existence. This contradiction, which is beyond a logical solution, the imagination of the poet and prophet transcends intuitively so here, but in a far clumsier and more rudimentary form than in the later Schelling, mythology becomes the intuitive form to absorb and to express universal truths. The removal of Spengler's biological irrationalism thus produces, if anything, an even wilder nonsense. Here a comparison with Spengler clearly shows the general decline in standards which we have already observed in Spengler compared to Nietzsche and Dilthey. In view of this, it is not worth examining Toynbee's writings in detail. Let us emphasize just one point, the point at which his connection with Christian allegiance is clearly manifest in the decisive part of his philosophy of history. Toynbee sees the only way out of the current crisis in an imitation of Christ. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword, but his admonition is directed exclusively at the internal and external proletariat, another of the discoveries which Toynbee makes for the whole of history. But again a high-flown copy of the fascist theory of proletarian nations, his admonition does not apply to the ruling classes, whose use of violence he finds very compatible with Christianity. If we now consider the overall ideological situation as outlined so far, we must immediately ask what scope it affords to originality, to profundity and influence. The answer is none at all, and we are not alone in saying this. Let us turn to so respected an ideologist of decadence and friend of America as Denis de Rougemont. But unfortunately this revolt by culture against the world surrounding us was denied all direct influence up to the present. It is the affair of an elite which, increasingly isolated from the general mass, becomes alienated from political, social and economic occurrences which obey their own laws, laws that are growing less and less acceptable to the human spirit. Between the businessman, the politician, the proletarian on the one hand and a Rilke or a Heidegger on the other, there is no longer a common language, a common visualization of the goal or the values of life and society. They are linked at best by such vague words as freedom, democracy and justice, and each man imagines something different by these. No longer is there a universally recognized authority to proclaim the truth, and to fix a common set of values. Almost everything that is going on in Europe today finds itself somehow at odds with what is right and proper in the view of the various orthodoxies, according to bourgeois morality or the criteria of reason. Our illustrious author is not content with this observation. He gives a very characteristic example of the inefficacy of the one ideology he esteems, the hero of which is another prominent figure in the same movement, Arthur Koestler. After one of his anti-communist novels had appeared, Koestler received some letters from students, and Rougemont quotes the following extract: "Your portrayal of Stalinism is in my opinion perfectly correct. That is why I'm joining a communist party, because I was just looking for such a discipline. This failure and impotence are not surprising. The single word despair, as the substance of this ideology, does not suffice to explain matters, for as we have seen, Heidegger's despair was able directly to prepare the way for Hitlerism. Today a writer like Graham Greene is able to exert a similar influence. But now we are dealing with something different, something additional and more concrete. Not just with a general despair about all human activity. This, from Schopenhauer to Heidegger, has led into the reactionary camp or at least to collaboration with it. Rougemont, Koestler and their ilk, however, are not only despairing in general. Their doubt and their despair are directed primarily towards those glad tidings, which, they came to announce, towards the defense of the free world. Let us turn again to an authentic witness of events, Koestler himself, speaking through a character in his novel The Age of Longing. One has a distinct feeling that the character, Julian, is speaking more frankly than the author would otherwise dare to speak. Now I happen to believe that Europe is doomed, a chapter in history which is drawing to its finish. This is, so to speak, my contemplative truth. Looking at the world with detachment, in the sign of eternity, I'll find it not even disturbing. But I'll also happen to believe in the ethical imperative of fighting evil, even if the fight is hopeless, and on this plane my contemplative truth becomes defeatist propaganda and thus an immoral influence. And this confession closes with an observation some importance, coming from Koestler, Future of Art and Literature in the Free World. So about the zealously defended by the author, European art is dying out, because it can't live without truth, and its truth has become arsenic. That means that Koestler is saying of his own world that it cannot bear an art which faithfully reflects reality. But that is exactly what the outstanding anti-fascists once observed about the relation of the Third Reich to true and realistic art. It is also part of the emerging picture, to be sure, that such observations by no means prevent men like Rougemont and Koestler from engaging in American war propaganda. The same observation, therefore, which made rigorous anti-Hitlerites of honest men of letters produces in the defenders of the free world only the luxury of a self-irony, a cheekily self-indulgent nuance to their imperialist propaganda. Here we find confirmed in a new domain our earlier remarks on the hypocritical cynicism of these ideologists. Believing in what they preach no more than Lippmann, they copy Burnham in acting as their own Rauschning, even if they distribute the incongruities over different writings. Naturally, despair does not lead solely to submission or even to making common cause with imperialist reaction. It can sometimes mark a crisis giving rise to a new awareness of reason. But it may also harbor such a collapse into inactivity, an intended self-surrender reaching suicidal proportions, that its usefulness, even its reactionary usefulness, appears to be more than questionable. The highly successful American novelist Louis Bromfield has depicted such a fate in his Mr. Smith. From the social angle he is no doubt right when he makes his narrator draw a parallel between himself and Babbitt. In writing of these men, I am not writing just of Babbitts. There are no Babbitts left. They belong to a particular phase of American life, and that phase is over. Today Babbitt, with his vanity, his easy nature, his strong extrovertedness and the rowdiness covering up his lack of culture, is a misfit and in some ways an outcast. All his qualities and his true problem have been ousted to some extent by illness and perplexity, whose victims are unaware of it and seek refuge in materialism, excessive activity and alcohol. Babbitt was crude in his way, but healthy. The illness of which I am writing, and which is constantly on the increase, is quite different. I know what I am talking about, and I fear for a whole nation and people Bromfield and his hero, to be sure, overestimate Babbitt's healthiness. Readers of both novels will know that what ruins the life of Bromfield's hero also crops up in Babbitt's life, albeit as a mere episode. The seeds of Bromfield's despair, though existing in Babbitt in embryo, are there put to rights by American freedom, from a boycott to material and moral ruin. This is not to discredit Bromfield. Seen through Mr. Smith's eyes, Babbitt is bound to seem healthy and robust, and it is precisely Bromfield's achievement to have portrayed accurately the turning of one type into a qualitatively different type in consequence of social developments. It is part and parcel of this heightening that Mr. Smith has even less inkling of the true determining causes of his fate than Babbitt did. In both characters, however, there is an instinctive revolt against a specifically American conformism, against the standardization by force if necessary of all thoughts and feelings. Sinclair Lewis, who was more conscious of these issues than Bromfield now is, said of such tendencies among the Good Citizens League, which liquidates Babbitt's excursion into eccentricity, and they confirm that American democracy may not mean equality of means but does on the other hand dictate a sound uniformity in thinking, dress, morals, painting and mode of expression. Sinclair Lewis, though not Babbitt, even knew that this conformism in the shapes of democracy and liberty was a universal capitalist phenomenon, only manifesting itself far more strongly in the United States than elsewhere on earth. The idea of defending just this world in the name of the right to nonconformity is another clear example of the Rauschning syndrome. What is therefore at stake in this development, whether or not Bromfield knows it, is the fate of the average man under capitalism gone to seed. We can understand only too well why men of healthy vital instincts should spontaneously revolt against such a perspective of their existence. This revolt often assumes an anti-capitalist form, usually fairly vague. We have already read of Raymond Aron's indignation at the general spreading of such feelings in Europe, but he was not the only thinker to object to it. By a long chalk, Professor D.W. Brogan of Cambridge, for instance, sees in the anti-capitalist sentiments of many Europeans the roots of their anti-Americanism. For us it is a matter of indifference that Professor Brogan wants to overcome these sentiments. Indeed, his very friendliness towards America lends to his observations a particular value. He writes, for if someone rejects the modern, capitalist, GL, world, he is perfectly entitled to reject it in its most representative form, and this is in the majority of cases the American form. Not because the Americans are especially depraved, but because they occupy a leading position in the technological field in the world today. It cannot be helped that unfavorable conclusions about America may possibly be drawn from this. At all events, anyone rejecting the modern world for one reason or another is well advised to reject it in its most consummate form. That is exactly the fate of M. R. Smith, of which the average European and above all the intellectual has a fear amounting to panic. Already he is disoriented and driven to despair by his own monopoly capitalism, which is still relatively undeveloped, so how alarming its American consummation must seem to him. It is Bromfield's further achievement to have shown the connection between modern decadent art, up to surrealism, and Mr. Smith's desperate loss of his bearings. He shows us the feelings and outlook, or rather, the lack of an outlook, which give rise to the effect of this art. Mr. Smith tells of a journey he made to New Orleans to drown the memory of his domestic surroundings with a few days, drinking and whoring. When I look back on that trip, my whole impression of it always reminds me of one of those surrealist paintings composed entirely of a tangle of narrow streets with lurid neon lights screaming out the jolly fellow, and the wild man a tangle of disconnected hands and arms, nothing but ghostly figures reaching out from narrow alleys and entrances to pull a man off the rails. Certainly it looks like that to one who has had a lot to drink. Mr. Smith's experience is unconscious, elemental, but it can be readily reconciled with critical endeavors to show more precisely why abstract art has become supreme among elevated circles in the United States, and what has made it so. The Marxist Finkelstein, who gives a vivid indication of these methods in an essay, quotes an article in the New York Times by Alain B. Luchain. Humanism goes back to the anthropomorphic philosophy of the Greeks when man was at home in the world, making himself the measure of things. And when art in the world as it is found expression by creating a representation of the world as man desires it to be. Such thinking presupposes a finite, calculable universe with independent, powerful man at its center, and a reality largely accessible to man's faculties of comprehension. But with our modern scientific research, such a picture of the universe is no longer possible. Of course, what the author of the article sets forth as a conclusion has no relevance to the findings of the natural sciences today. The telling question of why reactionary, decadent, agnosticist mystical journalism receives attention even from certain natural scientists exceeds the scope of these studies. The important point, for us, is that there is a direct road from the spontaneous description of the escape from an inhuman condition into the extra-human realm to a theoretical argumentation of this art from the anti-human principle. This contemporary road stretches far back into the Imperial Age, leading from Paul Ernst and Werner via Ortega y Gasset to Malraux. If this were a purely aesthetic problem, there would be scant reason for occupying ourselves with it now, but is it sheer coincidence that Paul Ernst ended his career as a supporter of Hitler, that Ortega y Gasset as a leading combatant of Vermissung became a typical anti-democrat of our times, or that Malraux turned into the Goebbels of de Gaulle? Because none of this is fortuitous. The protection of abstract, that is, consciously anti-human and anti-realistic art by leading circles in America is likewise no accident, and only snobbery as well on the surface. It is no more of an accident than the persecution and suppression of realism. As Hitler has already proved, a system of this kind cannot tolerate realism. Today we receive the same picture, but from the manifestations of American democracy. In itself the tendency is not new, but its present upsurge signifies something qualitatively new. The fate of Mark Twain as a writer is common knowledge. We have already referred to the democratic terrorism in Babbitt. Later Sinclair Lewis described in Aerosmith the Kid Glove and in Elmer Gantry and King's Blood Royal the notoriously terroristic methods of the free world. They sufficiently account for the great fluctuations in this highly gifted realist as well as the fate of such initially highly promising realists as John Steinbeck and others. And the relation of the free world to realism can be precisely traced in the treatment of Chaplin, Howard Fast and Paul Robeson. The persecution of artistic realism in itself is no longer just an aesthetic matter. But its socio-ideological aspects are revealed more distinctly still if we consider the human content expressed in a decadent literature protected precisely at the points where the moral consequences of a decadent outlook clearly emerge. And this is not a Marxist's anti-Americanism, as we see from observations which Professor H.S. Commager, an American, has made on these issues. The men and women who allow such frenzied rein to their natural instincts in Faulkner, Caldwell, Farrell and Hemingway, in Waldo Frank, Evelyn Scott and Eugene O'Neill are as amoral as animals. Nobody who has examined Ezra Pound's career can doubt that his quest for obscurity is connected with his hatred of democracy, and he adds in conclusion that the attack on reason fomented by such writers is the deepest degradation of man. It is at this point that the problem of modern art through the mediation of ethics tilts over into politics. Artistic policies pursued in the United States have energetically promoted this. Whereas earlier, in Europe especially, the unleashing of the instincts as the substance of art was confined to small circles of an elite among the decadent, parasitic intelligentsia, this content is now being popularized on a broad scale. The barriers between esoteric art and mass kitsch are being dismantled with increasing vigor. The cinema, radio, literary digests, etc., are spreading to the widest extent exactly what in Faulkner, say, is celebrated as quality literature, the uninhibited venting of even the worst instincts. The constant increase in juvenile delinquency, for instance, demonstrates the results of such social pedagogics. To seek the causes in literature would admittedly be wrong. We are simply dealing with symptoms. The Ku Klux Klan and other lynching organizations put the bestial release of the instincts into practice long before leading authors were drawn to the subject. To avoid any misunderstanding, we are now talking of the approval and glorification in literature of an unleashing of the instincts. The realistic mode of representation that calls a spade has no connection with this matter. Certainly detective and gangster films, trashy literature of various types, the Superman of the comic strips and the brutalizing of sport, etc., were the pioneering forerunners of this development, but only now has a comprehensive system arisen that encompasses the top and bottom ends equally. It was a characteristic of the Hitler regime that, by skillful maneuvers, it led essentially and harmlessly mediocre people, sometimes even gifted ones, into becoming accomplices and indeed active participants in terrible crimes and barbaric deeds of inhumanity. Without such social pedagogics, Auschwitz, for example, would not have been possible. Now it is the special feature of the American development that elements of such tendencies have always existed in the South, since the liberation of the slaves. The direct extension of a partially original accumulation of capital into the age of monopoly capitalism facilitated and encouraged the country to pursue such a social path. There is also the specifically Southern nuance whereby the most backward and anachronistic form of exploitation, slavery, had a more or less distinctly capitalist character from the outset. As the result of all this, social elements which otherwise belong entirely to the original accumulation grew, with the appropriate modifications, directly into imperialist capitalism. This further gave rise to the special peculiarity that all this evolved within forms of an exemplary bourgeois democracy. The United States are unfamiliar with any feudalism or absolute monarchy of the kind developed in Europe. And another important component of Hitlerism, racial theory and racial discrimination, was also operative there, especially in the South but later rife everywhere, at a time when racialism still constituted the personal view of reactionary extremists and outsiders in Europe. We pointed out before that Gobineau, unrecognized at home, found his first enthusiastic readers in the southern states of North America. The more American imperialism became the world's leading reactionary power, the more widespread these tendencies grew. They were used, if anything, more deliberately and systematically than under Hitler to pave the way for aggression, imperialist war and for the barbaric waging of wars that had already started loss in Korea. The respectable Democrats in the USA fought and are fighting a hitherto vain struggle against these tendencies. Another aspect of the same picture is that nowhere but in the USA does there exist such a network, such a system of cross-links between overt gangsters and the official state and municipal machinery. Professor H. H. Wilson has published a poll conducted by the National Opinion Research Office in 1944, according to which 5 Americans out of every 7 questioned thought all politicians were corrupt. Here too we can ascertain a constant feeling of indignation on the part of ordinary decent people. But this feeling has no real power behind it, chiefly because the monopoly of public debate, the power of a press governed by the aforestated network and the machinery of the 2 political parties are continually combining demagogically to mislead it. It is, for instance, highly probable that the Republican election victory in 1952 was partly due to a spontaneous revolt by many ordinary people against the corruption of the Democrats. Here we can predict with a fair amount of certainty that in a few years' time, there will be a similar revolt against Republican corruption. The case of Vice President Nixon, which was successfully covered up, sheds a glaring light on the fact that the Republicans are by nature as corrupt as the Democrats. To illustrate this with a random example, let us take the case of O'Dwyer. The following is a quotation from the New Yorker Zeitung, which is certainly not anti-American. O'Dwyer's appointment as ambassador to Mexico was solely the result of a need to move the mayor of New York out of the country before the disgraceful scandals of his hardly commendable administration were exposed. The soil of America has become so hot for this former New York policeman that he prefers to spend the rest of his life in Mexico as counselor to a lawyer's office there. Truman only accepted O'Dwyer's resignation, as he writes in his reply, with reluctance and warmest thanks for services rendered. But O'Dwyer will still be representing the United States along with several other special delegates at the inauguration in a few days, time of the new Mexican president, Ruiz Cortines, and at the time of writing this epilogue, the exposure of McCarran appears about to break. His case is, as a symptom, perhaps even more interesting because McCarran, who is closely associated with gangster organizations, was a veritable pioneer of the true American way of life, and scourge of anti-American tendencies. In its way, the McCarran case symbolizes in a nutshell what is going on among the dominant sector of warmongers as much as the far more innocent captain of Köpenick could once be said to symbolize the state of things in Wilhelm Germany. The particular blend of corruption, gangsterism, crime and political terrorism was also characteristic of the Hitler regime. We may recall Rauschning's conversation with the Führer in which the latter approved of the corruption of the ruling class because absolute obedience could be extorted from its members at any time, their corrupt behavior being a well-known fact. Naturally, this motive also plays a major role in the corruption prevailing today. With each public exposure, it turns out that many initiates have long been informed of the matter but had their reasons for concealing it in public. But the cross-links with the gangster world have the further political advantage that in awkward cases, the ruling class always has at its bidding the adequate terrorist organizations to intimidate and, if need be, to liquidate troublesome elements. This is a substitute in normal times of peace for what military discipline achieves in wartime. Fear is the condition of 20th century man, says Mailer's General Cummings. And to magnify this fear still further, there is the ever-increasing apparatus of the secret police, the legally permissible use of torture in police interrogations, etc. Of course, all this finds an epitome in the army. The army functions best when each individual fears the man above him and despises his inferiors, says the same General Cummings. The resulting general atmosphere of fear is by no means at odds with the aforestated problem of the unleashing of the instincts. On the contrary, this is an absolute necessity, in combating both the internal and the external enemy. As under Hitler, it has simply to be suitably channeled, guided into the desired direction, and the relation of the ruling class to the gangster world is an important intermediate link, intellectual, moral and organizational, in this process to the subject complex of the release of the instincts, gangster life. Intellectual and moral corruption belongs the unprecedentedly powerful role which renegades play in contesting communism. Of course, the phenomenon itself is not entirely new. Between the 2 world wars, after all, we witnessed Trotsky's international propaganda activity and deeds of provocation. There were the various Eastmans, Dorians and so on. But today it is not only ordinary police agents like Kravchenko and his ilk who stand in the forefront of world publicity. The most celebrated authors such as Dos Passos, Salone, Koestler and Malraux, leading politicians like Ernst Reuter, such publicists as Burnham and many others are apostates of communism. Naturally, this gives rise to the question, what makes the apostates of the communist movement so precious in the warmongers' eyes precisely nowadays? As we had already mentioned, the hollowness and poverty of imperialist ideology was bound to entail a constant borrowing from Marxist precepts in a distorted form in an attempt to utilize details of Marxism, absurdly garbled, in the anti-Marxist struggle itself. And naturally the apostates are experts on this subject. C. F. Burnham's treatment of monopolies in contrast to Lippmann or Roque. It turns out that even the most superficial study of Marxism offers immense advantages over the most thorough bourgeois university education, especially in economics and politics. For let us remark at this point that the overwhelming majority of apostates who have now become famous only moved for a time on the periphery of the communist movement. As the renegade Borka now observes, only Salone and Reuter were responsible Communist Party functionaries. It is not worth examining the difference in talents in detail, although Salone, for example, was a realist to be taken seriously in his communist period, whereas Koestler remained the trivial and superficial journalist he always was in his much acclaimed potboilers with their mixture of psychology and sociology. Also to be considered is the authenticity of their disclosures about communism, whose propaganda value the imperialists assess irrespective of whether the apostates concerned were, in view of their extremely peripheral place in the movement, in any position at all to be really informed about it. Since, as we have shown, anti-communist propaganda has hit upon Kravchenko, it will find some value in every lie and calumny, however tailored to mercenary purposes. Moreover, the apostates are seen as particularly reliable because no road back is now open to them. Burnham expresses this by saying that they are more immune to the ideological poison of communism than those who have not gone through the same transitional phase. Their no to communism has more feeling in it than that of the rest. Their hatred, vengefulness and resentment are emotions of great value to anti-communist propaganda. Thus in spite of the extremely modest standard of their knowledge and talents, they become pioneers and leading figures in the ideological struggle against communism. This again is a precise indication of how low bourgeois ideology has sunk today. It is from this situation, from recognizing the intellectual and moral inferiority of their present masters, that the apostates, pride and arrogance derive. Crossman records a conversation with Koestler in which the latter says, "We, the former communists, are the only people on your side who know what is really at stake," and Salone even goes so far as to state that the final battle would be fought out between communists and ex-communists. This, of course, is a bad joke which only goes to show that Salone has already forgotten what can be learned in any primary school, but the remark is typical of one facet of the apostates' intellectual and moral stance. The other facet is a fresh nuance, a further intensifying of a decadent psychology and morals. And herein lies the crucial motive for their importance to the contemporary bourgeoisie. The latter has a real use only for moral cripples or gangsters. Hence the apostates are its best human material. For time and again, they display the decadently warped and fragmented basis of their spiritual disposition, for which they overcompensate through arrogance. Crossman observes, the true ex-communist can never become an integrated personality again, and Koestler confirms this diagnosis when he makes one of his characters, an ex-communist poet, say of himself, "There is lyric poetry and sacred poetry, and a poetry of love and a poetry of rebellion. The poets of apostasy do not exist." Thus although the psychology of the apostate creates, on the face of it, an extreme outsider, it nevertheless contains something which is highly typical of the whole period. The cardinal lack of inner integrity, expressed as hypocritical cynicism, permeates all life's inner and outer manifestations. It is quite impossible and impermissible to state explicitly the true substance of the ideological struggle against communism, namely, the struggle to preserve exploitation against the attempt to end it. The whole foundation of the ideological dispute must therefore be mendacious. The struggle is represented as between freedom and oppression once again, a cynically promulgated barefaced lie. The whole Kravchenko method follows from this basic mendacity of the free world. We can perceive its consequences in every cultural sphere. The administrative drive towards an American cultural hegemony is oriented not only towards directly political realms. In part American ideological leadership is regarded as a universal question, but in part the material interests of American publishers, film manufacturers, etc., also play a crucial role. Film production units which are as highly developed artistically as the French and Italian are having to struggle desperately for their livelihood. Against the competition of state-supported trash from the USA, the progressive French work of literature must, to survive in spite of the mass distribution of horror, detective and digest stories, safeguard itself through an organized mass movement, and so on. While American Cold War propaganda professes to rescue European culture from the totalitarianism of the East, true European culture is fighting an all-out battle to preserve its naked existence, a battle against the agencies of the American century. That is the external situation. And the internal one? We have mentioned already a whole series of decisive cultural problems. Here we would like to stress just one more. This problem, although only of real interest to a relatively narrow section of the intelligentsia, nonetheless constitutes the common factor uniting intellectuals otherwise far apart and linking them to philosophical tendencies of the free world. We are referring to the right to nonconformity. But just here we are dealing with a sheer illusion. Monopoly capitalism's publishing, filmmaking, press and other machinery restricts, especially under Cold War conditions, the effective scope of this nonconformism to an extraordinary extent. It goes without saying that nuances of personal bias within the content laid down in each instance are not only allowed but expected. But should there occur a real, concrete deviation from the prescribed path in matters of intrinsic content, there ensues a hushing up process on the part of the public apparatus. For example, Albert's funeral and the obituaries of him, which is wont to amount to direct persecution. Chaplin. Nonconformity's champions should therefore ask themselves what kind of nonconformism is allowed in practice in the free world. Sartre, for example, was a hero of freedom of thought, as long as he opposed communism in his writings. Since taking part, in 1952, in the People's Congress for Peace in Vienna, he has become a subject of scorn for the free world. Thus we find in the free world a most unequivocal answer to the question: conformity to whom and what? One may, and should, boldly declare one's nonconformism, so-called, by making a stand against the Soviet Union and socialism in the United States, Adenauer's Germany, etc. One can even carry it out with whatever arguments one pleases. But one must conform to monopoly capitalism and its aggressive imperialist politics in order to be recognized as a proper nonconformist. But the problem of nonconformity goes deeper. In his empirio-criticism, Lenin had already shown that the academics, various individual epistemological nuances, furiously attacked and defended as they were, are no longer distinguishable when considered from the angle of the really crucial epistemological question: idealism or materialism? This applies on a heightened scale to ideological problems today. Anyone giving his attention to the really decisive philosophical problems will discern an alarmingly conformist monotony in the at first sight incommensurable chaos of individual nuances. We have indicated, for example, the close proximity of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, between whom there was no mutual influencing, when regarded from this viewpoint. The situation is exactly the same in ethics, in the interpretation of history, in the stance taken towards society, and in aesthetics. And also, of course, in literature and art themselves. Precisely the most individualistic, most radically nonconformist tendencies involve a radical leveling down of this kind. For objectively, and hence artistically as well, the real richness of the individual depends wholly on the richness of his real relations, Marx, and the more defiantly modern art focuses on the purely self-sufficient personality detached from society and from social relationships, the greater the similarity will be between figures. Outwardly so extraordinarily diverse, until there is no perceptible difference, for objectively, and hence artistically as well, the world of culturally evolved human relations is incomparably more varied than the bare world of the instincts. And this is why an art concentrating on the latter with almost dogmatic insistence is careering inevitably towards monotony and leveling down. How alike Aeneas and Dido are to Romeo and Juliet in their copulation, whereas the differences in erotic feelings determined by their society and culture have created genuine and enduring individuals. The solipsistic, abstract approach of the majority of modern nonconformists has brought about an inhuman leveling in the standards of creative work. Thus an involuntary, inner regimentation goes hand in hand with the external regimentation we have indicated above on the part of monopoly capitalism. Ernst Fischer, the distinguished Austrian thinker, rightly said at the Peace Congress in Wroclaw that modern nonconformists are as alike as peas in a pod. The louder and rowdier the proclamation of nonconformity, the shallower, more uniform and standardized the personality will be. This structure, as reflected in artistic creation and its audience, is an objective fraud which inevitably springs up from the soil of monopoly capitalism. Subjectively it is very often a case of self-deception, a delusion. This is the general character of the free world, today. It was already thus under Hitler. But in Hitler's day, the fraud was concealed from some people by a gaudy veil of myths, while others thought that Hitler's demagogy and tyranny, and not the character of advanced monopoly capitalism, of which Hitler was a mere tool, constituted the only obstacle, and that with its illumination, nonconformist individualism would come into its own. Now the veils have been removed, and the delirium is over. Today, everyone must see that the precondition of a tolerated nonconformity is an obligatory apologetic of the capitalist system, and this in its present aggressive and bellicose form. Room for maneuver in this world is becoming increasingly narrow, and the prescribed content to be promulgated increasingly meager and fraudulent. It is hard to believe, but true Cold War ideology has entailed a drop in standards even in comparison with the Hitler era. One has only to compare Hans Grimm with Koestler, or Rosenberg with Burnham. The causes we have already revealed. They stem from the collapse of indirect apologetics, which at least offered ideologists the illusory semblance of a link with the people. However much effort modern brains trusts devote to the task, they are incapable of devising a form for their central content, the struggle against communism, that could really win the people's enthusiasm. The fraud is becoming bigger and bigger, its mode of appearance less and less attractive and appealing. Hitler was still able to sum up everything reactionary accruing from the irrationalist developments of a century and a half and, as we have noted, to take irrationalism out of polite society onto the streets. Today, the socially determined necessity of direct apologetics renders this too impossible. It goes without saying that all these tendencies, which we have outlined so far chiefly as they occur in the prevailing American ideology, are also to be found in Western Germany. Here, admittedly, they occur with specific variations, and in view of the immediate importance of Western Germany's role, it is certainly worth at least taking a look at these. The main point to observe is that Western Germany is the seat of former Hitlerian fascists. Naturally, the occupying powers have done nothing to uproot Nazism in the organizational and ideological sense. On the contrary, they did all they could to salvage and preserve for the future those elements in the Nazi movement and its mental ambit that could be used in the campaign against the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, a certain mental adjustment, both external and internal respects, was needed in order for a henchman of Hitler to become an ideologist of Truman or Eisenhower. It will suffice to recall those differences in ideological structure we have indicated in their basic outlines, for all the affinities as regards the principal questions. This issue is of particular interest to us because we can study the present further development which has been undertaken in the American period by ideologists who played a leading part in preparing and establishing Hitler's dominion. The situation is simplest when it comes to those who, either of their own accord or because of chance personal circumstances, did not themselves participate in Hitler's regime directly, although, considered from an objectively ideological angle, as extreme developers of irrationalism they blazed an intellectual trail for Hitler and led a quiet, secure life under his rule. Jaspers is the chief representative of this type. Today the well-tried principle of his philosophizing still holds good, to go along with fashionably reactionary trends all the way, while at the same time accommodating them to the tepid just milieu of a petty bourgeois salon of intellectuals. Since Jaspers was an existentialist, a rationalist, Kierkegaardian and Nietzschean, nobody in Hitler's time could raise a concrete objection to him. Now, after Hitler's downfall, Jaspers discovers reason. This is natural. Today reason is dedicated to refuting Marxism as irrationalism was previously. It begins in an original way by alleging that Marxism is actually a pseudo-scientific kind of magic. The destructive element is the creative element. When nothingness is introduced, being appears automatically, but in the process of comprehension and action this is, in fact, a rehearsal of magical dealing in the guise of a pseudo-science. Corresponding to this metric is the Marxist claim to command a higher knowledge. Jaspers's pretended originality consists in the use of a vogue word like magical, which was meant to give Marxism a devastatingly compromising ring in the age of semantic logic. This apart, the same argument has been already advanced 75 years previously by Düring, and its rebuttal may be easily located in Engels's Anti-Düring. Here, ignoring the ABC of Marxism, Jaspers triumphantly repudiates inventions of his own, creating good remedy for the superstition of knowledge that Marxism supposedly presents. Jaspers recommends his own, fashionably up-to-date irrationalism. We must revert to the original as deed, a fashionable so-called ontology. Then the language of all things becomes discernible, and myth meaningful. Poetry and art become the organon of philosophy, Schelling. But the language of myth is distinct from a cognitive content. What is perceived in contemplation and is then animating in practice may neither be extinguished nor acquire the character of cognition when reason compels the test of truth. This verification is not a test by experience but a test against one's own intrinsic nature, by whether it causes an upsurge or decline in selfhood, Selbstsein, by the extent of our love, and in association with this Jaspers now defines as follows the connection between his old and new philosophy. Decades ago I spoke of existential philosophy, and L added that we were dealing not with a new or a particular philosophy but with the one perennial philosophy, which may, for an instant of abandonment to the merely objective realm, be accentuated with Kierkegaard's basic idea. Today I would prefer to call philosophy rational philosophy because it seems incumbent on us to emphasize its ancient essence. If reason is lost, philosophy itself will be lost. To stress the predominance of reason is the sole possible guarantee of the origin of genuine myth, thus myth is the inescapable language of transcendent truth. The creation of genuine myth is true illumination. This myth conceals reason inside it and is controlled by reason. Through myth, image and symbol we acquire our profoundest insight at the ultimate point. Where the safeguard is lacking, veneration will inevitably arise. The danger here, according to Jaspers, is that there then comes about not an impotent nothingness, but a potent enchantment. Jaspers thus employs the ancient distinction between white and black magic to introduce into philosophy the line pursued by the leaders of the Cold War. That is to say, the experience of the criminal Munich policy is supposed to be a reason for rejecting as appeasement any serious negotiations with the Soviet Union. So what Jaspers had neglected to contribute to the ideological rebuttal of Nazism, he now makes up for as an anti-Marxist campaigner. The parallels are all the more valid in that Chamberlain's political proximity to Hitler was no less than the philosophical proximity of Jaspers's irrationalism to its Nazi slant. The emphasis on myth does not affect Jaspers's contact with semantics. We can already say this because his constant invocation of Kant is just as agnosticist and irrational as the basic philosophical position of semantics. Let us remember the irrationalism of Wittgenstein. Both give expression, under a flimsy mask of rationality, to a despair over reason, to the impotence and dissolution of reason. For Jaspers reason is, for example, a priori unhistorical because Marx recognizes the rationality of history. Jaspers calls him a relativist, and it forms an antithesis to causal perception. Causally I recognize only the non-rational, he writes. Thus it is bound to be completely powerless in the face of reality. What Jaspers thus understands as a philosophy of reason is the old irrationalism in a garb matching modern American needs. It is the same philosophy of no exit as before, again tailored to the spiritual and moral comfort of a self-sufficient petty bourgeois intelligentsia. For Heidegger, it was far harder to engineer a transition of this kind. He had not only helped ideologically to bring Nazism about but had also made a direct and active stand on Hitler's behalf. To obtain an amnesty in such circumstances as well as a leading role once more, in order to assist the renewed barbarization of philosophy, and to do so by associating with professed combatants of Hitler, but without conceding the achievements gained and paving the way for Hitler intellectually. In other words, to present a public image changed and unchanged at the same time is a more difficult task. How does Heidegger solve it? The Kierkegaardian arsenal offers an outstanding weapon for these purposes, an incognito. This is central to Heidegger's thinking today. With Kierkegaard himself, to be sure, the situation was relatively simple objectively, because in his case the incognito followed logically from the anti-rationality, the anti-humanity of the relationship to God. Personally, because he had nothing compromising to hide, Heidegger, unworldly, world-despising thinkers are often very practical in the conduct of their private lives, knows very well that atheism is not a going commodity whilst there exists an alliance between the Vatican and Wall Street. He draws from this the appropriate consequences. Not, of course, in the form of an overt break with the atheism and nihilism of being and time, but simply by stating apodictically that his chef d'oeuvre was neither atheistic nor nihilistic. But in spite of this concession to present-day religious trends, he cannot render Kierkegaard's theology of immediate use to his personal aims. He attempts, on the contrary, to deduce a dogmatic incognito as the essence of all historicity from an extension of the familiar theory of history and time. In its intrinsic content, it must be admitted, this is still only an up-to-date variant of Kierkegaard's thesis that there is a world history only in the sight of God. For Heidegger, history is now a realm of errancy, of the dogmatic, ontological incognito, being withdraws by enclosing itself in that which is in being, das Sein. In this way being confuses what is in being, while clarifying it, with errancy. What is in being has been realized in errancy, in which being misleads it and thus creates error. Error is the essential arena of history. In it, the essential matter of history passes its likeness by. From the epoch of being comes the epical nature of its destiny, in which authentic world history consists. Every time that being holds fast in its destiny, world is an abrupt, unexpected event. Every epoch in world history is an epoch of errancy. Here Heidegger found the ontological arguments and justification for his behavior in the Hitler period. In his book on, or rather against humanism, this idea receives a more concrete form still. He stresses through his falsification of Hölderlin that the latter's relation to Greek antiquity is essentially different from humanism. Hence the young Germans who knew of Hölderlin thought and lived differently in the face of death from what was publicly proclaimed to be German opinion. Here Heidegger discreetly refrains from saying evidently this also belongs to the ontologically historical incognito that those young men were not only in a situation confronting death, under Hitler, but took a highly active part in murder and torture, pillage and rape. Evidently he considers it superfluous to mention this, for after all the incognito covers everything up. Who can tell what a pupil of Heidegger intoxicated by Hölderlin thought and lived, when he was pushing women and children into the gas chambers at Auschwitz? Nobody can tell either, what Heidegger himself thought and lived, when he led the Freiburg students to vote for Hitler. There is nothing unequivocally knowable in history as he presents it. It is a general errancy. Here, Heidegger has a threefold aim in view. Firstly, a total denial of responsibility for what he did to give Hitler active support. Secondly, he wants to preserve his old existential standpoint. Thirdly, he wants to make it seem as if all the changes he has effected today to accommodate himself to American policies had always represented his views. Such acrobatic feats can only be accomplished by resorting to scientific dishonesty. His former pupil, Karl Lowith, has exposed a fraud of this kind in the Neue Rundschau, but a contradiction cannot be resolved either by a shift in perspective of one's view or by a dialectical correspondence. In the postface to the fourth edition of Was First Metaphysic, we read with regard to the truth of being that being may well exist without that which is in being, but that what is in being can never exist without being. In the fifth edition published 6 years later, the but, that is, the stressing of an antithesis, is left out and the well replaced by a never, that is, the whole meaning of the sentence is turned into the opposite, without any indication of this change. What would one say to a theologian who claimed on one occasion that God may well exist without a creation and on another that he could never exist without it? How do we account for the fact that a linguistic thinker who weighs his words as carefully as Heidegger makes such a radical change to so crucial a passage? For obviously only one of the two formulations can be the true and proper one. Now whither is this philosophy bound? It retains from prefacism its extremely anti-rational character when Heidegger now says, thinking only begins when we have learned that the reason we have glorified for centuries is thought's most stubborn antagonist. He is only drawing the most extreme inferences from what was implicit in Husserl's intuitive vision, Wesensau, from the outset. And since, as we have shown, phenomenology in its origins was closely related to matrism, it is not too tricky for Heidegger essence to come very near to semantics. His terminological peculiarities are well known, as is his verbal hair-splitting. Now, as the crowning of matrism, phenomenology and semantics, he succeeds in making a philosophical method of language. Thinking collects language into the simple telling. Thus language is the language of being as the clouds are the clouds in the sky. With its telling, thinking makes modest furrows in language. They are more modest even than the furrows which a countryman slowly plows in a field. Here we have poetic semantics as a particular German nuance, but in both cases the irrationalist abyss is the same, no matter whether the immediate form of expression is deliberately poetic or soberly prosaic. The methodological approximation points to an objective proximity. Heidegger's being, in contrast to what is in being, is not all that far removed from what, according to Wittgenstein, could only be shown and not stated. And a similar method will give rise to similar consequences. In Hitler Heidegger greeted the dawning of a new age and thereby, to put it mildly, brought eternal disgrace upon himself. Today he is more cautious, at least in expression, but he seeks to ingratiate himself with today's or tomorrow's rulers as much as with Hitler. He expresses himself with caution, with a deliberate obscurity, but he lets the idea of a new age glimmer through this twilight again. Are we standing indeed on the eve of the vastest transformation of the earth and the time of the historical space on which it hinges? Are we on the eve of a night that will precede a different dawn? Are we about to march off into the historical land of this global evening? Will the land of evening tide emerge first? Is this evening land? to become the scene of the coming and more incipiently transmitted history, over and above Occident and Orient and passing beyond the European stage? Are we contemporaries already Occidental in a sense that is only coming to light with our passage into the global dark? How are any philosophies of history that are purely historically measured to account for history if they only dazzle with what is surveyable in material historically inculcated, without ever conceiving the foundations of its explanatory causes from the essence of history, and the latter from being itself? Are we the latecomers? We are. But are we at the same time also attendants on the dawn of a quite different world epoch which will have left our present historical ideas of history behind? The form of inquiry and the pessimistic impression suggest Germany's situation today. They are indispensable, for without the pessimistic tone one cannot influence the elite, so-called, of the intellectuals, especially German intellectuals, not even today, but we can see or at least glimpse behind this and intended twilight the outlines of the American century of the global state under American command, certainly. If a German imperialism should achieve independence at some future date and again aspire to global power, these words from Heidegger can then be applied to it too as a prophecy. Heidegger's disgrace over Hitler is not enough for him. He needs a second disgrace at all costs. This would be the suitable fulfillment of his philosophy of history as a doctrine of errancy. Naturally, the perspective we have drawn is immediate terms the most important feature of these statements by Heidegger. But beside the perspective, the method must not be overlooked completely. We have noted that Heidegger posits an authentic historicity in order to challenge real historicity as vulgar more effectively. This tendency becomes acuter in the post-war period. Whereas his being and time was in character a single great polemic against Marxism, but without revealing this character through as much as a distinct reference, Heidegger now feels already obliged to speak of Marx openly. What Marx, deriving from Hegel in a substantial and significant sense, recognized as the alienation of man reaches back at root into the homelessness of man in the modern epoch, because Marx, in experiencing alienation, delves into an essential dimension of history. The Marxist view of history is taken to be superior to all other versions. Granted, he promptly reduces Marxism to techniques, like all bourgeois vulgarizers of historical perception, but this statement, of course, already amounts to saying openly that Heidegger regards Marxism as the chief antagonist. On the one hand, all this expresses bourgeois philosophy's universal rearguard action against Marxism, just as Nietzsche, after Schopenhauer's repudiation of all history, was forced to argue a mythical pseudo-historicism. So imperialist phenomenology proceeds from Husserl's ahistoricism via Schiller to Heidegger's authentic historicity. And on the other hand, the comments quoted above clearly show that he intends thereby to discredit all real and concrete historical knowledge. For he states, how are any philosophies of history that are purely historically measured to account for history if they only dazzle with what is surveyable in material historically inculcated, without ever conceiving the foundations of its explanatory causes from the essence of history, and the latter from being itself? We are dealing here with a universal tendency of the age. To illustrate this with a topical example, let us recall the Camus-Sartre discussion already mentioned in other contexts. How far Camus squares with Heidegger in points of detail is of no importance at all in this context. The important thing is that he bitterly resists a historicism or indeed anti-historicism, while at the same time arguing his individualistic and anarchic withdrawal from real history in the name of a supra-history, just as Heidegger plays off the historicity of being against that of what is an being. Still more important as the sign of a salutary existentialist crisis, however, is the passionate protest by Sartre and his followers against Camus's position. Sartre says, and rightly so as a reply to Camus, our freedom today is nothing but the choice of the struggle whereby we can become free. The paradoxical aspect of this formulation simply expresses the paradox of our historical condition. As far as Sartre's philosophizing goes, the paradox is undoubtedly there, but objectively speaking it can be traced to a protest. This derives from the sound instincts of a man of our time who does not wish to share the guilt for the global catastrophe set in motion from America. Clearly seeing the role of the proletarian class struggle and the communist parties in averting this threat of war in practice, he consequently perceives the danger of the Heidegger-Camus conception of history in its real repercussions. But he fails to notice for the time being that he is here playing off a paradoxically contradictory existentialist standpoint against a rigorously existentialist one. For the whole paradox in his polemical comments boils down to his using the concept of freedom first in the orthodox existentialist sense, but then, in the same thesis, in a concretely historical sense. Sartre's fate as a thinker will depend on the direction in which he can and wants to resolve this paradox. Heidegger keeps his cynicism hidden behind a verbosity which flirts with obscurity and has pretensions to poetry. This cynicism is voiced quite nakedly by Hitler's former personal jurist and law theorist, Carl Schmitt. We have already given the ideological gist of his present-day theory of international law. From this formulation we can already see that Schmitt is serving American imperialism as busily as he once served Hitler. Today he is again acting as cleverly, paradoxically and cynically as before. Thus he stands every chance of a benevolent reception, of a full say at the current headquarters of international reaction and warmongering. But he too feels, or at any rate felt, the need to purge himself of his Hitlerian sins. And since he seeks, far more decidedly than Heidegger, to salvage all his earlier, aggressively reactionary endeavors for the American future, or, as the case may be, for that of a newly arisen and independent German imperialism, he too takes the incognito as the proffered ideological tool in his comments on a radio talk by Karl Mannheim. Just after the war, Schmitt gives such an innocent explanation for his role in the Hitler regime that the cynical and nihilistic character of the incognito, the philosophical claim to the most shameless lie, will be evident to any intelligent person. Schmidt writes, there remained the old established quiet tradition of withdrawal into a private inner life, along with the utmost readiness for a right and proper collaboration with anything decreed by any legitimate government. He even has the temerity to accuse of superficiality anyone venturing to criticize such behavior as his under Hitler. If the only thing deserving attention is what appears under the spotlight of a fully known and sanctioned public life, and if furthermore it is considered that an unqualified spiritual subjection lies in entering into this public arena, then to be sure the scientific work of these 12 years would merit no special attention. We have not neglected to pay special attention to Schmidt's scientific activities under Hitler. What went on in Carl Schmitt's incognito inner life during the Hitler period remains, of course, undisclosed. In places Schmidt lifts the incognito to suggest discreetly that he was one of the people who did not agree with Hitler. But it is a historical fact that at a time when, say, Niemöller, Wiechert and Nykisch, not to mention the communists, clearly voiced their opposition to Nazism, Schmidt was elaborating principles of law, philosophy and international rights that vindicated Hitler's deeds, from the mass murders of 1934 to the German army's invasion of neutral countries. Schmidt himself senses that in his case, the incognito of a subjectivist state of abstraction a la Kierkegaard and Heidegger does not carry conviction. He therefore also invokes an important, purported, historical analogy. He writes of Hobbes. Hobbes, on the other hand, had a much better grasp. After a further century of theological disputes and European civil wars, his despair is infinitely deeper than Bodin's. Hobbes belongs to the great solitary figures of the 17th century, who were all acquainted with one another. He grasped not only the manifold character of the modern Leviathan but also how to get on with it and the behavior commending itself to an independently minded individual if he becomes involved in such a dangerous matter. He reflected, spoke and wrote on these perilous subjects, always with an inviolate intellectual freedom and always well shielded in his person, always either in flight or in inconspicuous seclusion, the small but neither philosophically nor politico-ethically trivial difference is that Hobbes stood for progress in his time, whereas Schmidt supported the most extreme reaction of his day. But there lies still more behind this analogy, Schmidt's avowed continuation of his activity on the farthest wing of militant reaction. His interpretation of the analogy is as follows: just as it did not matter to Hobbes whether the liquidation of feudalism, the setting up of a modern bourgeois centralized state, was carried out by the Stuarts or Cromwell, it does not matter to him, Carl Schmitt, whether it is Hitler, Eisenhower or a newly arisen German imperialism that sets up the absolute dictatorship of monopoly capitalism. Hence now, as we have already shown, he is able to devise the best epigrammatic summary of the United States foreign policy, just as he had formulated this for Hitler. Hence he shows today the ineluctability of the dilemma of isolation or intervention for the USA. The contradictions stem from the unresolved problems of a territorial development involving an obligation either to set limits to the invasion and to find other major territories beside those recognizing themselves as such, or else to turn back what has hitherto been a war of national claims into a worldwide civil war, and hence Schmidt is now publishing old and new essays on his long-standing favorite, Donoso Courts. What is the essential point they make? It is the antithesis of bourgeois ideology and Marxism. The latter has grasped the link with the present time of historical developments from 1848 up to the present, whereas bourgeois ideology has not. Schmidt sums up the situation as follows. In their awareness of continuity, the communist authors have a considerable superiority and even a monopoly over the other historians, who cannot accept the events of 1848 and thereby forfeit the right to depict the present. Bourgeois historians are in a state of great embarrassment. On the one hand, they condemn the suppression of the revolution because they do not want to be reactionary, while on the other they welcome the restoration of common security as a victory for order. It is now a matter of breaking this communist monopoly and of bringing to light the non-socialist continuities, that is, the successes and traditions of the counter-revolution. Donoso Courts, according to Schmidt, is the ideologist just suited to arguing such a continuity. But the essential point is the accurate observation that the pseudo-religion of absolute humanity is exactly what opens the door to an inhuman reign of terror. That was a fresh observation, profounder than de Maester's many splendid dicta on revolution, war and bloodshed. By comparison with the Spaniard, who gazed into the abyss of the horrors of 1848, de Maester is still an aristocrat of the restoration of the ancient regime who prolonged and deepened the 18th century spirit. According to Schmidt, it follows that the monopoly of the interpretation of the century does, however, contain something extremely important, viz., the historical legitimacy of autonomous power, the right to violence and absolution from the world spirit for all crimes committed on its behalf. So Donoso Courts becomes the forebear of an arbitrary, absolute dictatorship of monopoly capitalism to be set up at some future date. Donoso's great theoretical significance for the history of counter-revolutionary theory lies in the fact that he gave up the legitimist arguments and no longer propounded a political philosophy of restoration but a theory of dictatorship. And Schmidt has such an enthusiasm for this prospect that he lays his incognito aside and openly states what makes his hero so irresistibly fascinating. His contempt for human beings knew no bounds. Their blind understanding, their feeble wills, the derisory elan of their carnal desires seem so pitiful to him that all the vocabulary of all human languages is not sufficient to express the full baseness of these creatures. Here we clearly perceive Schmidt's association with all anti-human tendencies, past and present, along with the reason for it in socio-human terms. He is an enemy of the masses grown blind with hatred, a fanatic in the campaign against vermissung or mass feeling. We also see in this statement the reality behind Schmidt's claim not to have been in agreement with the Hitler regime. Evidently he regarded Hitler's social demagogy, whose falsity he certainly saw through, as a contemptible masquerade of the absolute dictatorship of monopoly capitalism. For Schmidt, as for Spengler, Ernst Jünger and others, Hitler was too democratic, too vulgar. This professed opposition did not of course stop Schmidt from zealously assisting Hitler ideologically to the best of his abilities. Today, after the collapse of social demagogy and indirect apologetics, Carl Schmitt understandably sends fresh hope. The cynicism of this incognito ideology is, naturally enough, very widespread among West German intellectuals. It received its most overt and concentrated form in Ernst von Salomons Fragebogen, fact that may account for this book's huge success. Salomon too belongs to those who, objectively considered, helped to pave the way for Hitler, who had reservations about the Hitler regime, and who therefore attempted after the war to argue an ideological justification of their DVQ standpoint. Salomon's cynicism as expressed in his book differs to his advantage from that of Heidegger, Carl Schmitt and Ernst Jünger in that he is at least upright in not glossing over his DVQ feelings. He wanted simply to survive the Hitler regime, to be sure in the best material circumstances possible. Opposition was limited to voicing certain scruples in very private circles. In his case, therefore, the incognito has a robustly prosaic character, without existentialist and his so-called mysticism. It is a straightforward mimicry under Nazi conditions. Ernst Jünger, on the other hand, who's the worker, as we know, contributed far more to the origin of Nazi ideology than did Salomon's outsider writings, participated much more markedly in the Hitler regime, albeit largely as a mere figurehead. After the event, however, he portrayed his opposition stance far more plainly. But this again followed the line of an aristocratic protest against the vulgarity of Hitler's demagogy and not against its social content. Jünger differs from Schmitt only in that he overtly gave prominence to the role of the hereditary Prussian Junker nobility in an absolute dictatorship Burgenland in his novel Heliopolis. In addition, he provides, as philosophical background, an avowal of myth and magic as tokens of the difference between the modern period and the 19th century. The special character of the 19th century spirit lay in its neglect of this relation of rationality to the depths of consciousness. In its self-sufficiency it imagined that developments were progressing on a level determined by itself, in an enclosed just milieu which it had created and exercised control over, and which it defined as consciousness. Given this state of affairs, the awakening was bound to occur. It happened at the very moment that the rational roots had reached the subsoil of myths. This can be verified in words, imagery, ideas and even in the sciences. They all became stronger than befitted human proportions, human decorum. Mythical figures now advanced upon the rational ones in a series of terrible battles, and the new worlds of myth, dream and nocturnal magic stood revealed in the glow of the conflagrations. Jünger thus joins the ranks of ideologists like Jaspers, Heidegger and Schmitt who, as opponents to Hitler, offered a rational myth as a weapon to the new imperialism, and themselves as the soldiers. We have emphasized the outsider element in Salomon's attitude in the pre-Hitler period. As we know, he circulated among the most diverse reactionary groups, taking part in the murder of Raffanin, the Landvolk movement and so on. It is characteristic of his nihilistic cynicism that he calls this latter activity a coarse bit of fun. He experienced the crisis preceding Hitler's seizure of power and the growing influence, during it, of the communist philosophy. His brother Bruno even became a communist. This crisis also forced Ernst himself to try and come to terms with Marxism. Of course, no real understanding was gained in his case. Indeed, the encounter even ended with his rejection of Marxism, although Salomon states on occasion, and this is again very typical of his cynicism, but the communist was simply right in the matter. It is equally typical of him, however, that such an observation had no effect at all on his subsequent attitude. And so he fitted into the Hitler regime, leading a quiet and untroubled life. And although sometimes the Nazis' actions made him extremely angry, he remained in essence even in his heart entirely passive. He spoke of this passivity, this avoidance of all protest to his wife apropos the Jewish pogroms in Berlin. Is it because we know we shall find no answering echo? It is not that. It is much worse to tell the truth. We are dead already. We cannot live by our own lights any longer at all. Straight after this he related an episode experienced in Berlin and sums up its effects thus. One made my way home along the Kurfürstendamm and thought very hard indeed, there just must be a third solution. And if there was not, what was better, to act like a fool, or to act like a coward? This plainly honest pragmatism distinguishes Salomon to his advantage from the romantically and mystically inflated nihilism of Jünger and his following. Hence he is able to sketch animated scenes from everyday life in the Hitler period. Hence he is able to lay bare in a realistic way the cruelty and corruption of the American liberators. But the core of the Fragebogen is Salomon's allegiance to a GVQ cynicism. When he and his wife were released from their brief American imprisonment, there took place between them a dialogue which is so typical of the contemporary mood that we must quote from it at some length. Salomon says to his wife, "You came out of it very well. You have no cause for complaint. Far less cause than everybody you know and all the millions you don't know. And the same is true of myself. We have had a good time of it, and must not feel any resentment. We are among the few who must not feel any resentment." So Salomon adjusts himself to a GVQ attitude for the new period as well, but more typical still, and a stronger expression of real mass feelings as a retrospective summary of the experiences of the Hitler period, is his wife Al's reply. She says, "One must tell you something awful. I did not have a good time of it. I know, you were thinking all along that the main thing was that we got out alive, but I have not got out alive. I am no longer the woman I was when I married you. What was best and most precious in me is dead. They have killed it off. The last 12 years were frightful for me. I have always made an effort not to let you see it. We have had a good life, if you like, a good life from day to day. She tells how both of them, Salomon and herself, knew the details of all the atrocities committed under Hitler, but in order not to jeopardize a life of prosperity and relative security, never acknowledged them and were never prepared to. She now sums up her morale as a result of all this: one, love life, and I want a full life or no life at all. But dignity is one part of it. Not only a face or arms and legs, but dignity as well. And these 12 years have sought to take away my dignity. For what does living mean if not loving? I wanted to love the day and the country, the Germans among whom I was living, and you and myself. And I was not allowed to. I had to learn to despise it all, the day and the country and the Germans and you and myself. Even in denial, of course, there are no discernible conclusions drawn from her experiences. But the concrete substance of her outburst contains more than an emotionally critical summing up. Unknown to her, it also implies the human possibilities of the way out. Millions of us, mostly as unconscious of it as herself, have experienced similar and often far more harrowing things under Hitler, and now behold with horror the preliminaries to another war, and the sprouting of a new fascism. The spontaneous cry, leave us out. One roughly expresses the emotional consequences of what Isle von Salomon experienced and tried to couch in halting phrases. At present this cry expresses only a mounting fear among broad masses, fears of a fresh war, fears for one's own life, for the lives of relatives, for one's possessions. But there is also a flickering dread of another violation and spoiling of the human dignity, of personal integrity. Of course there are concomitant manifestations on a mass scale, even of a far greater awareness. There are the public statements and the commitment of persons who are ready to sacrifice their all to ensure that nothing akin to the Hitler regime can ever arise in Germany again. And there is also appearing, albeit slowly and paradoxically, an awareness of how much the American Cold War and its German branch office, the Adenauer government, is preparing for something similar in, seemingly, different and, purportedly, diametrically opposite forms for the time being, chiefly in Western Germany, but also in many other countries of the capitalist world. Such voices are being drowned by the voice of America. The substance of this propaganda we have already expounded in detail. We have also revealed its inner hollowness, its worthlessness and its lies. But of course the danger inherent in such propaganda is still immense nonetheless. The mass of those capable of being led astray, of the cowardly and easily intimidated, the weak and passive spirits, of minds poisoned spiritually and morally, is still exceptionally large. The situation as a whole, however, has altered radically. Before the Second World War, Hitler unfurled on the streets the flag of irrationalism and the destruction of reason. Today, reason is descending from the lecture platform, workshop or laboratory onto the streets to plead its cause before the masses, and in the vanguard of the masses. This strategic offensive by progressive philosophy, by the defense of reason, is the specifically new element of the post-war period. Around 1848 there first appeared the major, really decisive adversary of the destruction of reason, Marxism. And since 1917 it has evolved not only into the philosophy of the peoples of 1/6 of the earth, but is also manifested at a higher intellectual stage as Leninism. Marxism, as the further development of Marxism in a period of world wars and world revolutions. The Communist Manifesto had already been for a long time one of the most widely read and translated works in world literature. After 1917 Lenin's works joined it along with the wider distribution of the writings of Marx and Engels. But in this respect too, the post-1945 period signifies a qualitative change. There are few countries where the translation and distribution of these works did not proceed by leaps and bounds. We need not even mention China, the new People's Republics, or lands like France and Italy, where communist supporters constitute over 1/3 of the population. Even where the communists' organized strength is still relatively slight, we can observe a rapid growth in acquaintance with Marxism-Leninism, and the influence of Marxist philosophy reaches far beyond those frontiers. Regarding this matter again, we are concerned with the ideological aspect only. But it is also necessary to say that in these countries it is no longer just a question of the translation and distribution of the Marxist-Leninist classics, but of a rapid growth in native Marxist research, a scientific treatment of the country's history and present condition in the Marxist-Leninist spirit, using its intellectual weapons in the struggle against reaction. This upsurge is taking effect far beyond party political limits. The attraction of Marxism-Leninism for leading progressive intellectuals is steadily increasing. More and more natural scientists are grasping how much help dialectical materialism can offer them, especially since this, through its very solution of concrete scientific problems, has raised both science itself and the method of dialectical materialism to higher stage in the Soviet Union. More and more writers are experiencing the same with regard to their art. Hence the Soviet Union's discoveries and achievements are triggering off so sharp a defensive action in reactionary bourgeois science and philosophy, the Lysenko controversy. And hence such discussions are taking on more and more of a Kravchenko flavor in the free world. So as to block the increasingly irresistible appeal of progressive art and science, people are speaking far less of the actual problems than of the alleged persecutions to which nonconformist scholars and artists are subject in the Soviet Union. To be sure, Kravchenko affairs will always give rise to some technical hitches. It appears to be a practical impossibility adequately to brief all one's agents and opportunities for spreading lies and calumny. Thus not long ago, a certain Senator Wiley had the misfortune indignantly to defend in the name of freedom the supporters, persecuted by Stalin, of the philologist Arakcheyev, evidently without knowing that this Arakcheyev was a notorious reactionary general and politician from the time of Tsar Nicholas I, and that Stalin was invoking his name and methods to bring similar contempt Upon those who restricted the freedom of scientific discussion, the other new element in the active, large-scale defense of reason is the peace movement. This too we shall now consider solely from the standpoint of our subject, the destruction or restoration of reason. It is patent that today, as under Hitler, warmongering is again the major social force working towards the destruction of reason. And today its ideological battlefield is the Cold War. It amounts to the spreading of a vague fatalism, panic and a paralyzing fear among human beings the world over. An undoubtedly competent witness, Faulkner, said in his Nobel Prize speech, "The tragedy of our age is a general dread which governs the entire world. We have already carried it inside us for so long that we can even live with it. There are no spiritual problems left. There only remains the question, when am I going to be blown up?" And the German author Zuckmayer says, in very similar terms, what is the reality of this world situation which confronts us at the present time? It is a nightmare for the large majority. I believe that 90% of all the people alive today, all over the world, do not want or hope for what appears to be impending. But they must allow it to happen without a chance of countermeasures, just as in a nightmare one knows that one is dreaming, that one is having a nightmare, that one is being tormented and stifled by the incubus, and yet cannot shake it off, cannot move, cry out, or wake up. This fear, this nightmare was the main ideological weapon in the Cold War as long as the USA believed it could still flaunt with the atomic bomb monopoly. If other motives, spurious olive branches, the liberation of nations oppressed by socialism, etc. now also enter into it, nonetheless to foster such feelings of panic still remains an important Cold War weapon. Cf. the special issue of Collier's magazine. To catch the masses unawares, and even governments, is still an essential part of the strategy. But nowadays it is no longer a bolt from the blue, as in 1914. A fatalistic paralysis of the human will and understanding, the constant existence of a state of tense panic constitute the preliminary tactics. New, however, is the total difference in the reaction of the masses from what it was before the two past world wars. Everyone knows of the 600 million peace signatures. Once again, we shall look into this only as far as it relates to our subject. The peace movement as such has no philosophy, and knows no barriers in respect of political, philosophical or religious convictions. Here Christian and Muslim priests, Quakers and pacifists, liberals and neutrals, etc., are working hand in hand with socialists and communists. But little though the peace movement entails a conformism, its mere existence, its growth and its increasingly concrete outlines imply a raising and answering of the great philosophical question, for or against reason. Of course the questions and answers within the new entity, as regards individuals and groups, are extremely diverse and often totally opposed. But the great common principle behind such divergences is no less than the defense of human reason, and not merely its existence in general, but its actual influence and impact on history, in which we are all more or less active participants everywhere. The peace movement had and has its beginnings in spontaneous emotion, manifested most clearly in the West German Unans movement. In essence, the 500 million signatures to the Stockholm protest against atomic warfare also indicate an instinctive revolt by the masses against this criminal project. This spontaneous outburst of mass feeling, however, differs qualitatively from all previous ones. It would be wrong to gauge its proportions purely quantitatively, although such a mounting mass indignation already signifies something that is new in itself. The essentially new feature emerges particularly sharply if we think of the moment of its eruption. Previous mass waves of anti-war feeling occurred mostly in the third or fourth year of war, were often phenomena resulting from major defeats, and were nearly always directly triggered off by the crushing burden of a war economy. Today, however, this mass movement is breaking out before war, albeit also during the Cold War. Thus it has a preventive, averting character and is far more than a mere reaction to accomplished historical facts. This in itself lifts the movement out of the realm of pure spontaneity or emotionality. Every attempt at prevention implies a strong element of a rational, conscious desire to control future, forthcoming events. The experiences of two world wars have therefore accumulated in this spontaneity. It evinces a fundamentally new physiognomy, that of reason in spontaneity. Pietro Nenni, the vice president of the World Peace Movement, has underlined in a speech the important difference he sees between the peace partisans' second major campaign, the 600 million signatures demanding a pact of the five major powers, and the Stockholm appeal. Here, he says, the path leads from spontaneity to conscious awareness, from emotion to the use of its use for a very concrete task decisively influencing both each individual's life and the life of mankind. The rational perception that has its origins here is twofold: perception of the objective task, and reason. Perception of one's own share in its execution. And it is just these two aspects which show that where war and peace are concerned, human reason, if humanity is not to come to grief, must take the initiative, neither leaving events to run their own imminent course nor permitting them to be swayed by criminal intentions. How far and with what amount of subjective awareness individual relations to the whole are worked out inwardly varies very considerably, but that is not crucial here. Important is the clear, objectively discernible meaning of the 600 million signatures. In constructing a more and more concrete defense of peace, identifying aggression, defending the nation's independence, examining the possibility of the peaceful coexistence of different social systems, a methodical approach to negotiations, etc., the peace movement is increasingly leading to ever higher generalizations and making an increasingly strong appeal to the independent judgment resistant to all mendacious propaganda and reason of many hundred millions of people. Not only is such an intellectualization and rationalism not daunting for the masses, they actually find it highly attractive. I contrast this with the high tide of irrationalist fascism, when the few bourgeois champions of reason were excusing themselves on account of their rationalism or were forced to look like solitary, oddly paradoxical eccentrics. And this movement for the restoration of reason and the safeguarding of peace, the two are inseparable, is taking a hold among ever broader sections of the masses. Wider and wider circles are coming together, joining forces and marching united without, of course, so much as a suggestion of a philosophical conformity. The peace practical aims and perspectives are not something we can discuss now. But its mere existence has a world historical significance for human thought, the protection of reason as taking the form of a mass movement. After a century of the increasing dominance of irrationalism, the defense of reason and the restoration of subverted reason is movement starting on its triumphal march among the masses politically. The peace movement sets out to isolate from the masses and thereby to condemn to impotence the numerically small but, at present, crucially influential coterie of monopoly capitalists and militarists. Its ideological side, meanwhile, has the programmatic bias of removing the influence, on popular thinking and sensibilities, of manufacturers of decadent and irrationalist theories of any kind, of anti-rational and anti-human declarations. It is not enough by a long chalk that a writer like Denis de Rougemont should justifiably complain at his associates' lack of influence as long as the gap is filled by gangster films and hack literature. We cannot regard this great task as completed as mass rising on behalf of reason is the great contemporary response to the hysterical fear of vermissung or mass movements and the irrationalism closely linked with that fear. This rising is therefore a counterblast, historically considered, to the Hitlerian rising of uncontrolled, anti-rational instincts. It is an active comeback and, still more, a nipping in the bud of intended future atrocities like Hitler's more than 100 years ago. Marx wrote, "To be sure, the weapon of criticism cannot replace the critique of the weapon. Material violence must be overthrown with material violence, but theory too becomes material violence the moment it seizes the masses." We Marxists know that philosophically too, the great deciding contest between reason and anti-reason, between materialist dialectics and irrationalism can so long after this struggle has become a contest over Marxism only be brought to a final victorious end with the proletariat's triumph over the bourgeoisie, the overthrow of capitalism and the setting up of socialism. It goes without saying that all this has to remain entirely beyond the peace movement's objectives, hence not even on the ideological plane can its mighty effort to reinstate reason and restore it to power fight the final deciding battle. But this does not at all lessen its world historical significance. The movement has opened its campaign by mobilizing 600 millions, and it is in the process of mobilizing further hundreds of millions. It is the first major mass rising against the madness of imperialist unreason. Fighting in reason's name, the masses have proclaimed their rights on the streets, their right to a share in determining our destiny. No longer will they forego this right, the use of reason on their own behalf and on behalf of mankind, the right to live in a rationally guided world and not amid the chaotic madness of war. Budapest, January 1953. Notes: Dialectic of Irrationalism. Historicizing Lukacs is the destruction of reason. 1. Lukacs had already revealed the core of his interpretation of fascism in two studies written from the mid-1930s, How Fascist Philosophy Came into Existence, written in Moscow in 1933, just after his emigration to the USSR, and How Germany Became the Center of Reactionary Philosophy, written in Tashkent in 1943, when he was evacuated from Moscow. C. Zoltan Tar and Judith Marcus, Recent Lukacs Scholarship in Eastern Europe, A Trend Report from Hungary, Studies in Soviet Thought, Volume 31, 1, 29-30? Stephen Kotkin, Magnetic Mountain. Stalinism as Civilization, 23. 3. Boris Groys, The Total Art of Stalinism. Avant-Garde, Aesthetic Dictatorship, and Beyond, Trans. Charles Ruggell, 113. 4. Kurt Sontheimer, Deutschgeschichte und Nationalsozialismus, zu Georg Lukacs Zerstörung der Vernunft, Studien zur Religions- und Geistesgeschichte, Volume 9, 3, 291.5. Theodor W. Adorno, Extorted Reconciliation, on Georg Lukacs' Realism in Our Time, Notes to Literature, ed. Rolf Tiedemann, Trans. Sherry Weber Nicholson, 215. 6. Georg Lichtheim, An Intellectual Disaster Encounter, May 1963, 95. Alexander Ferrin, Marxism Orthodox ou Marxism Occidental? La Reception de Lukacs en France dans les années 1940 at 1950. Actual Marx, Volume 6. Lukacs' Incomprehension of the 23. Georg Lukacs, The Destruct. Enlightenment started with Herder, who put into question the universalism of reason by introducing 175-35 Siegfried Krieger, From Caligari to Hitler. A Psychological History of the German Film, ed. Leonardo Quaresima, Princeton University Press, 2004. 1989. 50. Lucien Goldman, Georg Lukacs, L'essayist, Reach. 59. Max Horkheimer, Theodor W. Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment, 44. 64. C. Mikko Immonen, Tour de Concrete Philosophy, Heidegger and the Emergence of the Frankfurt School. 65. Roger Chartier, The Cultural Origins of the French Revolution, Trans. Lydia G. Cochran. 66. Drive, 417. 67. Karl Lowith, From Hegel to Nietzsche. The Revolution in 19th Century Thought, Trans. David E. Green, Forward by Hans-Georg Gadamer, New York, Columbia University Press, 1964, 268. Herbert Marcuse, The New German Mentality, Technology, War and Fascism, ed. Douglas Kellner, 152. 69. Du Politique, ed. 80. 93. 98. 113 Edward W. said, Humanism and Democracy. 1 Translator's Note. 10 marks. 33 This ambiguous dual tendency is already to be found in Bohm himself. C.P. Marx Engels, Early Philosophical Works, Berlin 1953, pages 258.34 Translator's Note. High 9 100 171 Schopenhauer 231 Ibid. From Medsociomorphism, the last 4 Nietzsche, were 26 vo 51 vo 75 91 Ibid. But wrote the essay 121 15 40 66 88 100 100 1 mark 20 41 10 mark 29 Max Weber 53 Ibid. 80 Freyer 101 Schmidt 17 39 60 83 Ibid. Vol. 1 F. Index of persons' works mentioned in the text are listed under their author. Page references. Bernstein, Edward, 3081 548 572 570. Bruno, Georg. Cry. Cons. Free. Der Zabur. Nicholas I, Tsar of Russia. Real. Wiechert, Ernst, 800. Wiechert, Ernst, 839 Weil.